Forgotten female explorers who defied the world.
Chapter 1. Chains of Propriety, the Victorian Prison. The drawing room at Ashworth House captured perfectly the gilded cage of Victorian womanhood. Sunlight filtered through heavy brocade curtains, casting amber pools across the Persian carpet, where 6 young women sat in a careful arrangement that suggested both refinement and restriction. Their postures were impeccable, spines held rigid by whalebone and steel, shoulders back, chins slightly elevated. Each wore a dress that required at least 20 minutes and a lady's maid to don properly, layer upon layer of petticoats beneath silk skirts that spread around them like ornamental puddles. The rustle of fabric accompanied every minute movement, a constant whisper of propriety. Miss Weatherby, the governess, moved between them with the measured steps of a prison warden, though she would have been mortally offended by such a comparison. Her domain was culture, refinement, and the cultivation of those accomplishments that would render her charges suitable for marriage to gentlemen of quality. On the music stand, a Mozart sonata awaited one pupil. On the embroidery frames, pastoral scenes emerged slowly in silk thread. At the writing desk, another young woman practiced her copperplate handwriting, copying improving verses about duty and submission. This was 1873, though it might as well have been any year in the middle decades of the 19th century, when such scenes played out in drawing rooms across England, France, and America. The routine rarely varied. Morning lessons in French or German always focused on conversational pleasantries rather than literature or philosophy. Instruction in watercolor painting, but only of flowers, never landscapes that might suggest a desire to venture beyond the garden. Piano playing, but only of pieces deemed sufficiently gentle and melodious. The more vigorous works of Beethoven were considered too passionate, potentially overexciting to the delicate female constitution. Lady Charlotte Ashworth, just 17 and already considered perilously close to spinsterhood by her anxious mother, sat at the piano, but her fingers had stilled on the keys. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see her brothers mounting their horses in the courtyard below, preparing for a ride across the estate, and perhaps beyond, to the village and the wider world that lay tantalizingly out of reach. William, the youngest at 15, had just returned from his first term at Oxford, full of stories about lectures on natural philosophy, debates about Darwin's theories, expeditions to collect geological specimens. Edward, 19, was preparing to join a friend's father on a diplomatic mission to India, a journey that would last 2 years and span 3 continents. Charlotte's own education had concluded at 14. Her parents had considered even that generous, given that many of their peers saw no purpose in teaching daughters anything beyond basic literacy and household management. She could read, though she was actively discouraged from reading anything more stimulating than novels of moral instruction. She could write, though her letters were expected to contain nothing more controversial than observations about the weather and inquiries after health. She could paint and play and embroider, skills whose sole purpose was to ornament the leisure hours of a future husband. But Charlotte, like countless women of her generation, harbored secret longings that would have scandalized her family. Hidden beneath her mattress was a copy of Travels in West Africa by a male explorer, whose adventures had captured her imagination. She had purchased it with hoarded pin money during a rare chaperone shopping expedition, smuggling it home beneath a box of handkerchiefs. At night, by candlelight, she read about crocodile-infested rivers, encounters with tribal peoples, the collection of botanical specimens from forests no European had previously penetrated. Each page was a window into a world she had been taught to believe was entirely beyond her reach. The social architecture that confined women like Charlotte was not merely custom, but law, backed by the full authority of the state and reinforced by medical science, religious doctrine, and economic reality. In England, the Married Women's Property Act would not pass until 1882, and even then it only partially addressed the legal fiction that a married woman had no separate existence from her husband. Upon marriage, a woman's property, earnings, and even her physical person became her husband's. A man could legally confine his wife, control her movements, and claim any wages she might earn. Divorce was nearly impossible for women to obtain and brought complete social ruin. Women could not vote, could not stand for parliament, could not serve on juries, could not attend university, could not enter most professions. The few occupations open to middle-class women who needed to support themselves were severely limited: governess, companion to an elderly lady, or perhaps teacher in a girls' school, though even these positions were considered evidence of family failure and brought significant social stigma. Working-class women had more options, but all of them involved grueling labor for minimal pay in factories, as domestic servants, or in agriculture. The medical establishment provided scientific justification for these restrictions. Physicians solemnly declared that women were governed by their reproductive systems, that menstruation rendered them periodically irrational and incapable of sustained intellectual effort, that pregnancy and potential pregnancy required them to conserve their limited physical and mental energy. Dr. Edward Clark of Harvard Medical School published influential work arguing that higher education would damage women's reproductive organs by diverting blood away from the uterus to the brain. Physical exertion beyond the gentlest garden stroll was considered dangerous. Travel, particularly to foreign climates, was thought to risk nervous collapse. These medical theories intersected conveniently with social prejudices and economic interests. If women were too delicate for university education, then universities need not admit them or modify their all-male cultures. If women were unsuited for vigorous activity, then they need not be given access to sports, hiking, or any of the physical conditioning that might prepare them for exploration. If travel was dangerous to feminine health, then women's exclusion from geographic societies, scientific expeditions, and diplomatic postings was simply protective good sense rather than discriminatory gatekeeping. The Victorian corset served as both literal and metaphorical embodiment of these restrictions. The fashionable silhouette of the 1860s and 1870s required a waist so constricted that internal organs were compressed, breathing was restricted, and any vigorous movement became difficult or impossible. Women fainted regularly, not from delicate constitutions, but from lack of oxygen. The corset made it nearly impossible to bend at the waist, encouraging the rigid, upright posture considered proper, but also making it difficult to do anything practical. Try climbing a mountain or navigating a jungle trail while wearing a steel-boned corset laced tight enough to reduce your waist by 4 inches and restricting your lung capacity by 1/3. But the corset was only the beginning. The full costume required of respectable Victorian women included multiple petticoats, a dress with yards of fabric in the skirt, sleeves that restricted arm movement, often a bustle that made sitting difficult, boots that laced to mid-calf, gloves, and a hat secured with pins. The entire ensemble could weigh 20 to 30 pounds and required assistance to put on or remove. This was not clothing designed for mobility, for climbing, for riding astride a horse, or for any of the activities that exploration would require. It was clothing designed to signal class status, sexual propriety, and leisure, to demonstrate that the wearer was valuable precisely because she could not engage in productive labor. Beyond the physical constraints, the social consequences for transgression were severe. A woman who ventured outside proper bounds risked her reputation, and reputation was the currency on which a woman's entire future depended. An unmarried woman with a damaged reputation might never marry, condemning her to dependent spinsterhood, living on the charity of relatives. A married woman who brought scandal to her husband's name might be socially ostracized, divorced, or confined to an asylum. The madhouse served as the Victorian era's ultimate punishment for female deviance, and perfectly sane women were committed by husbands or fathers who found their independence inconvenient. The geographical societies that organized and celebrated exploration were exclusively male bastions. The Royal Geographical Society, founded in 1830, did not admit women as fellows until 1913, and then only after fierce controversy. The National Geographic Society in the United States, founded in 1888, was similarly male-dominated. These organizations controlled funding for expeditions, publication of findings, and the conferral of credibility on explorers. A woman might travel to the ends of the earth and make genuine discoveries, but without recognition from these gatekeeping institutions, her work would be dismissed as the eccentric hobby of an odd spinster, rather than serious scientific contribution. Newspapers and popular magazines of the Victorian era overflowed with accounts of male explorers. Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke searching for the source of the Nile. David Livingstone penetrating the African interior. Ernest Shackleton planning Antarctic expeditions. These men were heroes, their adventures serialized, their portraits displayed, their books bestsellers. Young boys were encouraged to emulate them, to dream of exploration and adventure. The same publications that celebrated male explorers, however, printed cautionary tales about women who stepped outside their proper sphere, editorials warning of the dangers of female education, and medical columns explaining women's inherent limitations. Yet even within this suffocating context, some women nursed secret rebellions. In provincial France, a young woman named Jeanne Baret was learning about medicinal herbs from the local healer, developing knowledge that would eventually take her around the world disguised as a man. In a wealthy English household, Gertrude Bell was fighting her parents for permission to attend Oxford, where she would eventually read modern history and discover a passion for the Middle East. In Rhode Island, Annie Smith Peck was struggling to finance her education, dreaming of mountains she had seen only in books. In a Pennsylvania factory town, Nellie Bly was beginning to question the grinding poverty and limited options that surrounded her. In England, Mary Kingsley was trapped by obligation to aging parents, but reading voraciously about West Africa. In Italy, young Freya Stark was developing a fascination with maps and languages that would eventually lead her to unexplored corners of Arabia. These 6 women, unknown to each other, separated by geography and circumstance, but united by a common hunger for something beyond the prescribed life, would all find ways to break free. Their paths to liberation varied, but all required extraordinary courage, creativity, and determination. They would have to overcome not just social disapproval, but practical obstacles that might seem insurmountable: lack of funds, lack of education, lack of equipment, lack of access to the networks and institutions that facilitated male exploration.
Jeanne Baret was born into poverty in 1740 in Burgundy, France, the illegitimate daughter of laborers. Her lack of family name or fortune meant she had no reputation to protect, and therefore, paradoxically, more freedom than women of higher social class. She could not fall further in social estimation than illegitimacy had already placed her. Working as a governess and housekeeper, she developed extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, learning from local healers whose knowledge was passed down orally, never written in the scientific treatises produced by university-educated men. When she met Philibert Commerson, a naturalist preparing to join a voyage of global circumnavigation, she saw an opportunity. Women were strictly forbidden on French naval vessels, but Commerson needed an assistant who understood botany. Jeanne bound her breasts, cut her hair, dressed in loose clothing, and adopted the name Jeanne. In 1766, she boarded the Étoile as Commerson's valet, becoming the first woman to circumnavigate the globe, though she would not receive credit for the achievement until after her death.
Gertrude Bell was born in 1868 into very different circumstances: wealth, social position, and a family that, while conventional in many ways, valued education. Her mother died when she was 3, and her father remarried a woman who believed in female education. This was rare enough to be remarkable. Gertrude was allowed to attend Lady Margaret Hall, one of the first women's colleges at Oxford, where she excelled in modern history and developed her formidable intellect. But even this privileged education had limits. Women at Oxford could attend lectures and take examinations, but were not granted degrees. They could study, but not receive official recognition of their scholarship. After Oxford, Gertrude was expected to return home, make a suitable marriage, and put her education to use managing a household. The prospect filled her with claustrophobic dread. She began to travel, first accompanying relatives on trips to Persia, then venturing further into the Ottoman Empire, learning Arabic and Persian, developing expertise in archaeology and tribal politics that would eventually make her indispensable to the British Empire's Middle Eastern policy. But in these early years, she was simply a restless young woman, trying to find purpose beyond the drawing room.
Annie Smith Peck was born in 1850 in Providence, Rhode Island, to a family of modest means and fierce intellectual ambition. Her father and brothers attended university, but higher education for Annie was out of the question, both financially and socially. She became a school teacher, one of the few respectable professions open to her, and saved every penny of her meager salary. At 24, she used her savings to attend the Rhode Island Normal School, the only advanced education available to her. She continued teaching, continued saving, and at 35, an age when most women of her era had long since settled into spinsterhood or marriage, she finally had enough money to attend the University of Michigan,
which had recently begun admitting women. She was older than her professors, an object of curiosity and sometimes mockery, but she persisted. She discovered classics, archaeology, and ancient history, and with these interests came an obsession with mountains. She read accounts of alpine climbing and decided with characteristic determination that she would become a mountaineer. Never mind that mountaineering was considered an exclusively male pursuit, that the equipment was designed for men, that women were thought physically incapable of high-altitude climbing. Annie would prove them wrong.
Nellie Bly, born Elizabeth Cochran in 1864, grew up in Pennsylvania in a family sliding from middle-class respectability toward poverty after her father's death. She saw firsthand how limited women's options were, how factory work destroyed health for starvation wages, how women with education and intelligence were confined to mind-numbing domesticity or soul-crushing industrial labor. When she read an editorial in the Pittsburgh Dispatch arguing that women belonged in the home and should not work outside it, she wrote a furious rebuttal that so impressed the editor he hired her. But even as a journalist, she was assigned the women's pages, articles about fashion and society, nothing substantial. She began investigating the conditions of working women, writing exposés that made her editors nervous. When they tried to confine her to safer subjects, she quit and moved to New York City, determined to break into the competitive world of metropolitan journalism. Her weapon would be audacity, a willingness to do what men would not, to go undercover in an insane asylum, to race around the world alone, to take risks that defied every convention of proper feminine behavior.
Mary Kingsley was born in 1862 to a family of travelers, but the travel was exclusively male. Her father was a doctor who accompanied wealthy patients on their global health-seeking journeys. Her uncle was the celebrated novelist Charles Kingsley. Mary's brother was sent to university. Mary herself received virtually no formal education. She taught herself by reading her father's library, developing particular interests in ethnography and natural science, but she was expected to serve as unpaid housekeeper and nurse to her invalid mother and demanding father. For years, she suppressed her own desires, playing the dutiful daughter, watching her youth disappear into domestic servitude. She read accounts of West Africa, a region considered so dangerous that it was called the white man's grave, where European traders and explorers died regularly of tropical diseases. Instead of deterring her, these accounts fascinated her. She began to dream of African rivers and forests, of peoples whose cultures were utterly different from Victorian England, of fish specimens that might advance scientific knowledge. But she was trapped, and she saw no escape until both her parents died within 6 weeks of each other in 1892. She was 30, a spinster by Victorian standards, but suddenly free. She had a small inheritance, no family obligations, and 3 decades of deferred dreams. Within months, she was planning her first journey to West Africa.
Freya Stark was born in 1893, late enough in the Victorian era to benefit from some gradual relaxation of restrictions, but still facing formidable obstacles. Her parents were artistic bohemians living in Italy, and her childhood was spent in a household more culturally rich than financially stable. She was educated at home, learning languages with ease, but lacking formal credentials. A devastating accident in her teenage years, when her hair was caught in factory machinery and she was partially scalped, left her with visible scars, and perhaps a sense that she had already survived catastrophe and therefore need not fear risk. She developed an intense fascination with the Middle East, teaching herself Arabic, reading Burton and Doughty, dreaming of Arabia. But she had no money, no institutional affiliation, no obvious path to the travels she desired. She would have to create her own opportunities, writing her way into the world she wanted to enter, using language as her passport to places women were not supposed to go.
These 6 women, born across a span of 150 years, but all shaped by the restrictive gender norms of their eras, would each find a different path to defiance. Some would work within the system, using class privilege or institutional connections to create space for their ambitions. Others would reject the system entirely, breaking rules so flagrantly that society had no framework for responding to them. Some would disguise their gender, passing as men to access opportunities. Others would insist on traveling as women, refusing to hide their sex even when doing so meant constant harassment and obstruction. Some would seek scientific credibility, contributing specimens and data that forced institutions to acknowledge their work. Others would write for popular audiences, supporting themselves through journalism and books,
bypassing the gatekeeping institutions that excluded women.
But in this moment, before their journeys began, they were all trapped. Charlotte Ashworth at her piano, watching her brothers ride away. Jeanne Baret working as a governess, using her botanical knowledge to cure the ailments of villagers who could not afford physicians. Gertrude Bell returning from Oxford to her father's house, attending tea parties and balls, dying of boredom. Annie Smith Peck teaching primary school, saving pennies, studying university catalogs at night. Nellie Bly writing fashion columns when she wanted to write about industrial accidents and political corruption. Mary Kingsley changing bedpans and reading explorers' memoirs. Freya Stark learning Arabic from a book with no clear vision of how this knowledge would ever prove useful.
The world was simultaneously expanding and contracting. Steamships were making global travel faster and more accessible. Rail networks were opening interiors of continents. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, had dramatically shortened the journey between Europe and Asia. Photography was allowing people to see images of distant places. Popular magazines and newspapers were filled with accounts of exploration. The map of the world was being filled in, the blank spaces labeled and claimed by European empires. It was an age of unprecedented mobility and discovery, but only for men.
For women, the world was shrinking. As the middle class expanded and consolidated its power, the ideology of separate spheres hardened into dogma. Women's supposed natural place was the home, the private domestic sphere, while men operated in the public sphere of commerce, politics, and adventure. This ideology was more restrictive than the actual practices of earlier eras, when aristocratic women had sometimes wielded significant power and working-class women had always worked outside the home. The Victorian middle class created an ideal of sheltered, ornamental femininity and tried to impose it up and down the social scale.
The contrast was sharpest in the realm of exploration and travel. While men were celebrated for venturing into dangerous territories, women who expressed interest in travel were considered at best eccentric, at worst dangerously deviant. Medical authorities warned that travel would damage female health. Social commentators warned that it would damage female character, making women coarse and unfeminine. Religious leaders warned that women travelers were shirking their duties to family and God. The cultural message was clear: a woman's place was home, and any woman who wanted to leave was defective, selfish, unwomanly.
Yet women did travel, even in the Victorian era, though usually under carefully controlled circumstances. Wealthy women accompanied husbands on diplomatic or business postings. Missionary women traveled to spread Christianity, their religious purpose providing a respectable justification for otherwise suspect behavior. Some women traveled for health, seeking better climates, though always accompanied by family members or companions. These approved forms of female travel were always subordinated to male authority or higher moral purpose. A woman could not simply travel for her own curiosity, her own ambition, her own pleasure. She needed an excuse that fit within acceptable frameworks.
The women who would become explorers had to construct those excuses, or simply defy the need for them. Jeanne Baret traveled as a man, avoiding the question entirely. Mary Kingsley traveled ostensibly to collect fish specimens for the British Museum, giving her journey scientific purpose. Gertrude Bell framed her travels as cultural and archaeological study, eventually making herself so expert on Arab tribal politics that the British government needed her. Annie Smith Peck positioned herself as an athlete and lecturer, making mountaineering her profession. Nellie Bly turned her travels into journalism, making her journey around the world a news story. Freya Stark would later travel as a writer and archaeologist, creating multiple layers of professional justification for her wanderings.
But before they could construct these justifications, they first had to imagine that defiance was possible. They had to see a crack in the wall that surrounded them, a glimpse of alternative possibility. These moments of awakening came differently for each woman, but all shared a common element: exposure to stories of travel, maps of distant places, images of landscapes utterly unlike the confined spaces of their daily lives.
For Charlotte Ashworth, it was that smuggled book, Travels in West Africa, read by candlelight while her family slept. The author described floating down rivers in a canoe, camping in forests, collecting plant specimens, negotiating with tribal chiefs. He wrote of freedom, of days spent entirely outside, of discovery
and risk and purpose. Charlotte had never imagined a woman could live such a life. But why not? The question once asked would not go away. Why not?
For Jeanne Baret, awakening came through plants themselves. She knew the medicinal properties of hundreds of species, knowledge that could save lives, but was dismissed as folk wisdom, inferior to the theoretical knowledge of male physicians who had never touched a living plant. When Commerson explained that he was joining a voyage to collect botanical specimens from around the world, specimens that would be classified in the Linnaean system and contribute to scientific knowledge, Jeanne understood that her practical knowledge could be transmuted into scientific credibility, if only she could access the spaces from which women were barred. The Navy ship became her university, the globe her laboratory.
For Gertrude Bell, the moment came in Persia, on her first journey beyond Europe, when she stood before the ruins of ancient Persepolis and felt the layers of history beneath her feet. She realized that she had something to contribute, a mind capable of understanding the complex political and cultural geography of the Middle East, languages that allowed her to speak with people rather than merely observing them. She saw that there was work to be done, important work, and that her gender should not disqualify her from doing it. The feeling was simultaneously exhilarating and enraging. Why should she not contribute? What possible justification existed for wasting her abilities?
For Annie Smith Peck, the awakening was physical as well as intellectual. On a school trip to Switzerland, she saw the Matterhorn, its peak piercing the sky, and felt a visceral pull. She wanted to climb it. The desire was not metaphorical but literal, a hunger to test her body against that mountain, to stand on that summit. When she learned that only a handful of women had ever climbed significant peaks, that mountaineering clubs excluded women, that the equipment manufacturers did not make gear for female bodies, she was not deterred, but rather energized. The obstacles made the goal more meaningful. She would climb mountains because she was told she could not, because doing so would prove the falseness of every claim about female weakness and incapacity.
For Nellie Bly, the moment came in rage. She was 21, working in a factory, reading that damned editorial that explained women should not work outside the home. The writer lived in comfortable ignorance, clearly never having spoken to the women who had no choice but to work, who supported children and elderly parents on starvation wages, who destroyed their health in factories and sweatshops because the alternative was starvation. The sheer injustice of it, the willful blindness, ignited in Nellie a furious determination. She would make people see. She would go places journalists did not go, would tell stories that needed telling, would use her audacity as a weapon against complacency and cruelty. For Mary Kingsley, liberation came through death. She did not wish her parents dead, but when they died, she felt a guilty relief that terrified her with its intensity. At 30, she could begin living. She had no clear plan, only a sense that she had been given a second chance, that she could not waste it on another respectable cage. West Africa called to her. Specifically West Africa, not the relatively traveled routes to East Africa or South Africa, but the swampy, disease-ridden, culturally rich regions that Europeans had barely penetrated. She would go there, would learn about the peoples and cultures, would collect fish specimens that might advance scientific knowledge, would write about her experiences. She would matter, would contribute, would exist as more than just a useful domestic servant to male relatives. For Freya Stark, the moment was quieter but no less significant. Reading Burton's accounts of Arabia, she recognized in his descriptions a landscape that matched something internal, a sense of belonging to spaces she had never seen. She knew, with certainty that transcended logic, that she would go to Arabia, would learn its languages and cultures, would travel through its deserts and mountains. The practical obstacles, lack of money, lack of connections, lack of institutional support, seemed irrelevant. She would find a way, because the alternative, a life confined to European domesticity, was unthinkable.
The Victorian era was beginning to crack, though the women living through it could not know the extent of changes coming. The suffrage movement was building strength, though women would not gain the vote in Britain until 1918, and then only partially. Universities were beginning to admit women, though they would face discrimination for decades. Professional opportunities were slowly expanding. But in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, these changes were more theoretical than real. For individual women, the constraints remained tight,
the penalties for defiance severe.
What drove some women to defy these constraints, while others submitted? Historians and biographers have proposed various explanations. Unusual family circumstances that provided more education or independence. Personality traits that made conformity unbearable. Historical moments that created opportunities. The influence of early female pioneers who provided models of defiance. Likely it was all these factors in combination, different for each woman.
But certain commonalities emerge. Many of the women who became explorers experienced some disruption of the normal path. Parents who died, leaving them independent, families who were themselves unconventional, financial circumstances that made traditional options unavailable. Many were educated beyond the norm for women, either through access to family libraries, determined self-teaching, or progressive parents. Many had brothers whose freedom they observed and envied, making their own constraints more visible and intolerable. Many experienced moments of travel or exposure to other cultures that expanded their sense of possibility.
They were also, inevitably, women of at least some economic privilege. Poor women were too concerned with survival to contemplate exploration. Working-class women worked brutal hours in factories and fields, lacking the leisure, education, and resources that travel required. The women who became explorers were generally middle or upper class, or they possessed education and skills that allowed them to earn money. Economic class did not spare them from gender restrictions, but it did provide resources to fight against those restrictions.
The chapter of Victorian constraint would eventually give way to the chapters of exploration and adventure. But understanding the depth and breadth of those constraints is essential for appreciating the magnitude of courage required to overcome them. These women did not simply decide one day to travel. They had to fight every step of the way, against external obstacles, certainly, but also against internal doubts, the voices that had been trained into them from birth, telling them they were incapable, unsuitable, unwomanly.
As the sun set over Ashworth House, Charlotte closed the piano and excused herself. In her room, she retrieved the hidden book and opened it to her favorite passage, where the explorer described climbing a mountain to gain a view of the country beyond. She copied the passage into her diary, then added her own words. "I will not die in this drawing room. I will see the world beyond these walls. Someday, somehow, I will be free." It was the first articulation of rebellion, a promise to herself that she would find a way, even if she could not yet imagine what that way might be. Across time and space, 5 other women were making similar promises, lighting small flames of defiance that would eventually become beacons, showing the way for others to follow. The Victorian prison would not hold them forever, though breaking free would require more courage than any of them yet understood they possessed.
Chapter 2. Jeanne Baret, the woman who became a man at sea.
The Loire Valley in 1740 was a patchwork of green and gold, where fields of herbs stretched toward ancient forests, and the morning mist clung to the ground like a secret waiting to be discovered. It was here, in a small stone cottage that leaked when it rained and shivered in winter winds, that Jeanne Baret entered a world that would never quite know what to do with her. Her parents were laborers, their hands perpetually stained with soil, their backs bent from work that began before dawn and ended long after sunset. In this world of rigid social hierarchies and even more rigid expectations for women, Jeanne's birth was neither celebrated nor mourned. It was simply another mouth to feed, another pair of hands that would eventually contribute to the family's survival. Yet from her earliest days, there was something different about the girl with the sharp eyes and the endless questions. While other children her age learned to accept the world as it was presented to them, Jeanne interrogated it. Why did this plant grow in shade while another required sun? Why did certain herbs ease pain while others induced sleep? Why were the patterns of leaves so varied, and what did those variations mean? Her mother, exhausted from the day's labor, would wave away these questions with a tired hand. Her father, when he noticed the girl at all, would grunt that such curiosity was wasted on a female child. But the fields themselves became Jeanne's teachers, and the elderly herbalist who lived at the edge of their village became her unlikely mentor. Old Marie was a woman the village both needed and feared, needed for her healing knowledge, feared for her independence and the power that knowledge gave her. She saw in young Jeanne a hunger that reminded her of her own youth,
and so she taught the girl what the schools would never teach, what society deemed unnecessary for someone of Jeanne's sex and station. By the time Jeanne was 12, she could identify hundreds of plants by sight, smell, and touch. She knew which flowers bloomed in what season, which roots held medicinal properties, which berries could kill and which could cure.
This knowledge was considered appropriate enough for a peasant girl. After all, women of her class were expected to know such domestic matters. But Jeanne's understanding went deeper than the practical. She didn't just memorize plants, she understood them. She grasped their relationships to soil and season, their connections to the larger natural world. In another life, in another body, with another name and different anatomy, she might have been called a naturalist, a botanist, a scientist. But she was Jeanne, poor and female, and so her extraordinary mind was considered merely a useful oddity, like a dog that could count or a bird that could speak. As she grew into young womanhood, Jeanne's options narrowed to the cruel simplicity that governed the lives of poor women in 18th century France: marriage to a man of her class, domestic service in a wealthy household, or the dangerous uncertainty of life on society's margins. Marriage held no appeal for her. She had watched her mother's spirit slowly crushed under the weight of childbearing and poverty, had seen how marriage for a woman without means was often just another word for servitude. Domestic service, then, seemed the best of limited choices, and Jeanne's knowledge of herbs and healing made her particularly valuable. At 25, in 1765, Jeanne entered the household of Philibert Commerson as a housekeeper and assistant. Commerson was a naturalist of growing reputation, a man whose passion for botanical discovery matched Jeanne's own, though his would be celebrated while hers would be hidden. He was also a man of complicated personal morals, recently widowed, and struggling to manage his household while pursuing his scientific work. In Jeanne, he found not just a competent housekeeper, but an intellectual companion, someone who could not only gather specimens but understand them, not only organize his collections but contribute to his research.
Their relationship, as was perhaps inevitable, became romantic. In another era, this might have been a partnership of equals, two passionate minds pursuing knowledge together. But this was 18th century France, and Jeanne's contributions to Commerson's work could never be publicly acknowledged. When she became pregnant with his child, the scandal rippled through their community like stones thrown into still water. Commerson's reputation survived it. It always did for men of his standing. Jeanne's situation became desperate. She gave birth to a son and was forced to leave the child with others to raise, a pain that would haunt her all her days. She needed income, needed a future, needed an escape from a society that had condemned her for the same relationship it had excused in her lover. It was at this moment of desperation that fate, or perhaps Commerson's guilty conscience, offered an extraordinary opportunity. In late 1766, Louis-Antoine de Bougainville was preparing an ambitious expedition, the first French circumnavigation of the globe. His two vessels, the Boudeuse and the Étoile, would carry soldiers, sailors, scientists, and supplies on a journey that would last years and cover thousands of miles of largely uncharted waters. Philibert Commerson had been appointed as the expedition's naturalist, a prestigious position that promised both adventure and scientific discovery. He would need an assistant, someone to help collect, prepare, and catalog the thousands of specimens they would surely encounter. Someone with botanical knowledge, physical stamina, and absolute dedication to the work. Someone like Jeanne. But there was an insurmountable obstacle. Women were absolutely forbidden aboard French naval vessels. This prohibition wasn't merely policy. It was law, tradition, and superstition woven together into an ironclad rule. Sailors believed women aboard ship brought catastrophic bad luck. Naval regulations explicitly prohibited female passengers. And the close quarters of an 18th century vessel, where privacy was virtually non-existent and men lived in intimate proximity for months or years at a time, made the presence of a woman seem logistically impossible, even if it weren't legally forbidden.
Jeanne and Commerson must have discussed the impossibility of the situation in whispered conversations, weighing her botanical skills against the rigid prohibitions of maritime law. And somewhere in those discussions, a radical idea took shape. What if Jeanne didn't board the ship as a woman? What if she became someone else entirely? The decision, once made, must have felt both terrifying and liberating. Jeanne would transform herself into Jeanne Baret, male servant and botanical assistant to Monsieur Commerson. The French authorities and the ship's crew would see only what they expected to see, another young man seeking adventure and employment on the high seas. But the transformation would require more than just a change of clothes. Jeanne would need to reconstruct herself entirely, to become so thoroughly male in appearance and behavior that she could maintain the deception in the most intimate and challenging circumstances imaginable, aboard a ship where space was limited, privacy non-existent, and any mistake could mean exposure, punishment, or worse. The preparations were meticulous and methodical. First came the physical transformation. Jeanne cut her hair short in the masculine style of the period, feeling each snip of the scissors as both liberation and loss. Hair was a woman's crowning glory in that era, and to cut it off was to mark oneself as outside society's norms, a prostitute, a criminal, or mad. But for Jeanne, it was the price of passage to a larger world. She bound her breasts tightly with strips of cloth, a practice that was painful and restrictive, but necessary to flatten the curves that would betray her sex. She studied the clothing of working-class men, learning how to wear the loose shirts, the practical breeches, the sturdy boots that were so different from women's restrictive garments. She practiced walking with a longer stride, standing with legs apart rather than modestly together, sitting without the careful arrangement of skirts. Every gesture had to be reconsidered and relearned. The way she held her hands, the way she turned her head, the way she laughed or expressed anger, all of these had been shaped by a lifetime of feminine training, and all of them could betray her if she wasn't vigilant.
She practiced lowering her voice, speaking from her chest rather than her throat, though she was fortunate that her natural voice was relatively low. She studied how men interacted with each other, the rough camaraderie, the casual physical contact, the competitive banter that was so different from female friendship. She learned to swear, to spit, to take up space in ways women were trained never to do. She created a background story for Jeanne Baret, an orphan from the countryside, educated enough to be useful, but not so educated as to seem suspicious, seeking employment and adventure abroad. She memorized this fictional history until it felt as real as her actual past. Commerson helped where he could, providing male clothing, coaching her on masculine behavior, and, most importantly, offering her the legitimacy of his employment. Jeanne Baret would be his personal servant and botanical assistant, and the naturalist's word would provide protection against too many questions. On a cold December day in 1766, Jeanne Baret walked up the gangplank of the Étoile in Rochefort, carrying a small bundle of possessions and an enormous weight of secrets. Jeanne's heart, Jean's heart now, must have hammered against the tight bindings around her chest as she stepped aboard. This was the point of no return. On land, if her disguise failed, she could flee, could disappear into the anonymous crowds of a city or the familiar landscapes of the countryside. But once the ship left port, there would be nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Discovery would mean humiliation at best, violence at worst. And yet she climbed aboard, because the alternative, a life bounded by poverty and scandal, her talents wasted, her passion for discovery forever unfulfilled, was a kind of death in itself. The Étoile was a flute, a merchant-style vessel modified for long-distance exploration, approximately 35 meters long and carrying a crew of about 120 men. It was a wooden world unto itself, cramped and crowded, smelling of tar and salt and the accumulated sweat of men living in close quarters. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist. Sailors slept in hammocks strung so close together that a man could feel his neighbor's breath. They ate together, worked together, performed their bodily functions in full view of each other, off the ship's sides or using shared buckets. For someone trying to hide their physical sex, it was a nightmare of constant exposure. Yet Jeanne, we must now think of her as Jeanne, as she thought of herself during those years, managed it through a combination of careful planning and audacious performance. As Commerson's personal servant, Jeanne had slightly more privacy than the common sailors, sleeping in or near the naturalist's cabin rather than in the crowded crew quarters. Jeanne was always first to wake and last to sleep, using the hours of darkness or early dawn for any personal needs that required privacy. When the crew bathed by jumping naked into the sea during calm weather and warm climates, Jeanne claimed a modest disposition or illness. When men stripped to the waist in tropical heat, Jeanne kept shirts on, claiming sun-sensitive skin. These eccentricities were noted, but not deeply questioned. Ships were full of odd characters, and a scholarly servant of a naturalist might well be peculiar. The disguise was helped by the nature of the work itself. As botanical assistant, Jeanne's duties took the persona away from the ship regularly. When the expedition made landfall, Jeanne and Commerson would disappear into jungles, climb mountains, explore valleys, always searching for new plant species. These expeditions away from the ship's confines were both the most dangerous and the most liberating times for Jeanne. Dangerous because they meant venturing into unknown territories where anything might happen, where indigenous peoples might react with hostility, where tropical diseases lurked, where a simple fall could mean death far from any help. But liberating because in the vast spaces of unexplored lands she could breathe freely, could drop some of the constant vigilance required on the ship, could be herself, or perhaps discover who that self really was when freed from society's constraints. The expedition's first major stop, after crossing the Atlantic and navigating the treacherous Strait of Magellan, was in South America. Here, in the lush coastal regions and the edges of great rainforests, Jeanne's botanical expertise truly revealed itself. She had an eye for specimens that even Commerson lacked, a sixth sense for which plants might prove scientifically valuable. She could spot rare specimens hidden among common varieties, could identify families and genera by the smallest distinctive features. She prepared specimens with meticulous care, pressing them, making notes on their habitat and characteristics, drawing quick sketches to capture details that might be lost in preservation.
The work was physically demanding. Hours of hiking through difficult terrain while carrying collecting equipment, climbing trees to reach flowering branches, wading through swamps, enduring heat and humidity and insects that raised welts on exposed skin. Jeanne did this work without complaint, driven by a passion that made physical discomfort seem trivial. And if the crew noticed that Commerson's servant showed unusual expertise for someone supposedly just an assistant, they attributed it to good training by the naturalist, never guessing at the depth of knowledge Jeanne had accumulated during her years in the Loire Valley and in Commerson's household. The expedition collected thousands of specimens during this period, plants that had never been classified by European science, species that would eventually bear the names of the expedition's leaders, though they were collected by Jeanne's hands and identified through her knowledge. Among these was a spectacular flowering vine they encountered in Brazil, a plant with brilliant magenta bracts that seemed to embody the exotic beauty of the New World. It would eventually be named bougainvillea after the expedition's commander, despite the fact that Bougainville never collected it himself, while the woman who did collect it would go unnamed in the official botanical records. This pattern of invisible labor and transferred credit was so common for women that it was barely recognized as injustice. It was simply how the world worked. After South America, the expedition turned westward across the Pacific, that vast and largely uncharted ocean that had swallowed previous expeditions whole. The months at sea were the most difficult times for Jeanne. On land, she could lose herself in work, could find private spaces in the vastness of nature. But on the ship, there was nowhere to go, nothing to do but maintain the constant performance of masculinity while enduring the boredom, the poor food, the outbreaks of scurvy, the violent storms that made everyone aboard fear for their lives. The close quarters meant that Jeanne's eccentricities became more noticeable. Why did Commerson's servant never join the men when they stripped for washing? Why did Jeanne never participate in the crude sexual banter that was standard among sailors? Why did Jeanne seem weaker than expected for a young man, struggling with some of the heavier physical labor? Some crew members began to whisper suspicions, to ask questions that Jeanne deflected with careful lies and Commerson's interventions.
And then they reached Tahiti. The island appeared like a dream after months at sea. Green mountains rising from turquoise waters, white beaches lined with palms, and people who emerged in canoes to greet the strange ships with curiosity rather than fear. For the European crew, Tahiti was paradise, a place that seemed to embody all the myths of noble savages and tropical Eden that were popular in Enlightenment thought. Bougainville would later write rapturously about the island, describing it in terms that contributed to the romanticized European image of the Pacific that persists to this day. But for Jeanne, Tahiti meant something else: exposure. The Tahitian culture had different ideas about gender and recognition than European society. The islanders were accustomed to reading the human body and human behavior without the confusing layers of European clothing and custom. When Jeanne came ashore with the landing party, the Tahitian people saw immediately what the French sailors had somehow missed for more than a year. This was a woman. According to the accounts that survive, and they vary in details but agree on the essential facts, the Tahitians began to exclaim and gesture at Jeanne, using their words for woman, surrounding the disguised botanist with curiosity and excitement. In some accounts, they were friendly, even celebratory, treating the discovery as a wonderful surprise. In others, there was an element of aggression, a crowd of men who recognized Jeanne as female and responded in ways that terrified her. What's clear is that the moment Jeanne had feared for over a year had arrived, not through her own mistake, but through the clearer vision of people less constrained by European assumptions. Bougainville's own account of the incident is careful and somewhat evasive, suggesting he was caught between acknowledging what his crew had begun to suspect and maintaining the legal fiction that no woman had been aboard his vessels.
He wrote that Commerson's servant had been recognized by the Tahitians as female, but he claimed to be shocked by this revelation, stating that he had been successfully deceived like everyone else. This was almost certainly untrue. Bougainville was an intelligent and observant commander, and by this point in the voyage, Jeanne's secret was an open secret among the officers, if not the common crew. But maintaining plausible deniability was important for legal and career reasons. Allowing a woman aboard his vessels, even unknowingly, was a serious breach of naval regulations.
For Jeanne, the exposure must have brought a complex mixture of feelings. Terror, certainly, at what might happen now that her secret was revealed. Relief, perhaps, that the exhausting performance could end. Grief at the probable end of her adventure, her freedom, her participation in this extraordinary journey. And underneath it all, the bitter knowledge that her contributions would likely be erased, her achievement unrecognized, her name forgotten while men took credit for work she had done. The expedition left Tahiti and continued westward, but the dynamics aboard the Étoile had changed. Jeanne was no longer quite Jeanne, but Jeanne couldn't quite be Jeanne either. Bougainville made the decision that when the expedition reached Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, Jeanne and Commerson would leave the ships. Officially, this was because Commerson was ill and needed to recover on land. Unofficially, it was a way to remove the problematic woman from the vessels while avoiding the scandal and legal consequences that would follow from admitting she had been aboard all along. In late 1768, Jeanne and Commerson settled in Mauritius, then a French colony known as Ile-de-France. They lived as husband and wife, though they never formally married, and continued their botanical work. The island itself provided rich opportunities for collecting specimens, and Commerson's health, though genuinely poor, allowed him to continue working with Jeanne's assistance. They spent several years on Mauritius, collecting, cataloging, observing. It was a quieter life than the grand circumnavigation, but in some ways more productive scientifically. Jeanne could work openly now, without the burden of disguise, though still without official recognition. Then, in 1773, Philibert Commerson died, leaving Jeanne alone on Mauritius, far from France, without family or financial resources. She was 33 years old, and the adventure that had defined her 20s seemed to have ended in isolation and obscurity. But Jeanne's story wasn't over. She survived on Mauritius for several years, supporting herself through her botanical knowledge, working in gardens, selling specimens and seeds to visiting naturalists, and then in 1774 or 1775, the records are unclear, she met and married Jean Dubernat, a French soldier stationed on the island. When Dubernat's service ended in 1775, they returned to France together, sailing around the Cape of Good Hope and up the Atlantic. By the time they arrived in France in 1776, Jeanne Baret had completed her circumnavigation of the globe. She had accomplished it in pieces, across different vessels in several years, but she had done it nonetheless. She was the first woman to circle the world, though this achievement would not be recognized for more than 2 centuries.
The French Navy eventually granted her a pension, a tacit acknowledgement of her service to the expedition, though the official documentation was carefully worded to avoid admitting she had been aboard the naval vessels themselves. Jeanne and her husband settled in the Loire Valley, not far from where she had been born. She lived quietly, rarely speaking of her adventures, as women who had transgressed social boundaries learned to do if they wished to live peacefully in their later years. She died in 1807 at the age of 67 and was buried in an unmarked grave. The thousands of plant specimens she collected, the botanical knowledge she possessed, the grueling work she performed, the extraordinary courage she displayed, all of it was credited to Commerson in the official records. His name would be remembered in botanical history. Hers would be forgotten for generations. But history has a way of eventually recognizing its hidden figures, and Jeanne Baret's story gradually emerged from obscurity. Historians examining the records of Bougainville's expedition began to piece together the truth about Commerson's mysterious servant. Botanical records were reassessed, and it became clear that many specimens attributed to Commerson showed evidence of having been collected and prepared by someone with distinctive methods and interests that matched what we know of Jeanne's work. Her achievement has finally been recognized. She was indeed the first woman to circumnavigate the globe, though she did so hidden behind a masculine disguise, and her contributions were erased from official records. Recent scholarship has worked to restore Jeanne Baret to her rightful place in the history of exploration and botany. In 2012, a new species of South American plant was named Solanum barrettiae in her honor, a recognition that came 205 years after her death, but a recognition nonetheless. Her story appears in books about women explorers, about the history of botany, about maritime adventure, about gender transgression and queer history.
She has become, posthumously, what she could never be during her lifetime: acknowledged, celebrated, remembered.
What can we learn from Jeanne Baret's extraordinary life? Her story illuminates the rigid constraints that governed women's lives in the 18th century, how talent and intelligence and passion could be wasted if they occurred in female bodies. It shows us the ingenuity and courage women employed to escape those constraints, the risks they took, and the prices they paid. It demonstrates that exploration and scientific discovery were never the exclusive province of men, though men wrote the histories and took the credit. Women were there, too, collecting specimens, making observations, contributing knowledge, even if they had to disguise themselves and hide their contributions to do so. Jeanne's life also raises profound questions about identity and performance. For nearly 3 years, she lived as Jeanne Baret, performing masculinity so convincingly that trained naval officers and experienced sailors accepted the performance as reality. What did this sustained performance do to her sense of self? Did she sometimes lose Jeanne in Jeanne, or did the masculine disguise feel like a liberation from feminine constraints? The historical records are silent on these internal questions. We have the external facts of her journey, but can only imagine the internal landscape of her experience. We know she was brave because the voyage itself required immense physical courage. We know she was intelligent because her botanical contributions were substantial enough to advance scientific knowledge. We know she was determined because she maintained an exhausting deception under circumstances that would have broken many people. We know she loved plants and the natural world with a passion that drove her to endure hardship and danger. But what did she feel during the long nights at sea? What did she think about as she pressed botanical specimens in Commerson's cabin while the ship rocked beneath her? What were her private thoughts about the men around her who could do openly what she could only do in disguise? Did she feel triumph at her successful deception, or resentment that deception was necessary? Did she see herself as fortunate to have experienced what no woman before her had experienced, or as tragic that her achievement had to be hidden and denied?
The answers to these questions died with her in that unmarked grave in the Loire Valley. But her story survives, and it speaks to every person who has ever felt constrained by the accident of their birth, who has ever had to hide who they are to do what they love, who has ever contributed to something larger than themselves while knowing their contribution would be erased. Jeanne Baret's circumnavigation was not just a geographical achievement. It was a subversive act, a quiet revolution, a refusal to accept that her gender should limit her possibilities. She saw a way forward that everyone told her was impossible, and she took it anyway, consequences be damned. In our present moment, when we debate gender identity and expression, when we argue about women's place in science and exploration, when we grapple with how to acknowledge the historical contributions of people who were systematically excluded and erased, Jeanne Baret's story feels especially relevant. She wasn't able to change the system that constrained her. She was one woman with limited power in a deeply patriarchal society. But she found a crack in that system's wall and squeezed through it, grabbing what freedom and adventure she could. She couldn't force the French Navy to credit her work, but she did the work anyway, and that work contributed to human knowledge, even if her name was stripped from it. And now, centuries later, we're able to restore her name and her story, to say clearly, Jeanne Baret was here. She collected thousands of plant specimens. She identified new species. She survived storms and diseases and the constant threat of exposure. She circumnavigated the globe when women were forbidden even to board the ships that made such journeys. She mattered. Her work mattered. Her courage and intelligence and determination mattered. When we look at the historical record of exploration, we see mostly men's names, the captains and naturalists and adventurers whose official accounts and published journals shaped our understanding of how the world was explored and mapped. But behind many of those names were invisible women, the wives and daughters who processed specimens and drew illustrations but couldn't publish under their own names, the indigenous women who guided explorers through territories their peoples had known for generations but who appear in accounts, if at all, as anonymous helpers, the women like Jeanne who disguised themselves as men because it was the only way to participate in the adventure they craved. We're slowly, belatedly beginning to tell their stories, to make visible what was hidden, to credit what was stolen.
Jeanne Baret's circumnavigation stands as a monument to what women could achieve even under systems designed to prevent their achievement. Her story is not just about botanical discovery or maritime adventure.
It's about the human capacity to transcend limitations, to insist on participation in the larger world, even when that world insists you stay home and stay silent. It's about the lengths people will go to pursue their passions, and the injustice of a system that required such lengths in the first place. As we conclude this chapter, let us remember Jeanne not as a victim of historical injustice, though she certainly was that, but as an actor in her own story, a woman who made bold choices and lived an extraordinary life on her own terms within the constraints her era imposed. She saw an opportunity that came with enormous risks, and she seized it. She maintained a difficult and dangerous deception for years because the alternative was a life too small for her spirit. She contributed to human knowledge and human achievement in ways that went unacknowledged during her lifetime, but that we can acknowledge now. Jeanne Baret, the woman who became a man at sea, the first woman to circle the globe, the botanist whose work was credited to men, the adventurer who had to hide her greatest adventure. We remember you now. We name you now. We honor your courage and your contributions. Your story, so long hidden, can finally be told in full, and in the telling, it reminds us that history is full of hidden figures whose achievements we have yet to discover, whose names we have yet to restore, whose courage and intelligence we have yet to honor. May we continue to seek out these stories, to tell them fully and honestly, and to ensure that the achievements of women like Jeanne Baret are never again erased from the records of human accomplishment.
Chapter 3. Gertrude Bell, the woman who drew lines in the sand.
The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Lady Margaret Hall at Oxford University, casting geometric patterns across the wooden desk where Gertrude Bell bent over her books. It was 1888, and the young woman with piercing eyes and auburn hair pulled severely back was demonstrating once again why her tutors considered her the most brilliant student they had encountered in years. Her pen moved rapidly across the page, translating complex passages from ancient history with an ease that belied the difficulty of the text. Around her, the hushed atmosphere of serious scholarship prevailed, broken only by the scratch of pens and the occasional rustle of turning pages. But beneath this surface of academic tranquility, a profound injustice simmered. No matter how brilliantly Gertrude performed, no matter how thoroughly she mastered her subjects, she would never receive a degree from this institution. Oxford did not grant degrees to women. She could study, she could excel, she could surpass her male counterparts in every examination, but the formal recognition of her achievements would be denied simply because of her sex. This fundamental inequality would shape everything that followed in her remarkable life. Born on July 14, 1868, in Washington Hall, County Durham, Gertrude Margaret Lothian Bell entered a world of privilege and contradiction. Her father, Hugh Bell, was a wealthy ironmaster whose industrial enterprises had made the family fortune. Her mother, Mary Shield Bell, died when Gertrude was only 3 years old, leaving a void that would echo through her entire life. Her father remarried Florence Olive, a woman of considerable intellect and progressive views, who would become a formative influence on young Gertrude, encouraging her education and her aspirations in ways that were unusual for the Victorian era. The Bell household was one of wealth, certainly, but also of intellectual curiosity and social conscience. Her grandfather, Sir Isaac Lothian Bell, was not merely an industrialist, but also a scientist and a fellow of the Royal Society. Books lined the walls of their homes. Conversations at dinner ranged across politics, science, and culture, and the expectation was that minds should be cultivated regardless of gender. Yet even within this relatively enlightened environment, the constraints on women were ever present, invisible walls that limited possibilities and circumscribed ambitions. From her earliest years, Gertrude demonstrated an intellect that refused to be contained. She was voracious in her learning, impatient with limitations, and possessed of a fierce determination that sometimes manifested as stubbornness. Her governess reported that the young girl would accept nothing less than complete mastery of whatever subject she undertook, whether it was languages, history, or mathematics. This perfectionism would become both her greatest strength and, at times, a source of profound frustration. At Queen's College in London, she excelled in every subject, before proceeding to Oxford, where she would make history of a sort, even if the university refused to formally acknowledge it. At Oxford, Gertrude immersed herself in the study of modern history with a passion that impressed even the most skeptical of her tutors. She completed what would have been honors degree requirements in just 2 years instead of the usual 3, and her performance in examinations was so exceptional that had she been a man, she would have received a first-class degree with distinction.
As it was, she received nothing official, merely the private acknowledgement from her tutors that she was among the finest students they had taught. The injustice of this situation was not lost on Gertrude, but rather than embitter her, it seemed to fuel a determination to prove herself in arenas where her sex might prove less of an obstacle. She would not wait for institutions to grant her recognition. She would seize it through achievement that could not be denied or dismissed. Upon leaving Oxford in 1888, Gertrude found herself in a position familiar to many intelligent, educated women of her era. She had been given the tools to accomplish great things, but society offered her no clear path to use them. The expected trajectory was marriage to a suitable gentleman, management of a household, perhaps some charitable work or light literary pursuits. For a woman of Gertrude's intellectual firepower and ambition, this prospect was suffocating. She returned to the family home, participated in the expected social rounds, attended balls and parties, but felt increasingly restless, like a thoroughbred forced to pull a cart. Her stepmother, recognizing this frustration, suggested what would prove to be a life-altering solution: travel. In May 1892, Gertrude embarked on her first significant journey abroad, traveling to Persia to visit her uncle, Sir Frank Lascelles, who was serving as British minister in Tehran. The journey itself was an adventure, covering thousands of miles by train and carriage through landscapes that grew progressively more exotic and unfamiliar. But it was what awaited her in Persia that would truly transform her. Tehran in the 1890s was a city of contrasts, where ancient Persian culture collided with modern diplomatic intrigue, where the delicate balance of imperial powers played out against the backdrop of breathtaking architecture and harsh desert beauty. Gertrude, arriving as a young woman of 23, found herself intoxicated by the otherness of it all, the calls to prayer echoing across the city, the bazaars filled with spices and silks, the language that sounded like music to her ear. She began immediately to study Persian, applying the same fierce dedication she had brought to her Oxford studies. Within months, she was reading Persian poetry in the original and conversing with a fluency that astonished diplomats who had been posted in the country for years. It was in Tehran that Gertrude fell in love for the first time. Henry Cadogan, known as Harry, was a junior secretary at the British legation, charming, intelligent, and utterly captivated by the brilliant and brilliant Angelo Michelin. They spent hours together exploring the city, riding in the surrounding countryside, discussing literature and politics and their dreams for the future. For Gertrude, who had never experienced romantic love, the intensity of her feelings was overwhelming. Harry proposed marriage, and Gertrude accepted with joy. But when she wrote to her father requesting his blessing, she was devastated by his response. Hugh Bell considered Harry Cadogan unsuitable, a man without sufficient means or prospects, a junior diplomat unlikely to rise to significant position. He forbade the marriage. And Gertrude, despite her independence of spirit, was deeply bound to her family and particularly to her father. The conflict between her love for Harry and her duty to her father tore her apart. She pleaded, she argued, she presented every rational case she could construct, but Hugh Bell was immovable. The engagement was broken off, and Gertrude returned to England with a broken heart, riding back in the grey dampness of an English winter that matched her spirits. The heartbreak of Persia might have broken a lesser woman, driven her into a conventional marriage of convenience or a life of quiet disappointment. Instead, it forged Gertrude into something harder, more determined, and ultimately more consequential. She channeled her emotional devastation into a fierce resolve to create a life of meaning and significance on her own terms. If she could not find fulfillment in the conventional paths open to women, she would forge entirely new paths, regardless of what society expected or allowed. Travel became her outlet, her education, and eventually her profession, though she would never have used that word. Over the next few years, she embarked on a series of increasingly ambitious journeys: to Italy, where she studied Renaissance art and architecture; to Switzerland, where she became an accomplished and daring mountain climber, scaling peaks that few women and not many men had attempted; back to the Middle East, where she began the serious study of Arabic to complement her Persian. Each journey was meticulously planned and documented. Gertrude was not a tourist seeking pleasant diversions. She was a scholar and explorer seeking knowledge and understanding. She carried with her cameras, survey equipment, notebooks that she filled with detailed observations, sketches, and measurements. Her photographs from this era, many of which survive, show a remarkable eye for composition and an ethnographer's interest in capturing the details of daily life, architecture, and landscape. She was, in effect, training herself for a role that did not yet exist, that of expert in Middle Eastern culture, politics, and geography, at a time when the region is becoming increasingly important to British imperial interests. By the turn of the century, Gertrude had become a published author, writing books about her travels that combined scholarly observation with engaging narrative. Her first book, *To Persian Pagers*, published in 1894, offered British readers a glimpse into a world few of them would ever see, ringed with the authority of someone who had learned the language of deeply and engaged rich writers. Later works would include poems of Fatima Madness for translation of the Three to Persian Boat, Of the Desert and the Zode, or about her travels in Syria and Palestine. These books established her as a serious orientedist scholarese, who backed her headline and acquired the problematic annotations who would later earn through inward science critique. She was building a reputation and creating a platform and positioning herself as an expert whose knowledge was based not on library research, but on direct, often dangerous experience. In 1905, Gertrude embarked on one of the most diplomatic real expeditions, traveling through Syria and Asia Minor to study and document the evil modifications in churches. This journey divided her
What set Gertrude apart from other Orientalist travelers and scholars was the depth of her engagement and the seriousness of her purpose. She did not simply observe Middle Eastern societies from the outside. She worked diligently to understand them from within, learning not just Arabic, but the specific dialects of different tribal groups, studying the complex web of tribal alliances and enmities, the religious divisions, the historical grievances, and the political aspirations that animated the region. She recognized that the Middle East was not a static, timeless place of exotic customs, but a dynamic political landscape where modernity and tradition were in constant, sometimes violent negotiation. By 1913, Gertrude Bell had become one of the foremost authorities in Britain on the Arab world, and her knowledge was increasingly sought by government officials and military officers who recognized that the Ottoman Empire was weakening and that European powers would soon be competing for influence in its former territories. That year, she undertook what would become her most famous and most challenging expedition, a journey across the Arabian Desert from Damascus to Hale, the capital of the Rashid Emirate in Central Arabia. This expedition would test every skill she had developed over 2 decades of increasingly ambitious travels. The journey to Hale was fraught with danger from the moment of its conception. The region was politically unstable, with competing tribal factions controlling different territories, and the desert itself was unforgiving. Water sources were scarce and often controlled by hostile groups. Temperatures could soar to lethal levels during the day and plummet at night, and the navigation required constant vigilance and expertise. Few European men had successfully made this journey, and no European woman had even attempted it. When Gertrude announced her intention to travel to Hale, she was met with skepticism and dire warnings. But she had prepared meticulously, engaging the services of experienced Bedouin guides who knew the routes and the tribal politics, assembling the necessary supplies and equipment, and securing what letters of introduction and protection she could from friendly sheikhs. On December 16, 1913, Gertrude set out from Damascus with her small caravan, guides, camel drivers, servants, and a string of camels carrying supplies, tents, and water. The early stages of the journey took them through territories she knew from previous expeditions, but soon they moved beyond the boundaries of the familiar into regions that appeared on British maps only as blank spaces or speculative sketches. Gertrude's journal entries from this period conveyed both the exhilaration and the hardship of desert travel. She describes the vast undulating dunes that stretch to every horizon, the quality of light at sunrise and sunset that transformed the landscape into something otherworldly, the cold beauty of stars so numerous and bright that navigation by constellation became not just possible but reliable. But she also records the discomforts, the constant wind that drove sand into every crevice and made eating and sleeping exercises in endurance, the fear of water supplies running low, the tension whenever they spotted distant riders who might be friendly or hostile, and the physical toll of riding for hours each day in heat and cold. One scene from her journey particularly captures both her courage and her methodology. Approaching the territory controlled by a sheikh whose allegiance was uncertain, Gertrude sent word ahead announcing her arrival and requesting an audience. The response was an invitation to the sheikh's camp, and Gertrude rode in with her guides, acutely aware that she was placing herself at the mercy of a man who held absolute power in this region, and whose reaction to a European woman traveling without male European companionship was entirely unpredictable. She was ushered into the sheikh's tent, a large structure divided by curtains, with carpets covering the sand and cushions arranged for sitting. The sheikh, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and shrewd eyes, regarded her with curiosity that might have been tinged with hostility or humor. It was impossible to tell. Gertrude had dressed carefully for this meeting, wearing clothing that respected local customs while still being practical for travel. She greeted him in Arabic, observing the proper formalities, presenting small gifts she had brought for this purpose. What followed was a negotiation that lasted several hours, conducted in Arabic, with Gertrude demonstrating not just linguistic ability, but deep knowledge of tribal genealogies, historical alliances, and the complex code of hospitality and honor that governed Bedouin society. She asked permission to cross his territory, explained her interest in archaeological sites and her desire to document the history of the region, and carefully positioned herself as a scholar and observer rather than a representative of British imperial interests, though of course that distinction was far more ambiguous than she acknowledged. The sheikh, intrigued by this extraordinary woman who spoke his language, knew his culture, and showed him a respect that most Europeans did not extend to Arabs, granted his protection and assigned additional guides to ensure her safe passage through his lands. This scene would repeat itself with variations throughout her journey, Gertrude using her knowledge, her diplomatic skills, and her genuine respect for Arab culture to forge relationships that would prove crucial not just for this expedition, but for her later political work. When she finally reached Hale in February 1914, after 2 months of desert travel, Gertrude had hoped to spend considerable time exploring the region and documenting its history and architecture.
Instead, she found herself in an increasingly precarious political situation. The Rashid Emirate was in turmoil, with factional conflicts threatening to erupt into violence, and the presence of a European woman complicated an already tense situation. The emir, Mohammed ibn Rashid, received her cordially, but made it clear that she was essentially under house arrest for her own protection. For nearly 2 weeks, she was confined to a house in Hale, allowed to move about the town only under escort, her movements restricted, and her interactions carefully monitored. For Gertrude, who valued her freedom above almost everything, this confinement was maddening, but she recognized the real danger of her situation and used the time to observe what she could, take photographs when permitted, and engage in careful conversations with the women of the emir's household, gaining insights into aspects of Arabian society that were completely closed to male European travelers. Eventually, she was allowed to leave Hale, but her route was dictated by her hosts, who sent her by a more northern route back toward Damascus. The journey back was even more difficult than the outward journey, with supplies running low, tensions high among her party, and the constant uncertainty about whether they would encounter hostile forces. But by late March 1914, she arrived safely in Damascus, exhausted, thinner, weathered by sun and wind, but triumphant. She had accomplished what many had said was impossible, and the maps, photographs, and detailed journals she brought back represented an invaluable addition to British knowledge of the region. The timing of Gertrude's return from Hale proved faithful. Within months, Europe would plunge into the catastrophic conflict of World War I, and the Middle East would become a crucial theater of operations. The Ottoman Empire, allied with Germany, controlled vast territories stretching from Anatolia through Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, and the Arabian Peninsula. British strategic interests demanded not just military operations against Ottoman forces, but also political operations to foment Arab resistance to Ottoman rule. For this work, the British needed people with deep knowledge of the region, its languages, tribal structures, and political dynamics. Gertrude Bell was the obvious choice. In late 1915, Gertrude received a request from the newly established Arab Bureau in Cairo, asking her to join their intelligence operations. For Gertrude, this represented a remarkable opportunity. Her knowledge and expertise, which had been essentially a private passion pursued at her own expense, would now be put to official use in service of the nation. She would be given resources, authority, and a platform to influence actual policy. The contradiction of her situation was profound, but perhaps not fully apparent to her at the time. As a woman, she had been denied a formal degree, had no official position in academia or government, had been excluded from institutions and corridors of power throughout her life. Now, because of a global catastrophe, she would be invited into the heart of British imperial policymaking. The only woman in rooms full of military officers and colonial administrators, her expertise suddenly invaluable because it served British strategic interests. She accepted immediately and set out for Cairo. The Arab Bureau in Cairo was a collection of some of the most colorful and controversial figures in British imperial history. T.E. Lawrence, Kinahan Cornwallis, Stuart Newcomb, and others who would play crucial roles in the Arab Revolt and the subsequent reshaping of the Middle East. When Gertrude arrived, she was initially met with skepticism by some of the military officers, who were uncomfortable with a woman in her midst, but her knowledge quickly silenced doubts. She could discuss tribal politics with a depth that none of them could match. She could read intercepted Arabic documents. She knew personally many of the sheikhs and leaders who were crucial to British plans, and she brought a perspective shaped by years of direct engagement rather than just colonial administration or military operations. Her relationship with D.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, was complex. Both were brilliant, both were deeply knowledgeable about Arab culture, both were convinced of the importance of the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, and both would play crucial roles in shaping the post-war settlement. But there were significant differences in their perspectives. Lawrence was more romantic, more personally identified with the Arab cause, more troubled by the contradictions between British promises to Arab leaders and British agreements with France about post-war division of Ottoman territories. Gertrude was more practical, more willing to accept the realities of imperial power, more focused on what she saw as the constructive work of helping to establish stable Arab governments under British guidance. Later historians would debate which of them better understood the region and which caused more harm through their actions. What is clear is that Gertrude's influence on British policy was substantial. Gertrude's work for the Arab Bureau involved gathering intelligence, analyzing political developments, producing reports and memoranda for British officials, and increasingly advising on policy. Her reports from this period, many of which survive in British archives, demonstrate the breadth of her knowledge and the clarity of her analysis. She could explain the historical roots of conflicts between Sunni and Shia communities, map out the complex tribal allegiances in Mesopotamia, analyze the political ambitions of various Arab leaders, and recommend strategies for British engagement. She was, in effect, helping to construct the intellectual framework through which British policymakers understood the Middle East, a framework that would have profound and lasting consequences. In 1916, Gertrude was transferred to Basra and then to Baghdad, where she would serve as Oriental Secretary, the only woman political officer in the British forces. Baghdad during the war years was a city transformed by conflict and occupation. British and Indian troops controlled the city, the Ottoman administration had been displaced, and the future of Mesopotamia, the region that would become Iraq, was entirely uncertain. What would happen to this land that Britain had conquered militarily but had no clear plan to govern? Would it become a British colony? Would it become divided among various ethnic and religious groups? Would an Arab government be established, and if so, under whose leadership? These questions occupied British officials, Gertrude Bell being one of the most influential voices in answering them. From her office in Baghdad, Gertrude worked to understand and document the political landscape for Mesopotamia. She traveled throughout the region when security permitted, meeting with tribal sheikhs, religious leaders, urban notables, and common people. She was gathering information, certainly, but she was also building relationships and began issuing opinions about what the post-war settlement should look like. Increasingly, she became convinced that Mesopotamia should become an independent Arab kingdom under British protection, with a king who would have legitimacy both with the local population and with the British authorities. This vision would shape the decisions made at the Cairo conference in 2021, where the modern state of Iraq was essentially invented. The war ended in 1918 with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the victory of the Allied powers. The question now was what would replace the
autumn system that accompanied the Netherlands for 6 centuries. At the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 and in subsequent negotiations, Britain and France, through dominant powers in the region, agreed to divide the Ottoman era territories between the Collision and Mandate system. Syria and Lebanon would be French mandates, while Palestine's entrenchments would be French mandates. This division was formalized in a Sykes-Picot Agreement secretary that contradicted promises that had been made to Arab leaders during war about independence and self-determination. The hypocrisy and betrayal of these arrangements would poison relations between heirs and Russian powers with translations. Gertrude Bell was deeply involved in implementing British policy in this penny-trickery cruel period. She served as a key advisor to subversive causes of Persian Benjamin and Iraq, and her team was on the task of transmitting health. She was enormous. She was a strong advocate and established based on his no case but case Nabash. Like the Kings and Naples recently beyond hence without mind leadership, that it was the option self-fixed and trusting for two plus this nation as home. Angel of this health secrets must be all Charles of his with space versus not just in the first 2 inches with the state asteroid. 60 was just terrified. During the conflict, the more than has to be to break the after down the punches on the other. He's the missing out. He's scaled to both of us. Switchers. Is it really?
The most consequential work of the conference was the drawing of borders. Maps were spread out on tables, and with rulers and pencils, lines were drawn across deserts and through communities. The border between Iraq and Kuwait, the border between Iraq and Syria, the border between Transjordan and Saudi Arabia. All of these were determined by British officials who prioritized administrative convenience, protection of British interests, particularly oil, and division of territory between competing Arab leaders who might be kept balanced against each other. Ethnic, religious, and tribal realities were secondary considerations at best. The scene of Gertrude Bell in the conference room at Cairo, the only woman among all these men, bending over maps and advocating for particular borders, is one of the most powerful and troubling images in the history of modern imperialism. Here was a woman who had been denied formal recognition of her Oxford degree because of her sex, who had been excluded from official positions throughout her early career, now wielding power over the lives of millions of people, literally drawing the borders of countries. The contradictions are staggering. She was both a victim of one form of systemic injustice and an agent of another form of systemic injustice. She was both a pioneering woman breaking barriers and a colonial administrator imposing European will on non-European peoples. She genuinely cared about Arab culture and Arab welfare, yet she was implementing a system that denied Arabs full self-determination and divided them in ways that served British rather than Arab interests. After the Cairo conference, Gertrude returned to Baghdad to oversee the implementation of the decisions that had been made. She was instrumental in organizing the referendum that was supposed to legitimize Faisal's selection as king, though the referendum was carefully managed to ensure the desired outcome. She helped draft the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty that established the terms of British protection over the new kingdom. She advised Faisal on cabinet appointments, on relations with tribal leaders, on the delicate balance between modernizing the state and respecting traditional power structures. She was for a time perhaps the single most powerful person in Iraq after the king himself, and certainly more knowledgeable about the country's complexities than any other British official. Her relationship with Faisal was central to her work during these years. She had great respect for him, saw him as a moderate and intelligent leader who could navigate between British expectations and Arab aspirations, and genuinely believed that she was helping him to establish a stable and eventually independent Iraq. Faisal, for his part, recognized Gertrude's influence and cultivated the relationship, consulting with her regularly, valuing her advice even when he did not always follow it. They shared a certain tragic awareness of the contradictions of their situation. He was a king without real power, ruling over a country that had been created by foreigners for foreign purposes, trying to build genuine legitimacy while dependent on British support. She was the expert who had helped create this situation and who was now trying to make it work despite its fundamental problems. The private conversations between them, glimpsed in fragmentary records and memoirs, reveal two intelligent people grappling with a situation that neither could fully control, and whose ultimate failure both perhaps sensed but neither could acknowledge. Beyond her political work, Gertrude poured enormous energy into cultural preservation and education in Iraq. She was the founder and first director of the Baghdad Archaeological Museum, which would become one of the region's most important institutions, though it would suffer terribly during later conflicts, particularly the looting that followed the 2003 American invasion. Gertrude worked to establish laws protecting archaeological sites from looting and unauthorized excavation, to train Iraqi staff in museum management and archaeological methods, and to ensure that Iraq's extraordinary cultural heritage would be preserved and studied. This work represented perhaps the most ambiguously positive aspect of her legacy, though even here questions about who controls cultural artifacts and how colonial powers appropriated the heritage of colonized peoples complicate any simple assessment.
As the 1920s progressed, Gertrude became increasingly aware of the problems of the system she had helped to create. The borders drawn in Cairo were proving as problematic as critics had warned. The combination of Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish populations within Iraq's artificial borders was difficult to govern, with each group having different visions for the country's future and different levels of acceptance of Faisal's monarchy and British oversight. Tribal leaders resented the centralized state that diminished their traditional authority. Urban intellectuals wanted more complete independence from Britain than the mandate system allowed. The economic resources of the country, particularly oil, were controlled by British companies under terms that most Iraqis considered exploitative. Kurdish populations in the north had been promised autonomy or even independence during the war, but found themselves incorporated into Iraq against their will. Gertrude, whose reports to British officials had been so confident and authoritative during the establishment of the Ulurki state, began to express doubts and concerns in her private correspondence. She saw that good intentions and expert knowledge were not sufficient to overcome the fundamental problems of the imperial project. In her letters to her father, her stepmother, and close friends, there are hints of disillusionment, a growing awareness that the neat lines drawn on maps in Cairo corresponded to messy, uncontrollable realities on the ground. She remained committed to making the British mandate work, but the confidence and optimism of earlier years had been severed by experience. Her health, never robust, began to deteriorate under the stress of her work in the harsh climate. She suffered from recurring illnesses, periods of exhaustion, and increasing insomnia. She had always pushed herself hard, demanded perfection, worked long hours without adequate rest, and now, in her 50s, the accumulated toll was becoming evident. She remained intellectually sharp and fully engaged in her work, but friends noted that she seemed tired, sometimes melancholy, less resilient in the face of setbacks. On the night of July 11, 1926, Gertrude Bell died in her home in Baghdad from an overdose of sleeping pills. She was 57 years old. The official determination was that the overdose was accidental, the result of her taking additional pills after the first dose failed to bring sleep, but many who knew her suspected suicide, though no one could say so publicly at the time. She had been unwell, certainly, suffering from pleurisy and exhaustion, but she had also seemed increasingly despondent about the state of affairs in Iraq, about her own health and prospects, about the life she had built and now seemed to be crumbling. She left no note, so her final thoughts remain unknown. The memorial service in Baghdad was attended by King Faisal and the entire British and Iraqi establishment, attested nefiyas. She was buried in the British cemetery in Baghdad, and the inscription on her grave, chosen by her father, reads simply, Gertrude Margaret Bell, CBE, 1868-1926. Assessing Gertrude Bell's legacy requires holding contradictory truths in tension. She was undeniably a pioneering woman who broke barriers, achieved recognition in fields dominated by men, and wielded political power in ways that were almost unprecedented for a woman of her era. She was a serious scholar who made genuine contributions to archaeology, history, and ethnography. She was an extraordinary traveler and explorer who demonstrated physical courage and intellectual rigor. She genuinely cared about Arab culture and Arab people, learned their languages, respected their traditions, and advocated for their interests as she understood them. All of this is true. It is also true that she was an agent of British imperialism at a crucial moment of imperial overreach, that she helped design and implement a system of control that denied Arabs full self-determination, and at the border she helped draw creative problems that continue to fuel conflict and suffering a century later, and that her expertise was ultimately deployed in service of British interests rather than Arab welfare, regardless of her intentions. The Iraq she helped create has been racked by coups, wars, state-aid-of-ship, foreign invasion, and civil conflict almost continuously since its found. The artificial borders forced inclusion of populations with different visions for their future, the structure of governance that concentrated power in ways that invite hearing, the external interference in internal affairs. All of these problems were present at the creation, and Gertrude Bell was present at the creation. To what extent is she responsible for what followed? This is the question historians continue to debate. Some argue that she was simply a product of her time, that she worked within the concerns of being a creative assistant and did the best she could with women in office, that she changingly tried to serve Arab interests that she understood that. Stoic in believing that she sent systems of censorship, she set off listening on about Hauser's actions. Others argue that fundamental problems were educated at the times, and critics imply that she prioritized British imperial interest in surrogate self-determination, and if expertise deployed in service of injustice remains complicit in justice regardless of intentions. Perhaps the famous assessment is that Gertrude Bell was a brilliant, courageous, complex woman which did extraordinary things at her own terms, but whose most consequential work was fundamentally compromised by the imperial context in which she operated. She broke barriers as women while helping to construct barriers for Arabs. She was both during her tenure, both respectful to the culture and agent of British control of Arab plants, or alive illuminates the profit contradictions of her era when European imperialism instead of sent aid to top bridges that eventually bring it to Mount The borders she helped draw in 1921 still appear on maps today, and the consequences of those borders still shape in Western politics, conflicts, and international relations. The modern conflicts in Iraq, the struggles of Kurdish populations divided among lawful services, the tensions between Sunni and Jihad communities forced into uneasy coexistence, the foreign interventions justified by instability, all of these have roots that triggered the decisions made by people like Gertrude Bell. And this edge, your legacy is not past but wrong, she's flipped in that past, and finds you trying to stand improvement in anything but depth. In her final years, alone in her study in Baghdad, surrounded by past representatives' great achievements and his most consequential mistakes, Gertrude Bell understood this. She had spent her life pursuing great knowledge of enough. She had more than almost anyone that her parent could have acted possible, reshaped the destiny of nations. But she had also had that expertise in her good intentions are not sufficient to overcome the fundamental problems and until seems eternal solutions from conflict societies. But the unsense and the constant decisions of her and the fully progressive as a woman of the vision in those life harsher than impermanence through the first instance, and endure far than any hesitate, and this is far more tragic than the explode. This is her legacy, extraordinary and tragic. I am encouraged to give out a picture of the board of here, trial and one small.
Chapter 4. Annie Smith Peck, Climbing Mountains,
shattering ceilings.
The lecture hall at the University of Michigan fell silent as Annie Smith Peck entered the classroom, her footsteps echoing against hardwood floors worn smooth by decades of scholarly pursuit. It was 1878, and she was 28 years old, one of only a handful of women permitted to pursue graduate studies at the institution. The young men already seated turned in their chairs, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism, still others with open hostility at this intrusion into their masculine domain. Annie felt their eyes upon her as she chose a seat near the front, not the very front, which would be interpreted as presumptuous, but close enough to see the blackboard clearly and signal her serious intent. She opened her leather satchel and removed her notebook, pen, and inkwell with deliberate care, each movement precise and controlled, refusing to let trembling hands betray the anxiety churning beneath her composed exterior. The professor, a distinguished gentleman with impressive side whiskers and a reputation for classical scholarship, paused his preparation at the lectern and regarded her with an expression that managed to convey both surprise and resignation, as though she were an unexpected but inevitable complication he must accommodate. This was her reality, every classroom a battlefield, every lecture a test, not merely of intellectual capacity, but of her right to be there at all. Born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1850, Annie had grown up in a family that valued education, at least for its sons. Her brothers had been encouraged toward university, toward professions, toward the wide world of masculine achievement. For Annie and her sister, the expectation had been different. Accomplishment within limits, education sufficient for cultured conversation but not professional aspiration, preparation for marriage and domestic management rather than independence and intellectual pursuit. But Annie had never accepted these boundaries. Even as a child, she had resented the invisible walls that constrained her curiosity, the unspoken rules that dictated which books were appropriate, which subjects too challenging, which ambitions unseemly for a young woman of good family. She had excelled at Providence High School, had read voraciously beyond her assigned curriculum, had mastered languages with an aptitude her teachers acknowledged with surprise tinged with discomfort. When she had announced her intention to attend college, her family's reaction had been mixed. Pride in her abilities tempered by concern about her marriageability, admiration for her determination shadowed by worry about her future. What man would want a wife more educated than himself? What role could such education serve in a woman's proper sphere? These questions hung unspoken in parlor conversations, whispered among relatives, implied in the well-meaning advice of family friends. Annie had heard them all, and had proceeded anyway with the quiet stubbornness that would characterize her entire life. She had earned her bachelor's degree, then her master's, proving herself again and again in classrooms where her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, where her contributions were met with surprise rather than acceptance. Now, beginning her teaching career at Purdue University as an instructor of Latin, she carried with her not just classical knowledge, but an acute awareness that every woman who aspired to intellectual achievement walked a narrow path between proving capability and threatening convention. The young men in her classes at Purdue initially tested her, pushing boundaries, questioning her authority with a brazenness they would never display toward male professors. Annie responded not with anger, but with impeccable preparation, with knowledge so comprehensive and presentation so polished that skepticism gradually, grudgingly gave way to respect. She taught Latin with precision and passion, bringing ancient texts alive, demonstrating connections between classical civilization and contemporary concerns, proving again and again that gender had no bearing on scholarly rigor or teaching excellence. Yet even as she established herself in academia, Annie felt a restlessness she couldn't quite name. Teaching satisfied her intellectually but left something fundamental untouched, some hunger for experience beyond library stacks and lecture halls, beyond the carefully regulated world of feminine propriety and masculine condescension. She traveled when she could, spending summers in Europe, visiting archaeological sites and museums, expanding her horizons beyond the prescribed limits of domestic tourism. It was during these travels, exploring Switzerland with the combination of scholarly interest and tourism curiosity typical of educated Americans abroad, that Annie's life changed irrevocably. She was 44 years old, an age when most women of her era had long since settled into predictable patterns, when adventure was considered unseemly and physical challenge inappropriate. But standing in the shadow of the Matterhorn, that iconic pyramid of rock and ice towering above Zermatt, Annie felt something awake in her that had nothing to do with classical scholarship or academic achievement. She watched climbers preparing for their ascents, studying their equipment, their purposeful movements, the way they examined the mountain with calculating eyes. She listened to their conversations about routes and conditions, about technical challenges and strategic decisions, and she thought, I could do that.
The idea was absurd, of course. Women didn't climb mountains, or at least not seriously, not the dangerous peaks that represent genuine challenges. There were occasional accounts of ladies being escorted up moderate slopes by patient guides, treated as delicate cargo to be carefully managed rather than capable climbers. But what Annie observed on the Matterhorn was different, real mountaineering, demanding skill and strength, courage and endurance. Everything in her upbringing told her this was impossible, inappropriate, unthinkable for a woman of her age and station. Everything in her spirit told her it was exactly what she had been seeking without knowing it. She hired a guide not for a gentle tourist excursion, but for a genuine attempt on the Matterhorn itself. The guide was skeptical, certainly, but Annie's determination and her willingness to pay convinced him to at least attempt the climb. That ascent, accomplished in 1888, transformed Annie's understanding of what was possible. The physical challenge surpassed anything she had experienced. The relentless exertion as they climbed hour after hour, the thin air that made every breath a conscious effort, the exposure that sent ice water through her veins whenever she looked down at the dizzying drops below. But alongside the hardship came acceleration unlike anything in her previous experience. The focused clarity required to move safely across difficult terrain, the satisfaction of solving physical problems through skill and determination, the profound joy of standing on a summit and seeing the world spread out below in all directions. These experiences struck something fundamental in Annie's nature. For the first time in her life, she felt completely present, completely alive, completely herself, without the constant awareness of performing femininity or defending her right to pursue intellectual work. The mountain didn't care about her gender or her age. It presented challenges that must be met with technique and courage, with planning and persistence. Success or failure depended entirely on her own capabilities, not on society's judgments about appropriate feminine behavior. This realization was intoxicating. Annie returned from Switzerland with a new passion and a new purpose. She began to study mountaineering systematically, reading accounts of major expeditions, learning about equipment and techniques, identifying peaks that represented progressively greater challenges. She started planning guides with the same scholarly rigor she brought to classical texts, researching routes and conditions, corresponding with guides and other climbers, preparing herself physically for the extraordinary demands of high-altitude mountaineering. Her friends and colleagues were baffled by this strange new obsession. Some found it amusing, an eccentric hobby for a spinster academic. Others considered it alarming evidence of instability or inappropriate ambition. Annie ignored them all. She had spent her entire life accommodating others' expectations, proving herself in environments designed to exclude her, moderating her ambitions to avoid threatening masculine pride. On the mountains, none of that mattered. There were simply problems to solve, challenges to overcome, summits to reach. The question of what she would wear while climbing, however, became a public scandal that revealed everything about Victorian society's priorities. The climbing outfits of the era were designed for men: knickerbockers or long trousers, woolen shirts and jackets, sturdy boots, practical clothing that allowed freedom of movement and provided protection from cold and weather. Women who ventured to the mountains were expected to maintain propriety by wearing skirts, despite the obvious impracticality and genuine danger of attempting technical climbing in long, heavy fabric that caught on rocks, absorbed moisture, and restricted movement. Annie, with her characteristic practicality, designed her own climbing outfit: knickerbockers and trousers under a short tunic that preserved modesty while allowing the freedom of movement essential for safe climbing. When she appeared in this outfit for her climbs in the late 1890s, the response was explosive. Newspapers devoted columns not to her climbing achievements, but to shuck-a-cock to comment out her attire. Editorial writers pontificated about the moral dangers of women wearing trousers, the theft of feminine delicacy, the breakdown of proper gender distinctions. Clergy preached sermons using Annie as an example of modern woman's alarming rejection of actual rules. Cartoonists produced mocking illustrations. Photographers sought images of Annie or her climbing costume to satisfy public curiosity about this scandalous outfit. The controversy was simultaneously infuriating and revealing. Annie had solved a practical problem, how to climb safely, but society was far more interested in policing women's clothing and acknowledging women's achievements. She responded with a mixture of principled defense and tactical savvy. In interviews and lectures, she pointed out the absurdity of expecting women to risk death for the sake of propriety, noting that no one suggested male climbers should attend technical ascents in evening dress. She documented the danger of skirts on mountains, describing incidents where women had been injured or killed because their clothing caught on mountains or ice. But she also emphasized that her clothing preserved modesty through its tunic design, that she never climbed in mixed parties that might create inappropriate situations, that her behavior remained beyond reproach even as her attire challenged convention. Gradually, and shock subsided, that the debate continued throughout her climbing career. Annie's practical climbing outfit became one of her signatures, a visual symbol of her refusal to let social convention interfere with rational action. Young women wrote to her asking for patterns, inspired by her example to claim practical clothing for their own athletic pursuits. Reformers championed her as evidence that women's fashion could evolve toward help and functionality rather than remaining trapped in dangerous impracticality. Throughout the shoulder where Annie began to climb it, she tackled peaks throughout Europe and South America, systematically building her skills and experience, pushing her capabilities to prepare for the ultimate challenge she had set herself, conquering one of the highest unclimbed peaks in the Western Hemisphere. That being was Mount Huascarán in Peru, a massive mountain in the Cordillera Blanca range rising to approximately 28,000 feet and summit shrouded in ice and snow and slopes steep and treacherous. Its altitude sufficient to cause serious physiological challenges. When Annie first learned about Huascarán, she was immediately captivated by the challenge it represented. This would be no tourist climb or guided excursion. It would require serious expedition planning, significant funding, expert mountaineering style, and extraordinary physical endurance. It would also make her the first woman to climb a peak as intensive, getting a record that would have been respected even from her harsh critics. The fact that most of those critics considered the goal impossible for a woman of any age, certainly absurd for a woman in her 50s, failing intensified Annie's determination. Mounting an expedition to Peru in the early 1900s presented challenges
funds, a constant struggle throughout her mountaineering. Male climbers can approach geographical societies, will be patrons to universities and corporations for expedition funding, and eager on these stories closed. She financed her expedition through lecturing, writing articles, case slide presentations, and accepted sponsors in exchange for naming mountains or cruising flags summits. This funding consumed enormous energy and forced compromises she resented, but it was the price for sweeter passion without independent wealth or institutional support. She had to recruit guides that to work for a women which workers to complete intelligence code hierarchies. She had to plan logistics before a country, arrange transportation through difficult terrain, and manage expeditions where her authority was constantly questioned by men not accustomed to taking immersion from within. Every aspect of decision planning was complicated by her gender and wasted sail climbers in new encounter. Annie's first tender Oscar Route 54, followed to nothing will form later. The approach to the Santa Valley requires confused and difficult travel, followed by the establishment of base camp on the mountain's floor slopes. The class itself, the cabin, the house, the house, the rapid, and other sons be as the day or us and every move. Deal with torment and fluffer to defendable truth. On the first attack session, the cards reached approximately 18,000 feet before we forced back by Enders. During the one synthetic failure was frustrating, but often expecting retort to by sending analyzed with flying rockets from the horses or never met.
The summit itself was a narrow ridge of snow and ice, buffeted by wind, the view extending across the Cordillera Blanca in all directions. Annie stood there exhausted beyond measure, frostbitten and oxygen-deprived, and experienced a triumph that transcended mountaineering. This wasn't simply about reaching a summit. It was about proving what women could achieve when given opportunity and refusing to accept imposed limitations. It was about demonstrating that age and gender were not destiny, that determination and skill mattered more than society's expectations. And Annie made certain the political meaning of her achievement was unmistakable. She had carried with her to the summit a banner reading "Votes for Women," a pennant representing the suffrage movement, then fighting for women's political rights throughout the United States and Europe. She planted that banner at the top of Huascarán, photographing it flapping in the wind above the Andes, making explicit the connection between her mountaineering achievement and the broader struggle for women's equality. The gesture was deliberate and powerful. Annie had always understood her climbing as political action, as demonstration that women possessed capabilities society denied them. By placing a suffrage banner on one of the highest peaks in the Western Hemisphere, she created a visual metaphor, women reaching the highest heights, claiming spaces previously reserved for men, planting flags of political demand in the most visible possible locations. The image of that banner at the summit, distributed through newspapers and magazines, became iconic in the suffrage movement, evidence that women's aspirations knew no bounds. The descent from Huascarán was in some ways more dangerous than the ascent, as exhaustion made every movement more difficult and judgment less reliable. But Annie made it down safely, returned to base camp, and then began the long journey back to civilization, carrying with her the proof of her achievement, photographs, measurements, the testimony of her guides. The response to her success was complex and revealing. Many celebrated her achievement, recognizing the extraordinary nature of what she had accomplished. Geographical societies acknowledged her altitude record. The suffrage movement embraced her as a heroic figure, proof of women's unlimited potential. Young women wrote to her expressing inspiration, describing how her example gave them courage to pursue their own unconventional dreams. But alongside celebration came dismissal and minimization. Some commentators questioned whether she had truly reached the summit, despite photographic evidence and guide testimony. Others suggested her guides had essentially carried her up, that she deserved no real credit for the achievement. Still others argued that mountaineering was a pointless vanity, that Annie should have devoted her energy to more traditionally feminine pursuits. The criticism revealed the fundamental challenge faced by pioneering women. Success threatened entrenched assumptions about gender and capability, and those assumptions defended themselves through skepticism, minimization, and outright denial. Annie responded to both celebration and criticism by continuing to climb. She wasn't finished, not by a long measure. In 1911, at age 61, she organized an expedition to Mount Corapuna in Peru, a peak she believed might be higher than Huascarán, though poorly surveyed and unmeasured. This expedition was explicitly scientific. Annie wanted to measure Corapuna's exact altitude, settling the question of which peak was highest in Peru. The expedition succeeded in making the first ascent and conducting altitude measurements that contributed to geographical knowledge. Annie climbed Corapuna despite her age, despite the accumulated physical toll of previous expeditions, despite everyone who suggested she should retire gracefully and rest on her laurels. But rest wasn't in Annie's nature. She had spent too many years fighting for opportunities to stop when she still had goals to achieve. Between expeditions, Annie became one of the most popular speakers on the American lecture circuit. She traveled constantly, presenting slideshows of her climbs to audiences across the country, from small-town lyceums to major urban venues.
These lectures served multiple purposes. They financed her expeditions, providing the income she needed for the constant fundraising that male climbers achieve through patronage. They also gave her a platform for advocacy. Annie never presented simply travelogues or adventure stories. She used her expeditions as evidence in arguments for women's suffrage, for women's education, for expanding opportunities across all sectors of society. She stood before audiences in proper Victorian dress, projecting respectability, and told stories of climbing mountains in trousers, of leading expeditions, of achieving goals that required courage and capability. The juxtaposition was deliberate. She could perform appropriate femininity when social context required it, but she refused to let those performances limit what she actually did. Her message was clear. Women could navigate both worlds, could be both respectable and adventurous, could claim traditionally masculine achievements without abandoning feminine identity. Her audiences were captivated. Annie was an excellent speaker, combining adventure narrative with humor, scientific observation with political argument, creating presentations that entertained while challenging assumptions. She displayed photographs of herself in climbing attire, inviting audiences to see there was nothing improper or unfeminine about practical clothing. She described technical climbing challenges in detail, demonstrating her expertise and the serious nature of her achievements. She spoke about the suffrage movement, connecting her personal accomplishments to the broader struggle for women's political rights, arguing that if women could climb the highest mountains, they could certainly exercise informed political judgment. These lectures made Annie a public figure, recognized across America as a symbol of female achievement, but they also revealed the limitations of fame. Despite her accomplishments in public recognition, mountaineering organizations continued to exclude her. The American Alpine Club, the premier mountaineering organization in the United States, refused her membership for years, despite credentials that would have guaranteed admission for any male climber. The rationale, when stated at all, involved vague references to maintaining standards and ensuring a serious commitment to mountaineering. But the reality was simple gender discrimination. Annie applied repeatedly, was rejected repeatedly, and continued achieving climbing goals that surpassed most male members' accomplishments. The exclusion was galling not simply because of wounded pride, but because membership in mountaineering organizations provided access to resources, information, and networks that facilitated expeditions. By excluding women, these organizations created additional barriers to female achievement, making every expedition harder than it needed to be. Annie confronted this exclusion directly, writing letters to organization leaders, publishing articles questioning their policies, and using her platform to criticize the hypocrisy of organizations that claimed to value mountaineering achievement while excluding accomplished climbers based on gender. Her advocacy contributed to eventual policy changes, though she herself was often excluded from the benefits. As Annie moved through her 60s and into her 70s, she remained extraordinarily active. She continued climbing, continued lecturing, continued writing, refusing to let age become the limitation that gender had failed to be. She traveled through South America multiple times, climbing lesser-known peaks, conducting geographical research, expanding knowledge of mountain ranges that had been inadequately surveyed. She wrote books about her expeditions, including accounts that became source material for geographical societies and later mountaineers. She maintained correspondence of suffragists, mountaineers, and young women inspired by her example, offering encouragement and practical advice. Her energy seemed inexhaustible, her determination undiminished by decades of fighting for recognition and opportunity. In her 80s, Annie was still climbing. At age 82, she ascended Mount Madison in New Hampshire, not because it was particularly difficult, but because she wanted to prove that age need not mean the end of physical activity or adventure. The climb attracted considerable press attention, with newspapers marveling at the elderly woman still pursuing mountaineering when most people her age had retired to comfortable inactivity. Annie used this attention to promote her consistent message: capability, not age or gender, should determine what individuals could achieve. She advocated for older women to remain active, for society to stop treating aging as inevitable decline, for everyone to pursue passions regardless of society's expectations about appropriate behavior for different life stages. Annie Smith Peck died in 1935 at age 84, still planning expeditions, still advocating for women's rights, still refusing to accept limitations. Her death occasioned obituaries that celebrated her achievements while often struggling to categorize her. She didn't fit neatly into conventional narratives. She wasn't simply a mountaineer, though her climbing achievements were extraordinary. She wasn't simply a suffragist, though she explicitly connected her expeditions to political activism. She wasn't simply an educator or scholar, though she maintained those identities throughout her life. She was all these things simultaneously, a pioneer who refused to choose between intellectual work and physical adventure, between respectable femininity and unconventional achievement, between personal goals and political advocacy. Looking back on Annie's life and career reveals consistent themes that extended far beyond mountaineering. Her fundamental challenge was against limitation itself, against the artificial restraints society placed on human potential based on gender, age, or social position. She spent her childhood and young adulthood fighting for educational opportunities that should have been available, but were systematically denied to women. She spent her middle years pursuing a passion for mountaineering that society considered inappropriate for women, particularly women of her age. She spent her later years advocating for political and social changes that would expand opportunities for all women. In each arena, she faced skepticism, discrimination, and outright hostility. And in each arena, she persisted until she achieved her goals, then used those achievements as platforms for advocating broader change. Her mountaineering career exemplified this approach. Every summit she reached became evidence that women's supposed physical limitations were social constructions rather than biological realities. Every expedition she organized and led challenged assumptions about women's organizational capabilities, leadership abilities, and technical expertise. Every lecture she delivered connected personal achievement to political activism, transforming mountaineering from individual accomplishment to feminist demonstration. She understood that representation mattered, that visibility changed possibility, that seeing a bullet succeed at supposedly impossible tasks expanded horizons for all women.
The symbolic power of her planting a Boats for Women banner on Wascaron Summit crystallized this understanding. That gesture said, women can reach the highest places, overcome the most daunting obstacles, and plant our flags where no one expected us to go. The metaphor was unmistakable and powerful, translating political demands in visual form that transcended language and culture. Annie also understood that achievement required more patronation. It required resources, access, opportunity, and support, all of which were systematically denied to women. Her constant struggle for expedition funding, her exclusion from mountaineering organizations, the skepticism she faced from guides and portage, the dismissal of her achievements by critics, all demonstrated how barriers operated not simply through explicit prohibition, but through accumulated disadvantages that made success exponentially more difficult. Yet she succeeded anyway, and in doing so provided a template for other women facing similar barriers. Her method was systematic persistence: identify goals, develop necessary skills, attempt achievement, and document results, and use success as leverage for the next challenge. She didn't wait for permission or approval. She acted, achieved, and dealt with consequences afterwards. This approach was radical in her era, when women were expected to seek approval before acting, to defer and male authority, to accept limitations as natural, and challenge them as unjust. Anne's correspondence and writings reveal someone deeply conscious of her pioneering goals. She saved rejection letters from the Mountaineering clubs as documentation of discrimination. She preserved newspaper clippings about the trouser controversy as evidence of society's place to cadets. She collected letters from young women inspired by her example, recognizing these as proof that representation mattered. She was creating an archetype of women's achievement, and married to that achievement, documenting both success and the obstacles overcome. This consciousness of legacy reflected Annie's understanding that her individual achievements have collective purposes. She weren't simply climbing for personal satisfaction. She was demonstrating possibility, expanding imagination, creating President Prescott that other women with friendly and calls. Every stack filled with Faith Mullins, physical careers to Andrew pioneers like Andrew who refused to accept the body it was and insisted creating what it should be. The Lady Margaret Hall, the difference from crime fighting gave into its complications. She became famous. There was temptation to sanitize her story, thinking more powerful for Nellie's specific mental offer over the representation. Sometimes that was actually Japanese centric personal situation and rising in the power of the time in the histories of the honor of all influence that was having sense of the Peter was president. And his own criticism is on the best
Chapter 5. Nellie Bly, Racing Around the World in 72 Days. On a bitter January evening in 1885, Elizabeth Cochrane sat in her modest Pittsburgh home reading the local newspaper by lamplight, her fingers tightening around the pages with each passing line. The Pittsburgh Dispatch had published a column titled "What Girls Are Good For," a sneering dismissal of women's capabilities that relegated them to domestic service and marriage, suggesting that those who sought employment outside the home were aberrations, unfeminine creatures destined for unhappiness. Elizabeth, barely 20 years old and already supporting her widowed mother through a patchwork of uncertain work, felt her blood rise with each condescending sentence. The writer, who hid behind the pseudonym Quiet Observer, painted a picture of women as delicate, simple-minded creatures who should be grateful for male protection and who had no business troubling themselves with the affairs of the world beyond their parlors. By the time Elizabeth reached the end of the piece, her hands were shaking, not with fear or submission, but with righteous fury. She pushed back from the small writing desk, took up her pen, and began to write. The words flowed from her in a torrent, each sentence sharp as a blade, each argument built on the foundation of her own experience and observation. She wrote of women who worked because they must, because starvation cared nothing for feminine delicacy. She wrote of the intellectual capacity women possessed, but were denied the opportunity to develop. She wrote of the artificial constraints society placed on half its population, wasting talent and potential in service to outdated prejudices. She signed the letter "Lonely Orphan Girl" and posted it to the Dispatch before she could reconsider. Days later, George Madden, the paper's managing editor, published her response prominently and placed an advertisement seeking to identify the author. If the writer of the communication signed "Lonely Orphan Girl" will send her name and address to this office merely as a guarantee of good faith, she will confer a favor and receive the information she desires. When Elizabeth presented herself at the newspaper office, Madden was struck by her passion and clarity of thought. Within weeks, she had her first assignment. Within months, she had adopted the pen name Nellie Bly, taken from a popular Stephen Foster song, and begun a career that would transform journalism itself. This was not the beginning of a society columnist or a writer of domestic advice. This was the birth of someone who would use journalism as a weapon against injustice, who would put herself in danger to expose truth, who would quite literally race around the world to prove what women could accomplish. Elizabeth Cochrane became Nellie Bly, and in doing so became a force that would challenge everything the Quiet Observer believed about what girls were good for. Nellie's early assignments for the Pittsburgh Dispatch revealed both her talents and the fundamental tensions that would define her career.
She had been hired because of her fierce intelligence and her willingness to speak uncomfortable truths, yet the newspaper constantly tried to channel her energies into conventional women's topics. She was assigned theater reviews, fashion commentary, and gardening columns, the typical fare deemed appropriate for lady journalists. But Nellie chafed against these constraints. She wanted to write about the conditions in factories where women worked 16-hour days for pennies. She wanted to investigate the slums where families crowded into rooms without sanitation or light. She wanted to expose the corruption that allowed such suffering to persist while the powerful grew richer. Occasionally, her editors relented, and these pieces showcased her revolutionary approach to journalism. Rather than interviewing authorities or relying on official statements, Nellie went directly to the source. She visited tenements and spoke with the women living there. She took jobs in factories to experience the conditions firsthand. She went into neighborhoods that respectable women supposedly never entered, and she returned with stories that made readers uncomfortable, that challenged their assumptions, that demanded action. Her piece on the conditions facing female factory workers in Pittsburgh was particularly striking, describing in vivid detail the dangerous machinery, the toxic substances, the sexual harassment, and the bare survival wages. The article created a sensation and brought angry responses from factory owners who accused Nellie of exaggeration and sensationalism. But she had been there, she had seen it, she had the evidence of her own experience. This became her method, immersive journalism that placed her body and her freedom at risk to gather evidence that could not be dismissed. Yet for every hard-hitting investigative piece, her editors assigned her a dozen articles on flower arranging or the latest hat fashions. The message was clear. She was allowed occasional forays into serious journalism, but her place was ultimately on the society pages. After several years of this frustrating pattern, Nellie made a bold decision. She told her editors she wanted to travel to Mexico and write about the country and its people. Perhaps they agreed because they thought it would get her out of their hair for a while, or perhaps they recognized that a series of travel errors from an exotic location might sell papers. Whatever their reasoning, they approved her trip. Nellie spent 6 months in Mexico, and the articles she sent back were unlike typical travelogues. She wrote about political corruption, the vast gulf between rich and poor, the oppression of indigenous peoples, and the iron-fisted rule of dictator Porfirio Diaz. Her reporting was so critical that the Mexican government threatened to arrest her, and she had to flee the country suddenly, crossing back into Texas with little more than what she could carry. The experience taught her that truth-telling had consequences, that powerful interests did not appreciate exposure, and that being a woman offered no protection when she threatened the status quo. It also taught her that she needed a bigger stage, a platform where her work would have greater impact and where editors might be more willing to support her investigations. In 1887, she left Pittsburgh for New York City, determined to work for one of the major metropolitan newspapers where real journalism happened. She had a portfolio of clippings, modest savings that would last perhaps a few weeks, and a determination that bordered on recklessness. New York City in the 1880s was a cauldron of wealth and poverty, innovation and exploitation, possibility and danger. It was also a city where newspapers competed fiercely for readers, where sensational stories sold copies, and where editors were willing to take risks if it meant outselling the competition. Nellie's timing in arriving in New York could not have been better, though she could not have known it. The newspaper business was in the midst of transformation, with a new style of journalism emerging that would come to be called yellow journalism. The term would later take on pejorative connotations, suggesting reckless sensationalism and disregard for truth, but in its early days it represented a democratization of news. Publishers like Joseph Pulitzer, who had purchased the New York World in 1883, believed that newspapers should appeal to working-class immigrants, not just the educated elite. This meant stories written in accessible language, attention-grabbing headlines, illustrations and cartoons, and content that focused on subjects affecting ordinary people: crime, corruption, working conditions, and human interest stories that provoked emotional responses. Pulitzer had transformed the World from a struggling paper into the highest circulation newspaper in the country by embracing this approach. But he needed reporters who could deliver the kind of stories his readers craved, journalists who were willing to go where the stories were, to take risks, to write with passion as well as accuracy. When Nellie Bly walked into the offices of the New York World seeking employment, she was exactly the kind of reporter Pulitzer's operation needed, though it took some convincing. She had to wait for weeks to get an audience with an editor, surviving on her dwindling savings and growing increasingly desperate. When she finally secured a meeting, she came prepared with her clippings and her ideas, but she faced the same skepticism she had encountered throughout her career. Women journalists were still novelties, confined largely to specific types of stories. The World employed some women writers, but primarily for the women's pages. Nellie insisted she could deliver the kind of investigative journalism that sold papers. She pitched several ideas, each one more daring than the last, until she landed on the proposal that would make her famous. She would feign insanity and get herself committed to the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island, then write an exposé from inside. The asylum had been the subject of rumors for years, whispers of abuse and neglect, but no one had been able to get him inside to document the conditions. Official inspections were announced in advance, allowing administrators to prepare and present a sanitized version of reality. What was needed was an undercover investigation, someone who could experience the asylum as the patients did and then report on what she found. It was dangerous, potentially even life-threatening. If Nellie's sanity act was too convincing, she might not be able to get out. If asylum officials discovered her deception while she was in their custody, there was no telling what might happen to her. But the World's editors saw the potential for a blockbuster story, and Nellie was willing to take the risk. They worked out a plan. Nellie would check into a boarding house and begin acting strangely. When she was committed, the newspaper would intervene after 10 days to secure her release. Nellie threw herself into the role with the same totality she brought to all her work. She rehearsed expressions in the mirror, practiced the vacant stare she had observed in people with mental illness, prepared to become someone else entirely. On a September evening in 1887, Nellie checked into a temporary home for women on 2nd Avenue run by a woman named Mrs. Irene Stennard. She signed the register as Nellie Brown, claiming to be from Cuba and seeking work in the city. From the moment she entered, she began her performance. She refused to go to bed, instead sat in the parlor with a wild, frightened look, startling at every sound. She complained that the other residents looked crazy, that they frightened her, that she could not remember how she had gotten there. Mrs. Stennard, increasingly alarmed by her strange boarder, eventually called the police. Nellie was taken to court for a sanity hearing, where she maintained her disturbed act before a judge. She trembled and spoke incoherently, insisted she could not remember her past, and exhibited all the behaviors expected of someone experiencing a mental break. The judge committed her to Bellevue Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. At Bellevue, Nellie was examined by several doctors, all of whom concluded she was insane. One doctor declared her to be undoubtedly insane and noted that she had been a hopeless case of insanity for some time. Another suggested she was probably the victim of foul play, possibly given some drug that had destroyed her mind. What is remarkable and deeply troubling is how easily she fooled the supposed experts. Nellie herself noted in her subsequent reporting that when she was inside Bellevue, she dropped most of her act and behaved quite normally, yet no one revised their diagnosis. The assumption once made seemed impossible to dislodge. If she was there, she must be insane. After a few days at Bellevue, Nellie was transferred by boat to Blackwell's Island, a strip of land in the East River that housed several municipal institutions, including prisons, workhouses, and the insane asylum. The boat ride itself was traumatic, with patients shackled and detained roughly by attendants. Upon arrival, Nellie was stripped, forced into a freezing cold bath, and given a rough asylum uniform. She was assigned to a ward with dozens of other women, and what she witnessed over the following days shocked and horrified her. The asylum was a chamber of horrors dressed up as a medical facility. Patients were routinely beaten by nurses and attendants. Food was nearly inedible, consisting of rancid meat and watery gruel and stale bread, served in insufficient quantities to satisfy. The water was contaminated and foul-tasting. The halls were frigid, with many patients lacking adequate clothing or blankets, forced to sit shivering on hard benches for hours. There was no treatment to speak of, no therapy or medical care, just warehousing of human beings under conditions of systematic neglect and cruelty. What particularly struck Nellie was that many of the women confined there did not appear to be insane at all. Some were immigrants who spoke limited English and had been committed because they could not adequately explain themselves. Some were women whose families wanted them out of the way. Some had been poor and homeless and were swept up by authorities. Once committed, there seemed to be no way out. The asylum was a trap from which escape was nearly impossible, a place where women disappeared, forgotten by the outside world. Nellie took mental notes on everything she observed, knowing that her testimony would be crucial. She befriended some of the other patients, learning their stories, documenting their suffering. She experienced firsthand the casual brutality of the attendants, the mocking cruelty of the nurses, the complete indifference of the doctors who occasionally walked through but never really looked at the patients as human beings. She felt the gnawing hunger of the cold that penetrated to the bone, the fear of physical howits, the crushing boredom and hopelessness. True to their agreement, the world arranged for Nellie's release after 10 days. An attorney appeared claiming to represent her, and she was discharged into his custody. After her release, Nellie immediately began writing. The result was a 2-part article published in October 1887 under headline 10 Days in a Madhouse. The articles were a sensation, creating a public outcry that resonated through the city and beyond. Nellie's expose of Blackwell's Island Asylum was unlike anything readers had encountered before. Her writing combined meticulous factual reporting with visceral emotional power. She described scenes with such specificity that readers could visualize them. The bruises on patients' arms from rough handling, the precise taste and texture of their exosude, the sound of women weeping in the night, the feeling of icy air cutting through thin garments. But she also contextualized what she observed, explaining how the system worked, how women were committed with minimal due process, how once inside the asylum they saw no advocates and no recourse. She named names, identifying specific nurses and attendants who had been cruel, specific doctors who had been neglectful. She interviewed several women she had met inside after securing their release, giving them space to tell their own stories of how they had been committed unjustly and what they had endured. The public response was immediate and explosive. Other newspapers picked up the story, running follow-up investigations and editorials demanding reform. The grand jury launched an investigation into conditions at the asylum. The city allocated additional funding for improvements, including better food, warmer heat, and additional medical staff. While the changes fell short of what was truly needed, and asylums remains rebuilt institutions for decades to come, Nellie's reporting had proven that
Colombo was Nellie's first extended stop since leaving New York. She had several hours before her next ship departed, and she used them to explore the city. The heat was oppressive, unlike anything she had experienced before, and the sensory overload was almost overwhelming. The colors were more vivid, the smells more intense, the sounds more cacophonous than in the more orderly cities of Europe. She hired a rickshaw and toured the city, visiting markets where vendors sold tropical fruits she had never seen, spices in great mounds that filled the air with complex aromas, and textiles in brilliant hues. She observed women in saris, men in various styles of dress reflecting Ceylon's mix of Sinhalese, Tamil, and Muslim populations, and the visible presence of British colonial authority. Nellie was aware that she was traveling through a world shaped by imperialism, that the efficiency of the transportation network she relied upon was built on colonial exploitation. Her articles from this part of her journey reflect some discomfort with this reality, though she did not fully analyze or condemn the imperial system. Like most white Americans and Europeans of her era, she held assumptions about Western superiority that she did not question as deeply as she might have. But she also expressed genuine curiosity about the people she encountered, attempted to learn about their lives and perspectives, and wrote about them with more respect and interest than many travel writers of her time, who treated non-Western peoples as mere curiosities or primitives. From Colombo, Nellie continued eastward on the Oriental, a peninsular and oriental steam navigation company ship, crossing the Bay of Bengal to Penang and then Singapore. She arrived in Singapore on December 18th, 34 days into her journey. Here she had another brief stop, and she used it to explore this major port city that served as a hub for British trade in Southeast Asia. It was in Singapore that Nellie made one of her most memorable acquisitions, a pet monkey. She purchased the small creature from a street vendor on a whim, charmed by its antics and perhaps also recognizing that it would make for good copy in her articles. She named the monkey McGinty and carried it with her for the remainder of her journey. McGinty became a beloved character in her dispatches, a source of amusement and frustration in equal measure. The monkey would escape from her stateroom and wreak havoc, steal food from other passengers, and generally behave in the unpredictable manner of wild animals pressed into service as pets. But Nellie doted on McGinty, and the monkey's presence humanized her journey, giving readers a concrete detail to latch onto, something familiar and amusing amid the exotic locations and rapid pace. From Singapore, Nellie traveled to Hong Kong, arriving on December 24. It was here that she received disturbing news. The World informed her by telegram that a rival journalist, Elizabeth Bismond, had set out from New York on November 14th, the same day as Nellie, but traveling in the opposite direction, westward across America to San Francisco, and then across the Pacific. Bisland was making the attempt for Cosmopolitan magazine, and it was now a race not just against Phileas Fogg's fictional record, but against another real person. The news rattled Nellie. She had thought she was racing only against time, but now she had a competitor, someone who might beat her and claim the achievement for herself. Nellie had no way of knowing where Bisland was at any given moment, or whether she was ahead or behind. All she could do was continue pushing forward, taking the fastest available transportation at each stage, and hoping it would be enough. The stop in Hong Kong was supposed to be brief, just long enough to transfer from one ship to another. But here Nellie encountered the most serious challenge of her journey. She learned that the ship she was supposed to take to Yokohama, Japan had already departed 5 days earlier. The next scheduled ship would not leave for 5 more days. A week's delay would destroy any chance of beating the record. Nellie was frantic. She made inquiries at every steamship office, pleading for any vessel that might be heading to Japan sooner. She explained her situation to officials who were alternatively amused and sympathetic, but ultimately unable to help. There simply was no ship available. She spent sleepless nights in her Hong Kong hotel, calculating and recalculating. Even if she caught the next scheduled ship and everything else went perfectly, she would be cutting it extremely close. The buffer she had built up by traveling slightly ahead of schedule would be entirely consumed. Any further delays would mean failure. She sent frantic telegrams to the world, informing them of the situation. The newspaper, recognizing the dramatic potential, published updates about her plight, building suspense for readers. Finally, after days of anxiety, Nellie learned that a steamship not originally scheduled to stop in Hong Kong was being rerouted and would arrive in time for her to make the connection. It was not ideal. The ship, the Oceanic, would add some distance to her journey, but it was better than waiting the full 5 days. When the Oceanic arrived on December 28th, Nellie boarded with McGinty and her small satchel, relieved beyond measure to be moving again. The passage across the East China Sea to Yokohama was rough, with winter storms battering the ship. Nellie, who had gotten her sea legs by this point, managed better than many passengers, but she still spent miserable hours in her cabin listening to the ship creak and groan, feeling it pitch and roll, and wondering if the vessel would hold together. She thought about the irony of surviving so much only to potentially drown within reach of completing her journey. But the Oceanic made it to Yokohama on January 7th, 1890, 54 days into her journey. She was now in Japan, the final major stop before the long Pacific crossing back to America. Nellie had only a day in Yokohama, but she was enchanted by what she saw. Japan had only recently opened to the West after centuries of isolation, and it retained a cultural distinctiveness that captivated her. She visited temples and gardens, observed women in elaborate kimonos, sampled unfamiliar fruits, and purchased several items including silk and lacquerware. She wished she had more time to explore, but the Oceanic was departing for San Francisco, and she could not afford to miss it. The Pacific crossing from Yokohama to San Francisco was the longest single leg of her journey, covering thousands of miles of open ocean. The Oceanic was a large and relatively comfortable ship, but the crossing still took nearly 3 weeks. Nellie used this time to rest, write up her accumulated notes and impressions, care for McGinty, and socialize with other passengers. Word had spread about her race around a world of pure she found herself something right about the ship. Passengers asked her to recount her adventures, and she obliged, enjoying the attention, but also conscious of the passage of time. Every day at sea was another day added to her total, and she could do nothing but wait for the ship to cross the vast expanse of water. The Pacific passage was also a time for reflection. Now he had not been traveling for more than 2 months, circling the globe, seeing sights and experiencing things that few Americans, especially few American women, had experienced. She had proven that she could handle the challenges, that her gender had not been an unsurmountable obstacle, but she also recognized how much her success depended on infrastructure built and maintained by others, on the steamship lines and railways and telegraph systems that made rapid global travel possible. Her achievement was real, but it was also made possible by modernity itself, by technologies and systems that were transforming the world. The Oceanic arrived at San Francisco on January 21st, 1890, 68 days after Nellie had departed New York. She was greeted by reporters, well-wishers, and officials from the world who had traveled to California to accompany her on a final leg of her journey, but there was no time for celebration yet. She still had to cross the American continent to reach New York, and every hour mattered. The world arranged for a special train to carry Nellie from San Francisco to Chicago, a journey that normally took several days. This train would travel as fast as safely possible, stopping only for coal and water, racing across the plains and mountains. Nellie boarded the train along with McGinty and a few companions from the world, and they set off on the final sprint. The train ride across America was its
its own adventure, and sometimes crowds gathered to the stations to catch a glimpse of Nellie as the procession crossed through. Even if you don't stop, the world would be bush. She wished down the station area Seta. She had wedding from 6. People were in the rolly clubs and guessing games for to predict exactly when songs were written after her, not written at her. She had become more of a journalist on a mission. She had become a symbol, the emblem of female superiority in modern achievement. The train raced through Nevada and Utah, Wyoming and Nebraska, Iowa and even Illinois. In Chicago, though we changed trains for the final segment to New York, the weather was brutal with snowstorms slowing progress. To the frame pushed on, Nellie barely slept of his final days, too anxious and sighing to rest. She was so close now, and as the train approached New York in January 2050, Nellie calculated the time carefully. It was 3:51 p.m. and the train pulled him into her sitting shade-edge man her journey around the world. 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes, and 14 seconds. She had not only beaten Jules Verne to fictional record 8 days, she crushed it. She had freedom of the elementary college for any extent as possible. Nellie stepped off the train to find a large crowd waiting for her. The thousands of people had gathered to cheer, appear in different hitting and bog bands play, reporters shouting questions. The world's publisher and editors requested her agreements and congratulations. She was a story to her anyway she was. She wording was all fought from the seal flash, ring in 72 days of houses coming. She had noticed who she had the next artist. Followers within 2 for tonight, and it was well that day. During 26 days, looking for cottage as well. And the lost one to just know they don't know where she went to all counted to the degree initial no is not standing tones.
The book included her articles, maps of her route, and illustrations. It was a bestseller, cementing Nellie's fame and ensuring that her achievement would be remembered. The immediate aftermath of Nellie's journey brought both ire and frustration in measures she had not fully anticipated. She was celebrated as a national heroine, invited to speak at events, mobbed by admirers on the streets, and featured in countless newspaper articles. Her image appeared on advertisements for products she had never endorsed, everything from patent medicines to household goods. The world capitalized on her fame, putting her name prominently in the paper and assigning her to write articles on various topics. But even in the midst of celebration, Nellie sensed an undercurrent of trivialization. Much of the coverage of her achievement focused on superficial details: what she wore, how she looked, whether she was romantically attached to anyone. Reporters asked her about her fashion choices as often as they asked about the challenges of her journey. Some articles treated her success as a charming novelty of amusing stunt, rather than a serious achievement in exploration and journalism. Male adventurers and explorers were written about in terms of their courage, determination, and contribution to human knowledge. Nellie was often written about as if she were a performing curiosity, impressive in that a trained animal might be impressive, but not to be taken entirely seriously. This pattern would frustrate Nellie throughout her life, the sense that no matter what she accomplished, her gender would always be the lens through which she was viewed, and that lens distorted everything. But nevertheless, her achievement got a real impact. She received letters from women and girls all over the country, and even from other countries, telling her that she had inspired them, that she had shown them what was possible. Some of these letters were from women who said they had been given permission to pursue education or careers because Nellie had proven how women could handle challenges previously thought beyond them. Teachers wrote to say they used her journey to teach geography and to encourage their female students to be ambitious. These letters meant more to Nellie than a public revelation because they represented actual change in individual lives. In the continued later lecturing flowers to speak to audience exposition and she distinguished national reactions and she was much still talking, but audience who respected Cartography's authenticity. She spoke cleanly about what she had seen and experienced, and she used her platform to advocate for women's rights and opportunities. She argued that her journey would both lead their way to continuation and go to the chance and share to try the unknown areas that reject women and rise away. She returned to the world to continue writing those materials. She says nothing her actions was as easy to them to never go later on the cars and she never really cared and so she was there she returned to me to your mind and when you think we think most of the blessings of the dreams after you would die and she returned to life to last long. Sometime it is like you lost your right to Yet she persisted, achieved remarkable things, and left a legacy at indoors. Examining Nellie's life and career reveals several key insights about gender, journalism, and social change. First, her success was made possible by the specific historical moment in which she worked. The rise of mass circulation newspapers created demand for the kind of sensational and interest stories she specialized in. If she had been born a generation earlier, there would have been no platform for her work, as she was more gender and she forgot to come on with his authors.
Chapter 6. Mary Kingsley, alone in West Africa.
The library was her sanctuary and her prison. In the dim afternoon light of the Cambridge house, Mary Kingsley sat surrounded by volumes of exploration, ethnography, and natural history, books that described worlds she could only imagine. Her father's collection represented decades of intellectual curiosity and global travel, each spine a doorway to places she would never see. She was 23 years old, and her future stretched before her with depressing certainty, caring for her invalid mother, managing the household, waiting for her father and brother to return from their adventures with stories of distant lands. Outside, she could hear her mother's bell ringing, that small silver summons that had punctuated her days for as long as she could remember. Mary marked her place in a volume about West African tribal customs, closed the book with careful reverence, and rose to answer the call. This was her life. This had always been her life. She had no reason to believe it would ever be different. Mary Henrietta Kingsley was born on October 13, 1862, in Islington, London, into a family that embodied the contradictions of Victorian society. Her father, George Kingsley, was a physician and amateur ethnographer who spent much of his time traveling as companion to wealthy aristocrats, collecting specimens and observing indigenous cultures. Her uncle was Charles Kingsley, the celebrated novelist and clergyman. It was a family of intellect, curiosity, and social standing, but these privileges did not extend to Mary. Her brother Charles, 4 years her junior, was sent to proper schools and prepared for Cambridge University. Mary received no formal education whatsoever. The prevailing wisdom of Victorian England held that girls of good family needed only enough learning to manage a household and be agreeable company. Anything more was not merely unnecessary but potentially dangerous, threatening the natural order of gender relations. But Mary possessed an insatiable hunger for knowledge that could not be contained by social convention. Left largely to herself while her mother remained bedridden with various ailments, and her father traveled for months at a time, she educated herself in the library. She read voraciously and systematically, travel narratives, scientific treatises, works of history and anthropology. She taught herself German to read ethnographic studies in their original language. She absorbed her father's notes and specimens from his travels, developing her own theories about cultural development and human society. In the margins of books, in private journals, her brilliant mind worked in isolation, forming ideas that would later challenge the anthropological establishment. Yet this intellectual development occurred entirely in secret, entirely without recognition. When her father and brother returned from their expeditions, Mary listened to their stories with careful attention, asking questions that revealed the depth of her understanding, but always positioning herself as merely curious and reclaiming expertise. A woman who appeared too knowledgeable was considered threatening, unfeminine, unmarriageable. The years passed in a rhythm of domestic duty and stolen scholarship. Mary was 30 years old in 1892, firmly established in the category of spinster, and pitied enslaving comic figure of Victorian society. She had nursed her mother through declining health for years. She had managed the household, helped and supervised servants, and maintained social care. She had watched her brother grow up.
Mary's relationship with the Fang people, particularly Fang women, provided insights that male ethnographers could not access. She participated in women's activities, observed domestic arrangements, listened to women's perspectives on social structures. What she found challenged European assumptions about gender relations in African societies. Fang women had considerable autonomy in certain spheres. They controlled aspects of agricultural production and trade. They had voices in community decisions, though these voices were exercised through different channels than formal political structures. Mary recognized that European observers, seeing that African women did not participate in governance in the same ways European men did, concluded that African women were oppressed. But this conclusion imposed European frameworks onto African realities. Power and influence could be exercised in multiple ways, through multiple structures. The mistake was assuming that European patterns were universal norms, rather than culturally specific arrangements. Yet Mary's progressive insights into African cultures coexisted with positions that seemed contradictory to modern observers. She opposed women's suffrage. She did not believe women should vote or hold political office. She thought women's influence should be exercised through other channels: education, writing, moral authority, economic activity. She supported British imperialism and believed that European colonial administration, properly conducted, could benefit African peoples. These positions seemed to contradict her anthropological work, which demonstrated the sophistication of African societies and the destructiveness of European interference. How could the same person who respected Fang culture support colonial governments? How could a woman who defied gender conventions by traveling alone in Africa oppose women's political rights? The answer lies partly in the complexity of Mary's thinking and partly in the limitations of Victorian intellectual frameworks. She could see that African cultures deserved respect while still believing in a hierarchy of civilizations with European culture at the apex. She could recognize her own capabilities while believing that most women were unsuited for public political participation. She contained contradictions, as all people do, and her progressive insights in some areas did not automatically extend to others. Mary returned to England in November 1895 after nearly a year in West Africa. She was 33 years old and famous. Word of her expeditions had spread through geographical societies, scientific institutions, and popular press. A Victorian lady who traveled alone in West Africa, who climbed mountains and lived with peoples Europeans called savage, who collected fish and conducted serious ethnographic research. This was a story irresistible to the press. Mary was invited to lecture at the Royal Geographical Society, at universities, at public venues. She wrote articles for popular magazines, and she began working on the book that would make her a best-selling author, Travels in West Africa, published in 1897. The book was extraordinary, combining serious ethnographic observation with adventure narrative and wry humor. Mary's writing voice was distinctive, self-deprecating, witty, sharply observant, capable of describing dangerous situations with comic understatement, and of demolishing pretentious European attitudes with a single sentence. Travels in West Africa became an immediate success. Victorian readers were fascinated by Mary's adventures and charmed by her narrative style. She described falling into game pits, encounters with hippos, navigating rapids, moments of genuine danger presented with such humor that readers could enjoy the thrills without being overwhelmed by horror. But embedded in these adventure narratives were serious arguments about African cultures and European colonialism. Mary praised the intelligence and capabilities of African peoples. She condemned missionaries who sought to destroy indigenous religions without understanding them. She argued that European traders who worked within African commercial systems were more successful and less destructive than colonial administrators who tried to impose alien legal and economic structures. She insisted that African societies had their own valid ways of organizing life, and that European assumptions of superiority were based on ignorance rather than evidence. These arguments were radical for their time, and they generated considerable controversy. Mary's lectures drew large audiences. She spoke at the Royal Geographical Society, where women were not yet admitted as fellows but could be invited as speakers. She addressed university audiences, trading associations, popular lecture series. She had a gift for public speaking, combining serious content with entertaining anecdotes. She would describe climbing Mount Cameron in full Victorian dress, making the audience laugh while demonstrating women's capabilities. She would recount living with the Fang people, building empathy while challenging stereotypes, and she would argue forcefully for changing British colonial policy to respect African institutions and to support trading relationships rather than administrative control. These positions aligned Mary with the trading companies, particularly the Liverpool merchants who had commercial interests in West Africa. Critics accused her of serving trader interests rather than African welfare. Mary responded that traders had to maintain good relationships with African peoples to succeed commercially, while colonial administrators could rely on military force and therefore had less incentive to respect African autonomy. Her second book, West African Studies, published in 1899, was more scholarly and less commercially successful than Travels in West Africa. It presented her ethnographic observations in greater detail, with extensive analysis of religious beliefs, social structures, and legal systems. She argued for approaching African religions as sophisticated belief systems rather than crematic superstition. She documented the complexity of African jurisprudence, showing that societies Europeans called lawless actually had elaborate systems for resolving disputes and maintaining social order. She made the case for preserving African institutions rather than replacing them with European models. The book was dense, challenging, and represented serious anthropological work. It did not sell as well as the adventure narrative of her first book, but it earned respect from scholars who recognized the quality of her observations and the originality of her analysis. Mary Kingsley was establishing herself as a serious ethnographer whose work deserved academic recognition. But Mary's health had suffered during her time in Africa. She had contracted several tropical fevers and had never fully recovered. She was exhausted from constant lecturing and writing, and she was increasingly frustrated by the limitations placed on her as a woman. She could lecture at the Royal Geographical Society but not become a fellow. She could conduct serious research
research, but could not hold an academic position. Her opinions on colonial policy were dismissed by officials who considered her a mere woman, however well-traveled. She was famous, but not fully accepted into the institutions where her work belonged, and she was lonely. She had close friends, particularly among men who shared her interest in Africa, but Victorian propriety made such friendships complicated. She could not marry, she had no interest in the domestic subordination that marriage entailed, but neither could she have the intimate friendships that might have sustained her emotionally. She existed in a liminal space, too unconventional for proper Victorian society, too committed to Victorian propriety to fully reject its constraints. When the Second Boer War began in 1899, Mary saw an opportunity for meaningful service. Britain was fighting Hagar Kenny republics in South Africa, and the military medical services were overwhelmed by disease. Typhoid fever swept through military camps, killing sorties faster than combat. Mary volunteered as a nurse, despite having no medical training. She believed her experience in West Africa, where she had survived multiple tropical diseases and observed sanitation practices, qualified her to help. She sailed for South Africa in March 1900, joining a nursing staff at a hospital in Simonstone treating Boer prisoners of war. The conditions were appalling. The hospital was overcrowded, undersupplied, and overwhelmed by the number of sick prisoners. Typhoid was endemic. Medical understanding of disease transmission was still primitive. The importance of sanitation and clean water was recognized but not consistently practiced. Nurses and doctors sickened regularly. Mary threw herself into the work with characteristic energy. She cared for dying men, cleaned wounds, provided what comfort she could in desperate circumstances. She wrote letters for prisoners who could not write themselves, listening to their stories, treating them with the same humanity she had extended to African peoples. And she sickened. By May 1900, Mary had contracted typhoid fever. The disease progressed rapidly, attacking her hardy, weakened body. She was moved to better facilities, attended by military doctors, but typhoid in 1900 was often fatal. There were no antibiotics, no effective treatments beyond supportive care. Mary's condition deteriorated steadily. She knew she was dying. She remained lucid and gave specific instructions for her burial. She was not to be buried in South African ground. She insisted on a sea burial, like a sailor. She had traveled by ships for years, had found freedom on the ocean. Let the sea be your final resting place. Mary Kingsley died on June 3, 1900, at age 37. Her body was taken aboard the HMS Thrush and buried at sea off the coast of South Africa, as she had requested. The flag-trimmed coffin slid into the water while sailors stood at attention. It was a military honor accorded to a civilian woman who had served her country not through military service, but through expanding human knowledge and challenging prejudice. News of her death reached England and generated extensive obituaries. Newspapers praised her courage and her contributions to geography and ethnography. The Royal Geographical Society, which had never admitted him to Trafella, published tributes recognizing her achievements. Scholars acknowledged that her ethnicity work was more superficial and much more intelligent for her anti-Ramajana times, more into a remarkable woman for which her tangible hidden the God to realize. Mary Kingsley's legacy is complex and multifaceted. Her immediate and feckless and challenging Victorian assumptions, Balkanist capabilities, and odd African cultures. She demonstrated that women could conduct serious scientific work in challenging environments, that female perspective added important dimensions to ethnographic research, and the Victorian priority need not confine women to domestic spaces. Her writings provided European audiences with sympathetic, detailed accounts of African peoples, countering missionary and colonial neophytes and presented Africans as periods needing European guidance. They argued from respecting African institutions or understanding African religions on their own terms, for recognizing the destructive impact of European interference. These arguments were radical for their time, and they generated considerable controversy. Mary's lectures drew large audiences. She spoke at the Royal Geographical Society, where women were not admitted as fellows, but could be admitted as speakers. She addressed university audiences, trading associations, popular lecture series. She had a gift for public speaking, combining serious content, divinity, and anecdotes. She would describe climate not covered in full, but story and dress, making Muhammad's laugh, whole demonstrating ways to like Mr. Getting with the thang challenges dissertation, and argue forceful to changing English colonial policy to respect African institutions and to support trading relationships rather than administrative control. These positions align maybe with the trade companies, particularly in the Liverpool merchants who commercial answer with Tahara, Perdisi Hughes, or serving traders' interests rather than hafting of her. Mary responded that traders had to maintain good relationships with African peoples to succeed commercially, while colonial administrators could rely on military force, and therefore had less of sense to contribute to Talent's governance. Her second group of West African studies, published in 1899, more scholarly and less commercially accessible to travelers West Africa, present her theory of demographic oscillations in greater detail, with extensive analysis of religious beliefs, social structures, and legal systems. She argued for approaching African religions as sophisticated belief systems grounded in creme superstition. She documented the complexity of African jurisprudence, joined to societies Europeans called lawless actually had elaborate systems for resolving disputes and maintaining social order. She made a case for preserving African institutions rather than replacing Oxford models. The book was dense, challenging, and presents serious ethnological work. It did not sell as well as the adventure narrative of her first book, but it earned respect from scholars who recognized the quality of her observations as in original analysis. Mary Kingsley had Albertinus, a serious ethnographer whose work to serve academic recognition. As Mary's health had suffered during her time in Africa, she had contracted several tropical fevers, and it never fully recovered. She was exhausted from hostile luxury of time, and she was increasingly frustrated by the limitations placed on her as a woman. She could lecture at the Royal Geographical Society, but not become fellow. She came about a serious research, was not hold an active position. Her opinion of colonial policy were dismissed by response for a mere woman, however, thought Cattle. She was famous, but not fully accepted in any institution for her work below men. She had false friends, particularly on men. She had difference in Africa. Victorian variety made such projects complicated. She could not marry. She had her interest in the academic connections, very no she had the advertising and that anti-knowledge severed effects like her emotionally. She existed in a limo in space too unconventional for proper Victorian society, too committed to Victoria to pride to fully try to discuss. When the Second World War began in 1599, Mary saw the opportunity for knitting scissors, and was fighting ahead of defending republics in South Africa, and the military medical services were overwhelmed by disease. Typhoid fever swept through the military camps. 2 soldiers faster than combat. Mary volunteered as a nurse, despite having no medical training. She believed her experience in West Africa, where she had survived the nausea of tropical diseases, and observed sanitation practices while in the fight to health. She railed for South Africa. Her marriage not hindered, knowing your nursing staff at a hospital and Simon stopped training for prisoners of war. The conditions were appalling. The hospital was undercredited, undersupplied, and overwhelmed by a number of sick prisoners. Typhoid was endemic. Medical understanding of distant transmission was still primitive. The importance of sanitation and clean water was recognized but not consistently practiced. Nurses and doctors sickened regularly. Mary threw herself into the work with a characteristic energy. Said for time and clean was provided what comfort you could in desperate circumstances. She wrote letters with prisoners who could not write themselves, listening to their stories, treating them with the same humanity she extended at their pencils. And she said that by 1900 Mary and such faculty for the disease progressed rapidly, attacking her already weakened body. She was moved to electricities, attended by Valkyrie Oxford. Typhoid to 1900 was often fatal. There were no antibiotics, no effective treatments beyond supportive care. Mary's condition deteriorated stumbles. She knew she was dying. She remained lucid and gave specific instructions for her burial. She was not to be buried in South African ground. She insisted our sea burial fetch a sailor. She would travel by ships for years, and freedom on the ocean of the sea be a final refuge. Mary Kingsley died on June 3, 1900, at age 37. Her body was taken aboard the HMS Thrush and buried to sea off the coast of South Africa as she had requested. The flag-trimmed coffin slid into the water while sailors stood at attention. It was a military honor accorded to a civilian woman who had served her country not through military service, and from spectating her knowledge and challenging prejudice. News of her death reached England and generated extensive overtures. Newspapers praised her courage and her contributions to geography and etymology. The Royal Geographical Society, which had never admitted her as a fellow, published tributes recognizing her achievements. There is knowledge their ethnograph is more sufficient than much else for the time before time. For its moment of remarkable attention and reaching fight into right. Mary Kingsley's legacy is compressible, fascinating, remedying and touches and challenging Victorian assumptions on typicalities and about African cultures. She demonstrated that with courage into serious, decisive, work in challenging environments that female respect.
Chapter 7. Freya Stark. Mapping the Arabian Desert's Mysteries.
The first sound Freya Stark heard when she regained consciousness was not human, but mechanical. The relentless grinding of factory gears that had moments before caught her long hair and torn away part of her scalp. She was 13 years old, visiting her mother's textile factory in northern Italy, and in an instant of inattention had leaned too close to the machinery. The pain was beyond description, but what stayed with her longest was not the physical agony or even the months of recovery that followed. It was the peculiar liberation that came afterward, the understanding that she had already survived the worst things she could imagine, and that fear itself had limits. The accident left her permanently scarred, partially deaf in one ear, and with a bald patch she would conceal for the rest of her life beneath carefully arranged hats and scarves. But it gave her something else entirely, a fatalistic courage that would carry her alone into places where even experienced male explorers hesitated to venture. Decades later, when tribal leaders in Yemen questioned whether a small, middle-aged Englishwoman could possibly endure the hardships of desert travel, when colonial officials in Baghdad insisted that the territories she proposed to map were too dangerous for any woman, when friends begged her to reconsider expeditions that seemed suicidal in their ambition, Freya would remember that factory floor in Italy and think to herself that she had already faced down death once and survived. What were sandstorms and bandits and political instability compared to that? The scars she carried were not weaknesses, but credentials, proof that suffering could be endured and transformation was possible. They were the first entries in a lifetime catalog of survived impossibilities. Freya's childhood had been unconventional even before the accident reshaped it entirely. Born in Paris in 1893 to artistic bohemian parents who seemed temperamentally unsuited to the responsibilities of conventional family life, she spent her early years bouncing between France, England, and Italy as her parents' marriage slowly disintegrated. Her father, a sculptor of modest talent but considerable charm, was frequently absent on commissions or affairs. Her mother, passionate and impulsive, threw herself into various enterprises with more enthusiasm than practical sense, including the textile factory that would prove so fateful. There were no formal schools in Freya's early education, no structured curriculum or qualified teachers. Instead, she and her younger sister learned from whatever adults happened to be present, visiting artists, family friends, hired tutors of varying competence. They read voraciously from their parents' eclectic library, absorbed languages through immersion rather than instruction, and learned to navigate the emotional volatility of adults who treated children as small confidants rather than dependents requiring protection. It was an education in improvisation, in making sense of chaos, in finding one's own way without reliable guides. When her parents finally divorced and her mother settled in Italy with a new partner, dragging Freya and her sister into yet another reconfiguration of home and identity, the teenage Freya had already learned the essential lesson that would serve her throughout her traveling life, that security was an illusion, that home was portable, and that the only reliable resource was one's own resourcefulness. The accident, traumatic as it was, simply confirmed what she already suspected, that the world was dangerous and unpredictable, and the only sensible response was to meet its dangers directly rather than cowering in false safety. The years of recovery were long and painful, involving multiple surgeries and constant discomfort. Freya spent months confined to bed or limited in activity, her scalp slowly healing beneath bandages, her hearing permanently damaged. But these restrictions also gave her something she had never had before, sustained time alone with books.
She read voraciously during her convalescence, working through her father's library of classical texts, teaching herself Latin by sheer persistence, discovering in ancient history and mythology a world as vivid and compelling as the one outside her window. The Roman historians became her companions, their accounts of faraway places and ancient conflicts more real to her than the limited social circle of her Italian village. She particularly loved the travel narratives, Herodotus wandering through Egypt and Persia, Xenophon leading his 10,000 across Mesopotamia, Marco Polo traversing the Silk Road. These men had walked through regions that remained, even in the early 20th century, largely unknown to Western travelers. The Middle East especially captured her imagination, those vast territories between the Mediterranean and India, where ancient civilizations had risen and fallen, where Alexander had conquered and the Crusaders had fought, where medieval Islamic culture had flourished while Europe struggled through its dark ages. The names alone were intoxicating: Damascus, Baghdad, Isfahan, Aleppo. She would trace them on maps with her finger, these cities that seemed to exist in some timeless realm between history and myth, and wonder what they looked like now, how much remained of their ancient glory, whether anyone from her world ever went there simply to see and understand. It never occurred to her during those long months of recovery that she herself might one day walk those streets and sleep in those caravanserais. She was a scarred girl in an Italian village with no money, no connections, and no prospects beyond the conventional fate of marriage and domestic life. But the seeds were planted, and they would prove remarkably persistent. World War I disrupted what little stability Freya's life possessed. She volunteered as a nurse, serving in Italy, where the mountain warfare against Austria-Hungary produced catastrophic casualties. The work was exhausting and often horrific, tending to young men whose bodies had been shredded by shrapnel and machine gun fire, holding hands as they died far from home, writing letters to mothers who would never see their sons again. But it gave Freya her first real sense of competence and purpose. She discovered she could function under pressure, could make life-and-death decisions quickly, could endure physical and emotional exhaustion without breaking. The war also completed her disillusionment with conventional European society. The civilization that had produced Renaissance art and Enlightenment philosophy had just slaughtered an entire generation of its young men in the muddy trenches for reasons that even at the time seemed murky and inadequate. When the war finally ended, Freya was 25 years old, still living with her mother in Italy, with no clear direction for her future. Most women her age were married with children or resigned to spinsterhood and genteel poverty. But Freya had spent 4 years nursing dying soldiers and had survived a factory accident that should have killed her. She was not interested in genteel anything. She wanted something else entirely, though she could not yet articulate what that might be. The revelation came gradually through her continued reading and self-education. Studying the history of the Crusades, Freya encountered references to a mysterious medieval sect known as the Assassins, a Shia Islamic group that operated from hidden mountain fortresses in Persia and Syria, whose members were said to carry out political murders with fearless dedication, supposedly induced by hashish and promises of paradise. The historical accounts were fragmentary and often contradictory, mixing fact with legend. European chroniclers described the assassins with a mixture of fear and fascination, but few had actually visited their strongholds. Marco Polo had written about them, but his account was second-hand. The locations of many of their castles remained uncertain, marked on maps as approximate circles or question marks. Modern scholars debated whether certain fortresses had even existed or were simply medieval propaganda. For Freya, this uncertainty was irresistible. Here was a genuine historical mystery, a gap in knowledge that could potentially be filled by someone willing to do the actual fieldwork of traveling to remote regions of Persia and physically locating the ruins. It would require learning Persian, navigating regions with minimal infrastructure or foreign presence, dealing with local authorities suspicious of Western travelers, and enduring conditions that would challenge even experienced explorers. In other words, it was absolutely perfect. At age 31, Freya enrolled in courses in Arabic and Persian at the School of Oriental Studies in London, threw herself into learning these notoriously difficult languages with the same intense focus she had brought to nursing, and began planning what everyone around her insisted was an impossible, even suicidal venture, a solo journey into the mountains of Persia to search for the castles of the assassins. Her family and friends were appalled. Well-bred English women in their 30s did not travel alone to Persia. They did not learn Arabic and Persian to converse with Muslims in their own languages. They did not propose to wander through politically unstable regions searching for medieval ruins of questionable existence. If Freya wanted to study the assassins, she should do so properly in libraries and universities, working with established scholars who could guide her research through appropriate channels. The idea of actually going there, of subjecting herself to the discomfort and danger and sheer impropriety of solo travel in the Middle East, seemed not just reckless but vaguely scandalous. Women who did these things were eccentrics at best, mentally unstable at worst. They certainly did not receive respect or recognition from serious scholars. But Freya was unmoved by these objections. She had spent her entire life being told what was and was not appropriate for someone of her sex and class and circumstances. The accident had taught her that safety was an illusion. The war had taught her that conventional society's values were bankrupt,
and her years of reading had taught her that the most valuable knowledge came not from libraries, but from direct observation, from being physically present in the places one wished to understand. In 1927, having saved enough money from small inheritances and writing work, Freya left England for Beirut, the first stop on what would become a lifetime of Middle Eastern expeditions. She was 34 years old, spoke Arabic with grammatical precision if not native fluency, carried letters of introduction to various colonial officials who might be useful, and had approximately enough money to sustain herself for 6 months if she lived very frugally. She had no institutional backing, no guarantee publisher for whatever she might write, no research grant or academic position waiting for her return. She had only her curiosity, her courage, and her conviction that understanding required presence, that one could not truly know a place by reading about it, but only by walking its ground, breathing its air, and speaking with its people. The Middle East that Freya entered in 1927 was a region in profound transition. The Ottoman Empire, which had controlled most of the Arab world for 4 centuries, had collapsed in World War I. The victorious European powers had carved up its territories into new political entities: British mandates in Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan, French mandates in Syria and Lebanon, various Emiratis and kingdoms of the Arabian Peninsula maintaining precarious independence. Traditional tribal authorities competed with modernizing governments, Islamic law intersected awkwardly with European legal codes, and ancient social structures confronted the disruptive forces of 20th century technology and ideology. For Western travelers, the region represented a peculiar mixture of accessibility and danger. Colonial infrastructure, railways, telegraph lines, administrative centers made certain areas relatively easy to reach, but outside these corridors of control, vast territories remained where central government authority was theoretical at best, where tribal law prevailed, and where foreigners were viewed with suspicion as probable spies or missionaries with ulterior motives. Male European travelers generally came in one of 3 types: colonial administrators enforcing mandate, military officers maintaining order, or scholars conducting archaeological or anthropological research under official sponsorship. All operated within structures of power and protection, rarely venturing far without escorts or official permission. A woman traveling alone existed in a category that local populations and colonial authorities alike struggled to comprehend. Freya exploited this confusion brilliantly, using her gender simultaneously as credential and camouflage, presenting herself as harmless enough to be unthreatening, while possessing enough determination to push past objections before anyone quite realized they should have stopped her. Her first major expedition took her into the Druze territory of Lebanon and Syria, where she lived with local families, learned their customs and dialect variations, and began developing the approach that would characterize
The question of Freya's relationship to colonialism and empire remains complex and contested. She was unquestionably a product of British imperial culture, educated in its assumptions about Western civilization's superiority and the British Empire's civilizing mission. She traveled with British passports, benefited from British military and administrative presence in the Middle East, and often relied on colonial officials for assistance, permissions, and emergency support. During World War II, she worked explicitly for British interests, employed by the Ministry of Information to use her knowledge and contacts to support Allied propaganda efforts and counter Axis influence in the Middle East. She helped establish information offices in Cairo, Baghdad, and other cities, recruiting local supporters and using her personal relationships to influence opinion leaders. This work was undeniably intelligence-related, using cultural influence as an instrument of wartime strategy. Her defenders argued that she genuinely believed Britain was fighting necessary battles against fascism and protecting Middle Eastern populations from Nazi and Italian imperialism that would have been even more oppressive than British rule. Her critics point out that regardless of intentions, she was serving imperial interests, using friendships instrumentally and supporting systems of foreign control over Arab self-determination. Both perspectives contain truth. Freya's personal writings reveal someone who was frequently critical of British arrogance, administrative incompetence, and cultural sensitivity toward colonized populations. She repeatedly condemned British officials who did not bother learning local languages, who treated Middle Easterners with contempt, and who failed to recognize that mandate rule was inevitably temporary and needed to prepare populations for eventual independence. She argued forcefully that British interests would be better served by treating Arabs as allies and equals rather than subjects requiring tutelage. Yet she continued working within imperial systems, accepting that British influence was both inevitable and, on balance, preferable to the alternatives she saw as chaos or more aggressive imperialism from other European powers. This position was common among liberal imperialists of her generation, people who recognized colonialism's injustices but could not quite imagine the world without it, who advocated for reform rather than abolition, and who believed that enlightened foreigners could still play positive roles in other cultures' development. From our contemporary perspective, this seems like obvious self-justification, but understanding Freya requires recognizing the genuine contradiction she embodied, someone who deeply respected Middle Eastern cultures while supporting their subordination, who formed genuine friendships across cultural boundaries while using those friendships for political purposes, who criticized empire while serving it.
After World War II, Freya continued traveling and writing prolifically into her 70s. She explored Turkey extensively, retracing the routes of Alexander the Great and writing about the region's classical heritage. She traveled through Greece and Asia Minor, examining the cultural transitions from Byzantine to Ottoman to modern Turkish civilizations. She made repeated journeys to Afghanistan, Iran, and the Arab world, documenting the dramatic changes as traditional societies confronted modernization, nationalism, and the declining European empires. Her post-war books showed an increasing preoccupation with permanence and change, with what endures across civilizational transformations and what vanishes. She wrote with nostalgia about disappearing traditional practices but avoided the reactionary romanticism that idealized the past. She recognized that people in the Middle East wanted modern education, healthcare, and economic opportunities just as much as Europeans did, and that traditional life, however picturesque to foreign visitors, often involved poverty, disease, and limited opportunities, especially for women. Her writing increasingly emphasized continuities, the persistence of hospitality codes, the enduring importance of family and tribal affiliations, the continued relevance of Islamic tradition even in secularizing societies. She argued that modernization did not have to mean westernization, that Middle Eastern societies could and should develop in ways that honored their own histories and values rather than simply imitating European models. This was a more sophisticated position than many of her contemporaries held, recognizing cultural distinctiveness while avoiding the patronizing assumption that modernization was somehow inappropriate for non-Western peoples. Freya's philosophy of travel, articulated across her many books and thousands of letters, emphasized several key principles. First, that genuine understanding required time and sustained presence, that one could not comprehend a culture through brief visits and superficial observations, but only through extended immersion that allowed one to move past initial impressions to deeper patterns. Second, that language learning was essential, that speaking with people in their own language, however imperfectly, demonstrated respect and opened possibilities of connection unavailable to travelers operating through translators. Third, the travel was fundamentally about receptivity rather than mastery, that the proper stance was one of humility and openness to being changed by what one encountered, rather than approaching travel as conquest or collection of experiences. Fourth, that hardship and discomfort were not obstacles to be minimized, but essential aspects of authentic travel, that the physical challenges of difficult journeys created a common humanity between traveler and traveled among that comfortable tourism could never achieve. Fifth, that women made particularly effective travelers because social conditioning had trained them in observation, listening, and empathy in ways that male socialization did not. Men, she argued, were taught to assert, to dominate conversations, to demonstrate expertise. Women were taught to watch, to listen, to notice nuance and subtext, to understand social dynamics through attention rather than participation. These skills translated directly into travel competencies. A woman who had spent a lifetime reading social situations and emotional undercurrents could navigate unfamiliar cultural contexts more effectively than a man who expected to be dominant and deferred to. Freya also believed women traveling alone inspired less anxiety than men, especially in regions where foreign men were suspected as probable spies or military scouts. A woman could more easily present as simply curious, as pursuing personal interest rather than official agenda, and thus gain access and trust unavailable to male travelers. By the 1960s and 70s, Freya had become a celebrated figure in British literary and geographical circles. She was made a Dame of the British Empire in 1972, recognizing her contributions to travel literature and Middle Eastern scholarship. She received numerous awards from geographical societies, was elected to the Royal Asiatic Society, and was recognized by academic institutions despite never having held an academic position or earned an advanced degree. Her books remained in print, introducing new generations to regions that continued making headlines: Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Syria, and providing historical context for contemporary conflicts. She maintained an enormous correspondence with friends, scholars, travelers, and admirers around the world, writing letters almost daily well into her 80s. These letters, many later published, reveal someone whose intellectual curiosity never diminished, who continued reading voraciously about current affairs, who held strong opinions about Middle Eastern politics and Western policies, and who watched with dismay as many regions she had documented descended into violence and instability. She was particularly distressed by the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which overthrew the Shah and established an Islamic Republic, and by the Iran-Iraq War that followed. These were regions where she had traveled freely, where she had made lifelong friends, and where the complex cultural synthesis of Islamic tradition and modernization she had documented seemed to be unraveling into ideological extremism and mutual slaughter. She was asked frequently by journalists and scholars to comment on Middle Eastern affairs, and she did so thoughtfully, always emphasizing the depth of historical patterns that superficial analysis missed, always urging Westerns to recognize their own roles in creating conditions that foster extremism and conflict. Freya spent her final decades in Asolo, a small town in northern Italy near Venice, in a house that became a repository for a lifetime of travel. The walls were covered with photographs from her expeditions: Bedouin camps, Persian castles, camel caravans crossing deserts, herself in various traditional costumes, friends from across the Middle East. Bookcases held her own works in multiple languages alongside the classical texts that had inspired her initial fascination with the region. Cabinets and tables displayed artifacts collected over decades: pottery fragments from ancient sites, textiles from Yemen, daggers from tribal leaders, maps she had drawn herself marking territories she had been the first Westerner to document. But the house was not a museum. It remained a working space where Freya continued writing almost until her death. She published her final book in her late 80s, a reflection on travel and memory titled The Journey's Echo. She worked on her autobiography, multiple volumes recounting her life with the same vivid detail and literary craft that had characterized her travel writing.
She continued correspondence with friends and admirers, her letters as sharp and observant as ever, even as her handwriting became shakier and her physical movement more limited. Visitors who came expecting a nostalgic elderly woman dwelling in past glories found instead someone engaged with contemporary events, still forming new opinions, still arguing passionately about politics and culture, still planning journeys she knew she could no longer make but could not stop imagining. When Freya died in 1993, 2 weeks before her 100th birthday, obituaries appeared in newspapers around the world, recognizing not just her individual achievements but her historical significance as one of the great travel writers of the 20th century. She had witnessed nearly the entire century, born before the Wright brothers' first flight and living to see the internet age beginning. She had documented a Middle East that in many ways no longer existed, a region before mass tourism, before the oil economy transformed Gulf states from backwaters to global financial centers, before revolutions and wars reconfigured political boundaries and social structures. Her books provided historical snapshots of cultures at particular moments of transition, valuable not just as literature but as anthropological and historical documents. Modern scholars of Middle Eastern history, women's studies, travel writing, and colonial cultural encounters still engage with her work, debating her perspectives and using her observations as primary sources. Her legacy is contested, as it should be. She was too complex and contradictory to fit comfortable narratives of either heroism or complicity, too honest of her writing to be easily categorized. She was a woman who achieved extraordinary things in a world that told women such achievements were impossible. She was a scholar who produced valuable knowledge outside institutional structures that generally excluded women from serious intellectual work. She was a writer who created a body of literature that remained readable and relevant decades after its initial publication. And she was a traveler whose journeys demonstrated that curiosity, courage, and respect for other cultures could overcome barriers that seem insurmountable. The factory accident that scarred 13-year-old Freya could have destroyed her. It could have left her traumatized, fearful, reluctant to take risks or venture beyond safe boundaries. Instead, it taught her that she was capable of surviving terrible things, that fear had limits, and that the worst pain was endurable. That lesson carried her alone into Arabian deserts, through Persian mountains, across territories where violence was commonplace and foreign women were suspected as spies or missionaries. It sustained her through illness, bureaucratic obstacles, physical exhaustion, and the constant low-level anxiety of being alone in unfamiliar places without reliable support. It allowed her to take risks that more prudent people avoided, and those risks produced knowledge, literature, and experiences that enriched understanding of one of the world's most complex regions. Freya's life demonstrates that trauma can be transformative in unexpected ways, that disadvantages can become advantages through reframing, and that the courage to venture beyond prescribed boundaries can produce contributions that where conventional paths never would have allowed. Her scarred scalp, hidden beneath carefully arranged hats throughout her life, was both wound and credential, both limitation and liberation. It marked her as different, and in embracing that difference rather than hiding from it, she found her path. When she stood in the ruins of assassin castles, when she traveled with Bedouin tribes through unmapped deserts, when she sat with women in harems learning about lives invisible to male scholars, when she carefully recorded geographical features to fill blank spaces on maps, she was not just documenting the world, but proving what was possible when someone refused to accept prescribed limitations. Her books remain in print in 30 years after her death, still read by travelers preparing to visit the region she documented, by scholars studying travel writing and colonial cultural encounters, by general readers drawn to her combination of adventure narrative and literary craft. The Middle East she described has changed dramatically. Independence replaced mandate rule, oil wells transformed economies, revolutions overthrew monarchies, wars redrew boundaries, fundamentalist movements challenged secular nationalism, and mass tourism penetrated regions that were once genuinely remote. But her essential insights remain relevant, that understanding other cultures requires humility and time, that language learning is both practical necessity and gesture of respect, that generalizations dissolve when confronted with individual complexity, that women's lives matter and deserve documentation, that Western perspectives are not universal, and that travel at its best is transformative dialogue rather than imperial observation. These lessons seem obvious now, but they were not obvious in her era, when colonial assumptions about Western superiority were mainstream, when travel writing was often self-aggrandizing adventure narrative or exotic entertainment for readers who would never visit places to strive, and when women...
Chapter 8. The Cost of Courage. What They Sacrificed.
The ledger of courage is never balanced. For every achievement inscribed in history's pages, there exists a corresponding entry in invisible ink. The relationships foregone, the ordinary happiness sacrificed, the doors that opened only as others closed forever. The 6 women whose journeys we have followed did not simply choose adventure over convention. They paid for that choice, in currencies both tangible and profound, in ways that men who made similar choices never had to consider. Their stories of triumph are incomplete without understanding what each woman surrendered to claim her place in the world, and how those sacrifices shaped not only their individual lives, but the possibilities available to all women who would follow. The pattern emerges clearly when we examine these lives together. Each woman faced a fundamental equation that their male counterparts never had to calculate. Achievement required abandoning the approved script for female existence, and that abandonment carried specific penalties. Marriage and motherhood, the prescribed destinations of every proper woman's life, became for most of them roads not taken, not merely because circumstances prevented it, but because the life of exploration, scholarship, and achievement they chose was fundamentally incompatible with the domestic role society demanded of wives and mothers. The sacrifice was not simply of individual relationships, but of an entire category of human experience, of the family structures and social acceptance that form the bedrock of most people's lives. Relationships, when they existed, were complicated by the fundamental contradiction between these women's ambitions and society's expectations. Partners had to be willing to accept a woman who defied convention, who possessed knowledge and experience beyond their own, who refused to subordinate her work to domestic concerns. Such men were rare, and even when found, the relationship itself became another battlefield where traditional expectations clashed with unconventional reality. The women who married discovered that legal and social structures gave husbands control over their wives' activities, finances, and even identities. Those who remained single avoided that particular trap, but faced different costs: social marginalization, whispers about their unwomanliness, and the practical difficulties of navigating a world structured around the assumption that adult women existed as adjuncts to men. Financial precarity haunted most of these women throughout their lives. While male explorers and scholars could secure funding through institutional channels, appeal to learned societies, or depend on family fortunes managed by male relatives, these women constantly scrambled for resources. They lectured exhaustively, wrote prolifically, sought patronage, and still often found themselves unable to fund the work that defined their existence. Annie Smith Peck's endless lecture tours, year after year standing before audiences to recount her achievements so she could afford to create new ones, exemplified this exhausting reality. The mental energy and physical stamina diverted to fundraising represented opportunity costs. The research not conducted, the expeditions not undertaken, the writing not completed because survival required constant self-promotion. The physical toll was equally significant. These women pushed their bodies through extremes that damaged health, left permanent marks, and sometimes shortened lives. They lacked the equipment, clothing, and support systems designed for men undertaking similar challenges. They adapted what was available, improvised solutions, and accepted that their bodies would pay the price for access to experiences supposedly beyond their capacity. Frostbite, tropical diseases, injuries from accidents that would have been prevented with proper equipment, these accumulated across years of exploration, creating chronic conditions that persisted long after individual expeditions ended. Perhaps most insidious was the psychological toll of constant vigilance. These women could never simply be competent. They had to be exceptional to receive even grudging recognition. A mistake that would be overlooked in a male explorer became for them evidence of female inadequacy. They lived with awareness that their every action would be scrutinized not just as individual performance, but as representative data in the ongoing debate about women's capabilities. The pressure to be perfect, to provide no ammunition for critics, to demonstrate twice the competence to receive half the recognition, this created an exhausting internal watchfulness that accompanied every achievement. Jeanne Baret's story illuminates these costs with particular poignancy. The woman who circumnavigated the globe, who contributed thousands of plant specimens to botanical science, who demonstrated courage and capability that would have made any man's reputation, died in poverty and obscurity. Her final years in the French countryside after Commerson's death and her eventual return to France remains sparsely documented, a silence that speaks volumes about how thoroughly her contributions had been erased. She had a small pension from her late husband, but nothing that acknowledged her own scientific work. The specimens she collected bore Commerson's name or were credited to the expedition generally. The knowledge she possessed about where plants had been found, their local names, their uses, all this died with her because no one considered a woman's botanical expertise worth preserving. We know she lost a child before the voyage or during its early stages. The historical record is fragmentary on this point, offering only tantalizing hints of a pregnancy, a birth, and then absence. Did the child die? Was it left with relatives? The silence suggests shame, scandal, the desperate measures poor women took when pregnancy and reputation collided. That loss, whatever its specific nature, represents another sacrifice, another cost of the circumstances that made Jeanne simultaneously indispensable to Commerson and unacknowledgeable as a scientific partner. Her relationship with Commerson itself embodied complicated dependencies. She needed his protection, his name or near it, his social position to access the world of exploration and science. He needed her knowledge, her physical capability, her willingness to perform the actual labor of collecting while he received the credit. It was partnership and exploitation simultaneously, affection and utility intertwined. After his death in Mauritius, she was left without that protection, without the role that had given her purpose. Her eventual marriage to a French soldier and return to France suggests a choice for security over continued adventure, a surrender perhaps, or simply recognition that a woman alone in the colonial world had limited options. The supreme irony is that Jeanne Baret achieved something genuinely historic, the first woman to circumnavigate the globe, but this achievement brought her no security, no recognition, no comfort in her final years. She died as she had lived much of her life, on the margins, her extraordinary capabilities barely acknowledged, her name destined for obscurity, until historians centuries later began piecing together the fragments of her story. The botanical knowledge she possessed, accumulated through years of fieldwork in some of the world's most biodiverse regions, vanished with her. Unlike the specimens themselves preserved in herbarium collections, her living knowledge could not be dried, pressed, and stored for future reference.
Gertrude Bell's sacrifices were different in kind, but equally profound. Born to privileged, educated, brilliant, she never lacked financial resources or social connections. What she sacrificed was emotional fulfillment, the possibility of partnership, the domestic happiness that her class and gender are supposed to guarantee. Her great love affair with Charles Doikie Wiley, a married man stationed in various parts of the Ottoman Empire, could never be more than letters and brief stolen meetings. Their correspondence reveals passionate attachment, intellectual companionship, and the constant ache of separation and impossibility. The affair was conducted largely through letters, hundreds of them, because physical meetings were rare and always constrained by the need for discretion. These letters show Belle at her most vulnerable, expressing needs and desires that her public persona of competent political operator never revealed. When Doikie Wiley was killed at Gallipoli in 1915, Belle lost not just a lover, but perhaps her only chance at the kind of emotional intimacy she craved. His death removed even the possibility that someday circumstances might change, that somehow they might be together. She wore mourning in her heart while maintaining her public role as political advisor and nation builder. Belle's final years in Baghdad, despite her official influence and importance, were marked by increasing isolation. She had power without position, influence without title, responsibility without recognition. The Arab leaders she had helped install sometimes resented her continued involvement. The British officials often saw her as an eccentric anomaly. She was too important to ignore, but too unconventional to fully accept. Her diaries from this period show a woman exhausting, questioning whether her work mattered, wondering if she had made the right choices. On the night of July 11, 1926, Gertrude Bell took an overdose of sleeping pills and did not wake up. The official verdict was accidental death. A woman so exhausted she didn't realize how many pills she had taken. But those who knew her well understood the ambiguity. She had been ill, yes, and tired certainly, but she had also been deeply depressed, questioning the value of her work as her rock's politics grew more complex and her influence seemed to wane. Her final diary entry suggests someone considering whether her life's work had meaning, whether the personal cost she had paid had purchased anything lasting. We cannot know with certainty whether Bell intended to die that night. The historical record preserves the ambiguity, and perhaps that uncertainty itself is meaningful. Here was a woman who had achieved more than almost any person of her era, regardless of gender. She had shaped the borders of nations, influenced the course of Middle Eastern history, produced scholarly work of lasting value, and led it according to her own terms, despite every social pressure to conform. Yet in her final moments, alone in her ruined Baghdad, she may have questioned whether achievement was enough, whether the costs had been worth paying. Belle never had children, never had a lasting partnership, never had the domestic refuse that her class not bringing in prepared her to expect. She chose instead influence, adventure, scholarship, and power, but these proved cold companions in private moments. Her death, whether intentional or accidental, came alone, despite her fame and influence, perhaps the ultimate symbol of the isolation that accompanied her extraordinary life. Annie Smith Peck approached the question of sacrifice with characteristic directness. She never married, and she was explicit about why. She could not have achieved her mountaineering feats while managing a household and meeting a husband's expectations. In her writings and interviews, she was frank about this calculation. Marriage, for a woman of her era, meant subordination, legal, social, and practical. A husband might not control over her finances, her movements, her time. He would expect her to prioritize his comfort and social standing over her own ambitions. Even a supportive husband would create obligations incompatible with months-long expeditions to remote mountains. Peck chose achievement over companionship, and she paid for that choice in constant financial struggle. Without family money or institutional support, she funded her expeditions through lecture tours that were themselves grueling ordeals. Year after year, she traveled by train across the United States, standing before audiences to recount her achievements, so she could afford to create new ones. She was in her 50s, her 60s, her 70s, still taking the stage, still recounting the same stories because she needed the lecture fees to fund the next expedition. The exhaustion was cumulative, the travel wearing, the repetition mentally draining. Imagine the scene. Annie Smith Peck, 68 years old, yet another small town, climbing once more onto a stage to address an audience that may or may not be interested, may or may not believe that this elderly woman actually climbed mountains higher than any man had yet conquered in the Western Hemisphere. She has given this lecture hundreds of times. She has shown the same slides, told the same stories, made the same jokes. Afterwards, she will answer the same questions, defend herself against the same skepticism, try to sell enough tickets or secure enough fees to move closer to funding her next goal. The physical reality of those lecture tours represent a particular kind of sacrifice. Peck was using the fame from her achievements to fund future achievements, creating a cycle that required her to constantly perform and promote herself. Male explorers and mountaineers could retreat to university positions, live on family money, or secure institutional backing. Peck had to be her own level-setting Jeanne, her own fundraiser, her own booking agent. The energy she spent on self-promotion was energy non-spent on climbing and exploration that gave her life meaning. She was also constantly defending her right to climb at all. Critics called her publicity-seeking, suggested her climbs were stunts rather than serious mountaineering, questioned her femininity. When she planted a banner reading votes for women on a summit of Mount Galipuna in Peru, she was making her political convictions visible, but she was also providing ammunition for critics who claimed she was more interested in spectacle than in genuine exploration. That her climbs were exceptional by any standard, male or female, did not protect her from dismissal as an eccentric woman seeking attention. Peck lived to 91, never married, never wealthy, but never willing to compromise her ambition for security or approval. Her autobiography, published when she was 85, shows no regret for her choices, but the costs are visible between the lines. The constant financial anxiety, the physical exhaustion, the knowledge that despite her achievements, she was often treated as a curiosity rather than a serious mountaineer. She had chosen freedom and achievement over security and approval, and she paid for that choice in every lecture she gave, every defense she mounted, every moment she spent justifying her existence outside prescribed boundaries. Nellie Bly.
Mary Kingsley's sacrifices centered on family duty and the ways it constrained her life until her parents' deaths freed her. She spent her 20s and early 30s caring for invalid parents, subordinating any personal ambitions to their needs. When they died within weeks of each other in 1892, Mary was 30,
without husband, without children, without conventional prospects, but suddenly free. Her travels to West Africa in the following years were attempts to complete her father's ethnographic work, but they were also flights towards self-discovery, toward experiences that would justify her existence and give her purpose beyond dutiful daughter. Kingsley's writings suggest complex feelings about this liberation. She felt guilty for experiencing relief at her parents' deaths, guilty for the happiness she found in African adventures while they lay in English graves. Yet she also recognized that without their deaths, she would never have had the chance to become who she was meant to be. She would have remained in England, caring for aging parents until she was too old for adventure, then fading into obscurity as an elderly spinster who had never done anything notable. Her parents' deaths were tragedies, but they were also releases, and the guilt she felt about that relief haunted her throughout her brief remaining life. Her expertise in African cultures, her ethnographic knowledge, her comfort with African environments, all of this made her unmarriageable by Victorian standards. She was too knowledgeable, too independent, too stained by experiences considered inappropriate for English ladies. She had traded life in England for temporary escapes to Africa, but she could never fully belong in either place. In England, she was the eccentric woman who had done shocking things in dangerous places. In Africa, she was always the outsider, the European woman who understood more than most but would never be African. She had chosen knowledge and experience over social acceptability, and that choice closed doors that could never be reopened. Kingsley died at age 37 while nursing Boer War prisoners in South Africa, contracted typhoid, and was dead within days. Her death came just 8 years after her parents' deaths had freed her to explore, a desperately brief window of autonomous life. Some historians have suggested that she sought out the nursing assignment as a way to find purpose after her African travels had necessarily ended. She could not continue exploring indefinitely. Her health was declining, her money was limited. Nursing in a war zone offered a socially acceptable way to be useful, to be in Africa, to have purpose. It also killed her. We might read Kingsley's death as the final cost of courage. She had lived so intensely in those 8 years of freedom that conventional life afterward was unthinkable. Nursing in a war, exposing herself to disease, was preferable to settling into quiet obscurity in England. She chose meaningful death over meaningless life, though she certainly didn't intend to die. Her sacrifice was her youth, her childbearing years spent caring for parents, and then her brief adulthood spent in pursuits that made conventional settling impossible. When she died, she left behind books, scientific observations, and ethnographic insights, but no children, no husband, no one whose life centered on her memory. Freya Stark's face bore the visible mark of her differentness. The factory accident in her youth, which caught her hair and machinery and tore away part of her scalp and hair, left her permanently disfigured. In an era that valued female beauty as essential to a woman's value, this injury marked Stark as other, as damaged, as less marriageable. She wrote about examining her scarred face in mirrors, seeing the physical evidence that she would never be the conventional beauty that Victorian and Edwardian society prized. The disfigurement paradoxically freed her. If she could not be beautiful, she could be brilliant. If she could not attract with appearance, she could astonish with achievement. Yet the psychological impact of that injury persisted throughout her life. She was self-conscious about her appearance, often photographed from angles that minimized the scarring, wearing hats and hairstyles that concealed what could be concealed. Her romantic relationships were complicated by this self-consciousness, by wondering whether she was loved despite her appearance, or whether anyone could love her because of it. She had romantic attachments, most notably to Stuart Perrone, whom she briefly married, but none resulted in lasting partnership. The marriage to Perrone failed partly due to his sexuality. He was gay, though this was not openly acknowledged, and partly due to incompatibility between her need for independence and adventure and his expectations of conventional marriage. Stark traveled into her 90s, wrote over 24 books, became one of the most celebrated travel writers of the 20th century. She achieved fame, recognition, and respect that few explorers of any gender have matched. Yet her personal life remained fragmented, serial romantic attachments that never quite worked, friendships intense but geographically scattered, belonging nowhere completely. She was Dame Freya Stark, eyed by the British government, celebrated by geographical societies, welcomed in Middle Eastern capitals, but she was also permanently the outsider, the woman whose face and life marked her as different, as outside conventional boundaries. In her later writings, Stark reflected on how her unconventional life meant permanent outsider status. She could visit society but never quite join it. She could have admirers but struggle to find partners who understood the depth of her need for independence and adventure. She had traded conventional belonging for extraordinary experience, and she judged the trade worthwhile, but she was honest about the costs. The loneliness, the awareness that she would always be explaining herself, justifying her choices, defending her right to live as she chose, these were constants throughout her long life. The penalties for gender nonconformity were specific and persistent across all these lives. These women were regularly called mannish, unnatural, unfeminine, terms that struck at the heart of Victorian and Edwardian gender ideology. A woman who explored, who claimed authority, who refused domestic confinement was violating the natural order, making herself into a kind of monster. The language used to describe them reveals the anxiety they provoked. They were unsexed, unwomanly, pretending to be men, forgetting their nature. These were not neutral descriptions, but active attempts to delegitimize their achievements by delegitimizing their gender identity.
Their achievements were constantly reframed to minimize their significance. If a woman succeeded at something difficult, it was either because she possessed masculine characteristics, thus not really succeeding as a woman, or because her achievement was a publicity stunt rather than serious work. Annie Smith Peck's climbs were dismissed as attention-seeking. Gertrude Bell's political influence was attributed to her ability to charm men rather than her genuine expertise. Mary Kingsley's ethnographic work was treated as amateur dabbling rather than serious scholarship. Nellie Bly's investigative journalism was sensationalism rather than important reporting. The constant reframing meant these women could never simply be competent. Their competence was always qualified, always explained away, always treated as exceptional in the sense of unusual rather than evidence of general female capability. The question, "Why aren't you married?" haunted all of them. It was asked directly and implied constantly. The assumption was that marriage and motherhood were every woman's natural destination, so a woman who remained unmarried required explanation. Was she too ugly, too difficult, too masculine? Did she hate men? The question carried embedded criticism. An unmarried woman was a failure as a woman regardless of what else she achieved. Mary Kingsley, Annie Smith Peck, and Freya Stark faced this question throughout their lives. Gertrude Bell faced it until her affair with Dottie widely became known, after which she faced different criticism for loving a married man. Nellie Bly's marriage was treated as her true achievement, her return to journalism a sad necessity after widowhood rather than a choice. Only Jeanne Baret, disguised as a man in average of her most significant work, temporarily escaped the question, though she faced it brutally after her exposure. Their authority was challenged in ways male explorers never experienced. Male explorers could make claims about what they'd seen and done, and those claims would be presumed accurate unless proven otherwise. These women's claims were presumed exaggerated or inaccurate unless proven otherwise. Annie Smith Peck had to provide extensive documentation to prove she'd reached the summit she claimed, facing skepticism that male climbers with similar evidence would never have encountered. Mary Kingsley's observations about African cultures were questioned by anthropologists who had never been to Africa, but who assumed their theoretical training trumped her practical experience. Gertrude Bell's political analyses were second-guessed by men with less regional knowledge but more official standing. The presumption was always that a woman's word was less reliable, her observations less accurate, her conclusions less sound than a man's, regardless of relative expertise. The psychological toll of maintaining constant vigilance against this criticism and maintaining twice the competence to receive half the recognition was immense. These women could never relax into confidence that their work would speak for itself. They had to constantly defend, explain, justify, prove. They had to be perfect because any imperfection would be taken as evidence of female inadequacy generally. They had to be humble about achievements while simultaneously insisting on their significance. They had to be feminine enough to avoid the mannish criticism while being bold enough to accomplish extraordinary things. The mental energy required for this constant calibration was exhausting, representing another hidden cost of courage. Yet we must also acknowledge what they missed in conventional terms. They largely did not experience the ordinary happiness of partnership, the daily intimacy of marriage at its best. They did not have children, did not experience the particular love of parenthood, did not create families that would carry their memory through generations. Annie Smith Peck and Mary Kingsley might have descendants. Gertrude Bell's name continued through her family but not through her own children. Freya Stark's brief marriage produced no children. Nellie Bly's marriage was childless. Jeanne Baret possibly had a child but lost that child to circumstance or death. These women's legacies are intellectual and inspirational rather than genetic. They miss the security of social approval, the comfort of fitting in, the ease of booming through society without constant explanation and justification. They missed financial stability. Most of them struggled with money throughout their lives. They missed the support systems available to men in their fields, and their field societies, the institutional societies, the networks of colleagues and clients. They worked in isolation, out here isolation, without the camaraderie and collaboration that makes difficult work easy and amplifies individual achievement. Yet their own writings make clear they found conventional women's lives inadequate for their spirits. Mary Kingsley wrote about how the prescribed feminine whole felt like a coffin for living women. Annie Smith Peck stated explicitly that she could not have achieved her climbs within the constraints of marriage and domesticity. Gertrude Bell's letters show her disdain for the limited concerns of conventional society. Freya Stark wrote about meeting experiences and challenges that drawing or life could never provide. Nellie Bly stirs with some critics the constraints of homies' lives and opportunities. Even Jeanne Baret, who left few items demonstrated through her actions that you accept disguise, hardship, and scandal, rather than remain confined to prescribed family goals. They expressed conviction of death chosen correctly, despite cause. In her autobiography, Annie Smith Peck reflected on her long life and concluded that she would make the same choices again. Freya Stark, writing in her 80s, asserted that her unconventional life had been worth living, that the adventures it issued justified the sacrifices. In Freya Kingsley's final letters, made just before her death, show no regret for travels where her choices, only frustration the time had been so brief. Yet we must also include moments when they expressed ambivalence, loneliness, and doubt alongside determination and satisfaction. Gertrude Bell's final dare lost the value to working in choices. Mary Kingsley's writings include passages about the isolation of the position, over. Mary's my sister's constant wear, either down constant affection with us. Freya Stark's memories acknowledge the wholly as apparent and affecting existence. That has lies is restructured into dumping affectional setbacks than just the axes of that role, but also perhaps of sadness that they permitted her, and even the high time and sympathy with her. These women were not simple heroes without doubt. They were complex humans who paid high prices and sometimes questioned whatever touches were most lasting. Then personal sacrifices enabled broader social change in ways both demanding and subtle. Each one who defied convention made it infinitely easier for those who bore it. When Annie Smith Peck tried her 60s that she expended in the category of women to do, and Gertrude Bell's shaky leads decided that she expanded women's capacity for strategic thinking and diplomatic skill. When Nellie Bly exposed the silent conditions, she showed its potential for serious journalism. When Mary Kingsley graphic rapid advices, she proved with the scholarship capabilities. When Freya Stark traveled through dangerous territories and warned about conflicts and medical situations, she modeled female confidence in traditional men domains. When Jeanne Baret's story was recovered, it provides a historical precedent for women's participation in scientific exploration. The changes were not immediate or complete. Women's and female actors still faced barriers, criticism, and contest for defining invention, but the barriers were slightly lower, the criticism was slightly less fair, and there were
possibilities. Their writings frequently include explicit advocates of feminine rights and gays, and is even literally related to suffrage for Bell. Also, the years after the condition she was not a suffragist activist, they got to be as an expeditionist theorist. Truly ideology, together with the probability, while fighters trying to get us desysteming for them, where have large chance for full people and gays, due to the time period, and a few vestiges of sense and annihilation, they lead to resources now.
Chapter 9. Erasure and Rediscovery. How History Forgot Them. The disappearance of these women from historical memory did not happen by accident. It was a systematic process, as deliberate in its execution as any military campaign, as thorough as any scientific methodology. Within years, sometimes within months, of their extraordinary achievements, the mechanisms of erasure began their work, quietly, efficiently, almost invisibly removing these women from the narratives that would be passed to future generations. The process was so effective that by the mid-20th century, comprehensive histories of exploration, mountaineering, journalism, archaeology, and natural science could be written without mentioning them at all, and readers would never know what was missing. This chapter examines how this erasure occurred, why it was so complete, and how, against considerable odds, these women had been rediscovered and reclaimed in recent decades. The story of how history forgot them is as important as the story of what they accomplished, because it reveals the mechanisms by which women's achievements have been systematically devalued, minimized, and ultimately erased from collective memory across centuries. Understanding these mechanisms is essential to preventing similar erasure in the future and to recovering the countless other women whose stories still remain hidden in archives, footnotes, and forgotten volumes. Jeanne Baret returned to France in 1775, having become the first woman to circumnavigate the globe, having collected thousands of botanical specimens across 3 continents, having survived storms, tropical diseases, and the constant threat of discovery in her male disguise. She had worked alongside Philibert Commerson, certainly, but the botanical work had been collaborative at minimum and often primarily hers, especially during the periods when Commerson was incapacitated by illness. She had identified species, pressed specimens, made detailed notes, and carried equipment through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Yet within a decade of the expedition's return, as the scientific establishment began cataloging and publishing the results, Jeanne Baret's name had virtually disappeared from the record. Commerson received credit for the entire collection. Scientific papers referred to Commerson's specimens and Commerson's observations, without mentioning the woman who had done much of the physical work of collection and preservation. When new species were described and named, they bore Commerson's name in their Latin designations, not Baret's. The comprehensive accounts of the Bougainville expedition mentioned her only in passing, if at all, usually in the context of the scandal of her presence rather than her scientific contributions. This erasure was not simply an oversight. The French scientific establishment of the late 18th century had no conceptual framework for acknowledging a woman's contributions to natural science. Women of education might maintain private botanical collections, might paint flowers, might even correspond with naturalists. These were acceptable aristocratic hobbies. But serious scientific work that contributed to human knowledge and merited professional recognition, was by definition the province of educated men. Jeanne Baret, a peasant woman who had learned botany through practical experience rather than formal education, who had been forced to disguise herself as a man to participate in the expedition at all, simply could not be accommodated in the narratives the scientific community constructed about itself. Her presence was an embarrassment, her contributions an impossibility that threatened the entire social order of science. So she was written out, quietly and thoroughly, until comprehensive histories of the Bougainville expedition and 18th century botanical exploration could be published that mentioned dozens of minor male crew members, but not the women who had circled the earth collecting plants. The pattern repeated with each of these women, though the specific mechanisms varied according to time, place, and field. Gertrude Bell's erasure was perhaps the most politically motivated and systematic. During her lifetime, particularly during World War I and its immediate aftermath, her influence was undeniable. Military officers consulted her, politicians sought her advice, Arab leaders negotiated with her as a representative of British interests. Her knowledge of tribal politics, territorial boundaries, and regional power dynamics was unmatched. She was instrumental in drawing the borders of modern Iraq, in selecting its first king, in establishing its museums and cultural institutions. Yet even before her death in 1926, the official accounts of British policy in the Middle East were already minimizing her role. Military histories emphasized the decisions of male generals and colonels, mentioning Bell only as a helpful source of local information. Political histories credited male diplomats and officials with policy she had largely crafted. The creation of Iraq was attributed to a pantheon of male politicians and military leaders, with Bell relegated to a supporting role, if mentioned at all.
This erasure served multiple purposes. It maintained the fiction that women were not involved in serious political and military affairs, certainly not in determining the fate of nations. It protected the reputations and legacies of male officials, who might have appeared less impressive if the full extent of Bell's contributions were acknowledged. It simplified narratives that would have become more complex and potentially controversial if they had to account for a woman wielding significant power in the construction of Middle Eastern political order. And crucially, it allowed subsequent generations of historians to write about the creation of modern Iraq, about British imperial policy in the Middle East, about the aftermath of World War I, without having to confront the uncomfortable reality that a woman had been a central architect of these developments. By the 1950s and 1960s, comprehensive academic histories of the region barely mentioned her. A generation of students studied Middle Eastern history without learning her name. Her extensive papers remained in archives, available to anyone who looked, but few did, because the published history suggested there was nothing there to find. Annie Smith Peck's erasure took a different form, rooted in the mountaineering community's persistent refusal to fully accept her achievements. Throughout her climbing career, she faced skepticism and resistance from male climbers and mountaineering organizations. Her records were questioned in ways that male climbers' records were not. When she claimed first ascents, committees demanded additional proof and corroborating witnesses that male climbers were not required to provide. When she set altitude records, technical objections were raised about measurement methods, about whether certain peaks counted, about whether her accomplishments were truly significant. After her death in 1935, this skepticism hardened into dismissal. Mountaineering histories of the early 20th century mentioned her, if at all, as an eccentric, as a publicity seeker, as a woman who climbed for attention rather than for the purer motives attributed to male mountaineers. Her genuine achievements, first ascents, altitude records, pioneering routes, were downplayed or attributed to her guides, as if she had simply been carried up mountains by more capable men. The mechanisms here were subtle but effective. Mountaineering, like other adventure sports, constructed narratives of heroic masculine achievement. The ideal climber was portrayed as strong, stoic, technically skilled, driven by an almost mystical connection to the mountains rather than by worldly concerns like fame or recognition. Women who climbed were automatically suspect, their motivations questioned, their capabilities doubted. Annie Smith Peck, who was indeed interested in public recognition, as were most male climbers, though their promotional activities were rarely framed as character flaws, who write about her expeditions and gave public lectures, who explicitly connected her climbing to women's rights activism, could easily be dismissed as unserious, as more interested in being famous than actually climbing. This dismissal allowed mountaineering historians to focus on male climbers as the true pioneers and record setters, while relegating Peck to footnotes as a curious anomaly, a woman who had climbed but whose climbing didn't really count in the same way men's climbing did. Nellie Bly's erasure was particularly paradoxical because she had been spectacularly famous during her lifetime. Her around-the-world journey was front-page news leaks. Millions followed her progress. She was a household name, recognized internationally, celebrated as an embodiment of American energy and ingenuity. Yet within decades, as journalism professionalized and developed its own institutional memory and hagiography, Bly was remembered primarily as a stunt journalist, a celebrity, a woman who had done sensational things that attracted attention, but hadn't contributed to serious journalism. The investigative reporting that have exposed asylum abuses, factory exploitation, and corruption was forgotten or minimized. Her pioneering techniques, immersive undercover reporting, advocacy journalism, using her platform to effect social change, were not credited to her when they were later employed by male journalists, who were instead hailed as innovators. The journalism profession in the early and mid-20th century was constructing its identity as a serious, objective, professional endeavor. This construction required heroes and founder fathers, the great editors, the crusading reporters, the men who had built newspapers into powerful institutions, and journalism into a respected profession. In these narratives, there was little room for a woman whose most famous exploit involved traveling around the world faster than a fictional character, whose methods included deception and performance, whose writing was passionate and advocacy-oriented rather than detached and objective. Bly didn't fit the emerging professional ideal of the journalist, so she was recategorized as something else, an entertainer, a celebrity, a stunt performer who happened to work for newspapers. This recategorization allowed journalism histories to celebrate male investigative reporters and advocacy journalists, while dismissing Bly as not quite the real thing, despite the fact that her actual work was substantively identical to, or more impactful than for many men in Memphis. Mary Kingsley's erasure walked through the mechanism of academic credentialing and professionalization. During her lifetime and immediately after her death, her books on West Africa were widely read, and her ethnographic observations were taken seriously by scholars of archaeologists. But as anthropology professionalized as an academic discipline in the early 20th century, it became increasingly credential-focused and institutionally bounded. Serious anthropology was done by people with university training, affiliated at academic institutions, following established methodological protocols. Kingsley, who was self-taught, who traveled independently rather than under institutional sponsorship, who wrote for general audiences rather than academic journals, who died before anthropology's full professionalization, was progressively marginalized as an amateur. Her observations, which had been valuable when anthropology was itself still a loose collection of interested observers, became suspect as the discipline professionalized and drew sharper boundaries between legitimate scholarly work and mere travel writing. This process was gendered in specific ways. Male travelers and observers without formal training, explorers, colonial administrators, missionaries, continued to be cited as ethnographic sources even as the discipline professionalized, because their observations were assumed to be objective and reliable despite a lack of credentials. Kingsley's observations, in contrast, were increasingly dismissed as impressionistic, subjective, and unreliable, even though her work was often more systematic and detailed than the men who continued to be cited. By mid-century, comprehensive academic studies of West Africa would cite dozens of sources, colonial reports, missionary accounts, other travelers' observations, but not Kingsley, despite the fact that her documentation of certain cultural practices and beliefs was the most thorough available. She had been recategorized out of anthropology into Anderwaffel, a genre that was assumed to be less rigorous and less scholarly. Her books remained in print longer than most of these women's works, but they were served as entertaining account of a storming out adventure rather than a serious ethnography, and the extensive cultural documentation they contained was effectively lost in the scholarly community.
Freya Stark's case was different because she lived longer until 1992 and was celebrated throughout much of her lifetime. She received honors, awards, recognition from two thriving societies of literary organizations. Yet even during her lifetime, and increasingly after her death, she was categorized as a travel writing, with the implicit diminishment of the category carried. Travel writing was a legendary childhood, but it was not considered as serious as series. Geography, archaeology, the prism of analysis, Stark's extensive geographic work, her mapping of previously uncharted regions, her documentation of archaeological sites, her analysis of political and social conditions in the Middle East was overshadowed by the literate quality of her writing. She was praised as a beautiful style, which she was, but this praise functions to categorize her as an artist rather than a scholar or scientist. Male explorer writers like T. Winslow or Wilfred Hitziger were credited as both literary figures and serious scholars of the region. The writers were mined for historical and political insights, as well as appreciated for their prose. Stark's writing, equally insightful about regional political geography and culture, were often treated as personal reflections, beautiful but not necessarily reliable or significant as sources of knowledge about the Middle East. This gendered categorization and thus that amidst some studies helped as an academic field. Stark was marginalized despite her extensive knowledge and long experience of the region. Scholars writing about the political history of Syria, Iraq, and Yemen would cite male travelers, archaeologists, and political officers, but not Stark, even when she went extensively and knowledgeably about the same topics. Her work was literary, personal, subjective in ways that it was assumed made it less useful for serious scholarship, even though her observations were often more detailed and her analysis more sophisticated than the men who were cited as authority. She was remembered and celebrated, but in a way that diminished the scholarly and geographic significance of her work, that made her an elegant writer rather than an important contributor to knowledge by the Middle East. These mechanisms of erasure, the denial of professional status, the minimization of attributions, the attribution of credit to male colleagues, the recategorization into less serious genres, the residuation of higher evidential series, the construction of professional narratives that excluded women by definition, were remarkably consistent across different fields and different time periods. They were not the result of conscious conspiracy, but rather emerged from the structural logic of male-dominated institutions and professions. As fields professionalized, they constructed histories of themselves that emphasized continuing progress in the contributions of great men. Women's contributions, when they were undeniable, were treated as exceptions, anomalies, interesting curiosities that didn't change the fundamental narrative. When they could be denied and minimized, where women's work was done in collaboration with men, and they received disproportionate
The rediscovery of these women began in earnest in the 1970s, driven by second-wave feminism and the emergence of women's history as a scholarly field. Feminist historians began deliberately searching for women's contributions that had been overlooked or erased from standard historical narratives. This was painstaking archival work, requiring researchers to look beyond published histories to primary sources, letters, diaries, government documents, newspaper archives, institutional records, where women's presence and contributions might still be traced, even if they had been removed from secondary accounts. It also required a hermeneutics of suspicion, a willingness to question authoritative historical narratives and to consider what might be missing from them. When a history of botanical exploration mentioned Commerson and his assistant without naming the assistant, feminist historians asked who that assistant was and what that person had actually done. When a history of British policy in Iraq attributed decisions to male officials, feminist historians looked for evidence of who else might have been involved in crafting those policies. This recovery work was enabled by the fact that these women had left extensive documentary traces, despite their erasure from published histories. Jeanne Baret's name appeared in ship's logs, in scattered contemporary accounts, in administrative documents related to the Bougainville expedition. Gertrude Bell's papers had been preserved and were available to researchers, though few had consulted them for decades. Annie Smith Peck's books had gone out of print, but still existed in libraries. Nellie Bly's articles were preserved in newspaper archives. Mary Kingsley's books could still be found, though often in storage rather than on library shelves. Freya Stark's extensive writings and correspondence were available. The raw material for recovering these women's stories existed. It required researchers who knew to look for it and who had the tools and training to interpret it properly. The rediscovery proceeded woman by woman, field by field, driven by individual scholars, and gradually building into a collective project of recovery. In the early 1970s, feminist scholars began writing articles and books about forgotten women explorers, scientists, and adventurers. These early recovery works were often celebratory, focused on making these women visible again and arguing for their significance. As more women's stories were recovered, scholars began analyzing patterns in how and why women had been excluded from historical narratives, developing theoretical frameworks for understanding historical erasure as a systematic process rather than a series of individual oversights. By the 1980s and 1990s, women's history had become an established scholarly field, and recovering forgotten women was a recognized and valued form of academic work. Jeanne Baret's rediscovery came relatively late, partly because French archival sources were less accessible to Anglophone feminist historians in the 1970s, and partly because the complex international and multidisciplinary nature of her story made it harder to trace. But as historians of science began to pay more attention to the contributions of assistants, technicians, and other support workers whose labor had been rendered invisible in celebratory histories of great scientists, Baret's role became clearer.
Scholars examining the Bougainville expedition's botanical collections realized that the work attributed to Commerson alone was too extensive for one person, particularly given Commerson's frequent illnesses. Consulting contemporary accounts and ship's logs, they rediscovered Baret's presence and began piecing together her contributions. By the early 2000s, scholarly articles were arguing that she should be recognized as a significant naturalist in her own right, not merely Commerson's assistant. In 2012, a comprehensive biography by Glenys Ridley brought her story to general audiences. In 2013, a species of flowering plant from South America was formally named Solanum baratea in her honor, the first plant to bear her name, more than 2 centuries after she had collected thousands of specimens. Gertrude Bell's rediscovery began earlier and was driven partly by renewed interest in the history of British imperialism and the creation of modern Middle Eastern states. As historians in the 1970s and 1980s began to critically examine British policy in the region, some returned to primary sources, including Bell's extensive papers, which had been deposited at Newcastle University. Feminist historians, particularly those interested in women's roles in imperialism and colonialism, began to recognize how extraordinary her position had been, and to argue that she had been systematically written out of histories that should have featured her prominently. Biographies in the 1970s and 1980s brought her back into public consciousness. By the 1990s and 2000s, scholars of Middle Eastern history were routinely consulting her papers and acknowledging her influence. In recent years, as questions about the arbitrary borders and political structures imposed by colonial powers have become central to understanding contemporary Middle Eastern conflicts, Bell's role in tying those borders and establishing those structures has received renewed attention. This attention is complicated and critical rather than simply celebratory. Bell's legacy is controversial given the long-term consequences of the political order she helped create, but she is no longer erased from the historical narrative. Annie Smith Peck's rediscovery was driven partly by the women's mountaineering community, which began deliberately recovering the history of women climbers in the 1970s and 1980s. As more women took up serious mountaineering and faced skepticism and resistance similar to what Peck had encountered, they became interested in the history of women who had climbed before them. Peck's books were republished, her climbing records were verified through primary research, and her pioneering routes were documented and celebrated. The climbing community began to acknowledge that she had been held to different and higher standards than male climbers, and that her achievements had been minimized because of gender bias. Contemporary women climbers made pilgrimages to peaks she had climbed, retracing her routes and honoring her memory. Mountain rescue organizations and women's mountaineering groups named awards after her. By the early 2000s, mountaineering histories routinely included her as one of the pioneering high-altitude climbers of the early 20th century, and her advocacy for women's mountaineering was recognized as having opened the sport to future generations of women climbers. Nellie Bly's rediscovery was paradoxical because she had never been entirely forgotten. Her name remained somewhat known, and her around-the-world journey was still remembered as a famous stunt, but the recovery of her reputation as a serious, pioneering investigative journalist required looking beyond the spectacle to the substance of her work. Feminist media historians in the 1970s and 80s began to reread her asylum expose and other investigative articles, recognizing them as exemplary instances of what would later be called advocacy journalism and immersive reporting. They argued that the techniques she had pioneered, going undercover, experiencing conditions firsthand, using narrative storytelling to convey investigative findings, explicitly advocating for reform, had been adopted by later journalists who were celebrated as innovators while Bly was dismissed as a stunt performer. Gradually, journalism education began to reclaim her as a founder of investigative reporting. Awards were established in her name. Her techniques were taught as examples of important journalism methods. By the 2000s, journalism histories routinely included her as a significant figure in the development of investigative and advocacy journalism, though debate continues about how to categorize and evaluate her theatrical methods. Mary Kingsley's scholarly rediscovery was complicated by the fact that her books had remained more continuously in print than most of these women's works, so she had never been entirely forgotten, but she had been categorized as a travel writer and adventurer rather than as a serious ethnographer, and her cultural documentation had been largely ignored by anthropologists. The recovery of her scholarly reputation required demonstrating that her ethnographic work was systematic, detailed, and valuable, and that it had been dismissed because of gendered assumptions about women's observational capabilities and analytical rigor rather than because of actual deficiencies in the work. Feminist anthropologists in the 1980s and 1990s began to reread her books as ethnographic texts, analyzing their methodologies and findings and comparing them to contemporary work by male observers who had been accepted as legitimate ethnographic sources. They demonstrated that her work was often more thorough and more analytically sophisticated than that of male travelers whose observations were routinely cited. Post-colonial scholars also became interested in Kingsley as a figure who had complicated relationships with imperialism and colonialism, critiquing certain aspects of British policy while supporting imperial structures overall. Recent scholarship treats her as both a significant ethnographic observer whose work documented cultural practices that would otherwise be unknown, and as a complex and contradictory figure whose Withawandalism must be acknowledged alongside her achievements. Freya Stark's case was unique because she lived into the 1990s and was celebrated throughout much of her life, so she never entirely disappeared from public consciousness, but the recovery of her reputation as a serious geographer, archaeologist, and political observer, rather than merely a gifted travel writer, required looking beyond the literary qualities of her writing to the geographical and scholarly content. Scholars of Middle Eastern history and geography in the 1990s and 2000s began to revisit her extensive writings, recognizing them as valuable sources of information about regions, cultures, and political dynamics that were often poorly documented in other sources. Her maps and geographical documentation of previously uncharted areas were recognized as serious contributions to geographical knowledge. Her archaeological observations were acknowledged as important records of sites and artifacts. Her political analyses, written from direct observation over many decades, were valued as insightful commentaries on Middle Eastern affairs. Recent scholarship treats her as both a masterful writer and a significant contributor to geographical and historical knowledge about the Middle East, rather than having to choose one identity over the other. This rediscovery work matters for multiple reasons beyond simply correcting the historical record, important as that is. First, it demonstrates that erasure is not permanent or inevitable. Women who have been forgotten for decades or longer can be recovered, their achievements can be documented and celebrated, their contributions can be restored to historical narratives where they belong. This is encouraging work that suggests that the countless other women whose stories remain untold can also be recovered with sufficient effort and commitment. Second, the rediscovery reveals the mechanisms of erasure, making it possible to recognize and resist similar processes in the present. When we understand how women's achievements were minimized, how their work was attributed to male colleagues, how they were captured to less serious genres, how higher standards were applied to them, we can identify these same mechanisms operating today and actively counter them. Third, recovering these women's stories provides inspiration and role models for contemporary women, evidence that women like them have done remarkable things despite obstacles, and examples of strategies for navigating constrained systems and creating opportunities for achievement. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, recovering these women's stories changes our understanding of history itself. When women are restored to narratives of exploration, science, journalism, and adventure, the past looks different. It becomes clear that women were not simply absent from these spheres, but were actively excluded and then erased. It becomes apparent that the standard narratives we have inherited are not complete or accurate, but are selective accounts that systematically privilege men's contributions while minimizing or ignoring women's. This realization should make us appropriately skeptical of any historical narrative that claims to be comprehensive while featuring only or primarily men. It should prompt us to ask what is missing, who has been erased, whose contributions have been rendered invisible. It should motivate us to actively seek out and preserve women's stories, to ensure that contemporary women's achievements are properly documented and credited, so that future historians will not have to do the hard work of recovery that has been necessary for these 6 women. The rediscovery project is ongoing. These 6 women represent a small fraction of the women who made significant contributions to exploration, science, journalism, and other fields but were erased from historical memory. For every woman whose story has been recovered, dozens or hundreds remain forgotten, their names appearing only in obscure archival documents, their achievements unrecognized, their contributions uncredited. Feminist historians continue to search for these women, working through archives, mining footnotes, questioning authoritative narratives, piecing together fragmentary evidence. Each recovered story adds to our understanding of women's historical presence and agency, complicates our narratives of the past, and provides inspiration for the present. The rediscovery project is not just about recovering individual women's stories, important as those are, but about fundamentally transforming how we understand history, who we recognize as historical actors, and whose achievements we consider worth remembering and celebrating. Yet even as we celebrate the rediscovery of these 6 women and others like them, we must acknowledge the fragility of historical memory and the ongoing work required to prevent future erasure. These women were recovered largely because feminist scholars in the 1970s and later made the deliberate choice to search for them, because women's history emerged as a scholarly field with institutional support, because archives had preserved the documents that made recovery possible. But not all women left such extensive documentary traces. Not all archives have preserved records of women's activities. Not all historical periods or cultures have been as thoroughly researched. The women who have been recovered tend to be those who were exceptional in multiple ways, not only in their achievements but in their literacy, their access to resources, their ability to document their own activities, their presence in institutions that kept records. Women who were less privileged, less educated, less able to create permanent records of their activities remain much harder to recover even when their achievements were significant. Moreover, the institutional support for women's history and feminist scholarship is not permanent or secure. Academic fields rise and fall in popularity and funding. The infrastructure that has enabled the recovery of these women's stories, university positions, research funding, archives, publishers willing to print women's history, must be actively maintained and defended. There is no guarantee that future generations will have the resources, training, or inclination to continue this work. And even as we work to recover women from the past, we must remain vigilant about preventing similar erasure in the present. Women's achievements today are still sometimes minimized, attributed to male colleagues, categorized into less serious genres, held to higher standards. The mechanisms of erasure that operated in the past have not entirely disappeared. They have simply adapted to contemporary circumstances. Preventing future generations from having to rediscover today's women requires active effort to properly credit, document, and celebrate women's achievements in the present, to challenge gender bias in how work is evaluated and credited, to ensure that institutions and fields construct histories of themselves that genuinely include women's contributions, rather than treating them as supplementary or exceptional. The story of E6 on erasure and rediscovery is ultimately a story about power, memory, and who stories get told. History is not a neutral record of everything that happened. It is a selective narrative constructed by people with particular perspectives, interests, and biases. For most of recorded history, those with the power to construct historical narratives have been predominantly men, and they have constructed narratives that emphasize men's achievements and minimized or ignored women's. Recovering women's stories requires looking beyond these official narratives to other sources, requires questioning what we think we know, requires the deliberate effort to seek out what has been hidden or forgotten. It requires recognizing that absence in historical narratives does not mean absence from historical events.
Chapter 10. Legacy. How 6 Women Changed the World. The morning light filters through the tall windows of a modest London townhouse in 1902, illuminating dust motes that dance in the still air. A young woman sits in a chair that has been pushed close to the window to catch the best reading light, her family's objections to wasting lamp oil during daylight hours long since internalized. Her name is Clara Morrison, though history will not remember it, and in her lap rests a volume that will change her life, Mary Kingsley's Travels in West Africa. Clara's father, a solicitor with conventional views about women's proper sphere, has forbidden her to attend university. Her mother quietly agrees, citing the strain that intellectual work places on the female constitution. But as Clara reads Kingsley's vivid accounts of navigating rivers, documenting cultural practices, and conducting scientific observations, something fundamental shifts in her understanding of what might be possible. The book is proof, tangible and irrefutable, that a woman can do these things. Not in theory, not in fantasy, but in documented reality. By next spring, Clara will have found employment as a governess in a diplomat's family bound for East Africa, her wages secretly saved toward eventual anthropological study. She is one of thousands, her name lost to time,
but her life trajectory altered by the visible achievement of a woman who dared to go first. This is how change happens, not in grand proclamations, but in private reading rooms where young women encounter proof that the world is larger than they have been told, that the boundaries drawn around their lives are artificial rather than inevitable. This concluding chapter examines the profound and multifaceted legacy of 6 remarkable women whose individual acts of courage collectively contributed to transforming women's lives and expanding the boundaries of possibility across multiple fields and generations. Jeanne Baret, Gertrude Bell, Annie Smith Peck, Nellie Bly, Mary Kingsley, and Freya Stark each operated within different contexts, pursued different goals, and left different types of evidence behind. Yet their lives share common threads. Each defied the gender conventions of her era. Each achieved recognition in fields claimed as masculine territory. Each paid personal costs for her defiance, and each became proof that societal claims about women's limitations were false. Their legacies are complex, sometimes contradictory, and invariably entangled with the imperial, colonial, and class structures of their times. But their impact on expanding opportunities for women is undeniable and continues to reverberate through institutions, professions, and individual lives more than a century after most of them worked. To assess their legacy is to grapple with how social change actually occurs, not through abstract progress, but through accumulated acts of individual courage, not through perfect heroes, but through flawed humans who nonetheless pushed boundaries, and not through simple narratives, but through complicated stories that require us to hold multiple truths simultaneously. The immediate influence of these women manifested most directly through their published accounts, which reached audiences far beyond their immediate circles and provided tangible evidence that women could succeed in realms society claimed were impossible. When Jeanne Baret's story finally became widely known through the accounts of her voyage companions and subsequent historical research, it revealed that women had been contributing to scientific knowledge all along, even when their labor went uncredited. The thousands of botanical specimens she collected during the circumnavigation of 1766 to 1769 contributed to expanding European understanding of global plant diversity, and many of the specimens she preserved remain in collections today. But perhaps more importantly, her story demonstrated that the history of science included women's work even in its earliest phases, undermining the narrative that science was and had always been an exclusively male domain. Subsequent researchers who uncovered her story provided ammunition for arguments that women belonged in scientific fields not as newcomers, but as participants whose contributions had been systematically erased. When Nellie Bly published her account of traveling around the world in 72 days, 6 hours and 11 minutes in 1890, newspapers across America and Europe reprinted her dispatches, making her journey a shared cultural event. Young women who had never left their home states followed her progress through Ceylon, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan, seeing through her eyes and understanding viscerally that a woman traveling alone could navigate foreign cultures, handle logistics, solve problems, and return triumphant. The commercial success of her book and the newspaper serialization proved that the public was hungry for women's perspectives on the world, validating women's voices as authorities on travel and international affairs. Mary Kingsley's Travels in West Africa, published in 1897, became both a bestseller and a scholarly reference, achieving the difficult feat of being simultaneously accessible to popular audiences and respected by academic specialists. Her vivid writing style, self-deprecating humor, and careful spherographic observations made African cultures visible to European readers in ways that challenged prevailing stereotypes. She demonstrated through painstaking documentation that African societies had complex social structures, sophisticated economic systems, and rich cultural traditions, evidence that contradicted the racist assumptions underlying much colonial discourse. While her work was certainly entangled with and limited by the imperial context in which she operated, it nonetheless provided intellectual resources for those who would later challenge colonial hierarchies. More immediately, her example inspired other women to pursue ethnographic fieldwork. When British anthropology began to professionalize in the early 20th century, the visible precedent of Kingsley's serious scholarly work made it marginally more possible for women to claim space in the discipline. She had proven that women could conduct rigorous fieldwork, publish respected scholarship, and contribute to academic conversations, even if the institutions themselves remained resistant to granting women full professional recognition. Annie Smith Peck made her legacy more explicitly political, directly connecting her mountaineering achievements to arguments for women's suffrage and expanded rights. In lectures across the United States, she would recount her climbs up in Matterhorn, Mount Huascaran, and dozens of other peaks, then pivot to arguing that women who could survive at high altitudes, navigate technical climbing challenges, and exercise the judgment necessary to avoid fatal errors were certainly capable of voting, owning property, and participating in civic life. Her athletic achievements became evidence in political debates, concrete proof that medical claims about female fragility were false. Gertrude Bell's influence operated differently through institutional structures and political frameworks rather than primarily through published accounts aimed at popular audiences. Her archaeological work at sites across Mesopotamia contributed to the emerging field of Middle Eastern archaeology, and her meticulous documentation, photography, and mapping set standards for systematic excavation and recording. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad, which she founded in 1926, represented her commitment to preserving cultural heritage within the region of its origin, rather than shipping artifacts to European institutions, a somewhat progressive position for her time, even if it remained entangled with colonial power dynamics. Gertrude Bell's legacy is particularly complex because her political work directly contributed
contributed to drawing the borders of modern Iraq, borders that contained within them seeds of future conflict. She operated as an instrument of British imperial policy while simultaneously developing genuine expertise in relationships that shaped how that policy was implemented. Modern assessments of her legacy must grapple with this contradiction. She was an extraordinary scholar and administrator whose work had lasting impact, and she was also complicit in structures of colonial control that had devastating consequences. Her life demonstrates that historical figures can be both groundbreaking and challenging gender barriers, and problematic in their relationships to other forms of power and abrasion. Freya Stark's influence extended across both literary and geographical domains. Her travel writing, which combined vivid description with scholarly depth, historical awareness with immediate sensory detail, set standards that influenced subsequent generations of travel writers. She demonstrated that travel writing could be serious literature, intellectually substantial while remaining accessible and engaging. Her careful geographical mappings of regions that had been poorly documented in Western records filled in blank spaces on artificial maps, contributing to geographical knowledge in concrete and lasting ways. The Royal Geographical Society awarded her its prestigious medals, recognizing her contributions as legitimate scholarly achievements rather than merely interesting adventures. Beyond their specific field contributions, these women function as what sociologists call first movers or pioneers, individuals whose success in breaking barriers creates pathways that others can follow, even as the pioneers themselves face resistance and costs that later entrants might avoid. The concept of the first mover helps explain both the importance and the particular difficulty of their achievements. Before there are any women in a particular field or role, the arguments against women's inclusion seem plausible to many people because there are no counterexamples. Medical authorities could claim that women's constitutions couldn't withstand travel, high altitudes, or intellectual strain, and in the absence of visible counter-evidence, these claims carried weight. But once even a single woman had demonstratedly succeeded, once Baret had survived a circumnavigation, once Peck had summited high peaks, once Bly had circled the globe, the claims of impossibility were revealed as false. This didn't mean the barriers immediately fell. Resistance continued, often intensified, but the terms of debate had shifted. Now opponents had to explain away the visible counter-evidence rather than simply asserting impossibility. This dynamic played out across all the fields these women entered. The first woman in any domain faces skepticism about whether any woman can succeed. The second faces questions about whether the first was an anomaly. By the 10th or 20th, the question shifts to what systemic barriers continue to impede women's fuller participation. Each pioneer moves the conversation forward at personal cost, creating marginally more space for those who follow. The broader social impact of these women's visibility extended beyond their specific fields to influence public imagination about what women could be and do. In an era when most information came through newspapers, books, and public lectures rather than through mass media, these women were remarkably visible. Nellie Bly's face appeared on trading cards and advertisements. Annie Smith Peck's climbs were covered in newspapers across America and Europe. Mary Kingsley's lectures through crowds. This visibility mattered profoundly because it made women explorers, scientists, and adventurers imaginable to the public. Young women who might never meet a female scientist or explorer could nonetheless know that they existed because they had encountered them through media. This kind of visibility provides what psychologists call a model of possibility, a concrete demonstration that a particular life path is available, which makes it easier for others to imagine themselves following it. The absence of such models functions as an invisible barrier, making certain paths seem unimaginable even when they are not technically forbidden. By being visible, these women made their paths imaginable. Letters and memoirs from subsequent generations of women explorers, scientists, and journalists frequently cite these pioneers by name, crediting them with inspiration. When Amelia Earhart broke aviation records in the 1930s, she explicitly connected her achievements to earlier women who had broken barriers in other domains. When Margaret Mead conducted her groundbreaking anthropological fieldwork in Somalia in the 1920s, she was following a path that Mary Kingsley had helped to establish, demonstrating that women could conduct serious ethnographic research in the field. The practical demonstrations that these women provided, that women could navigate foreign cultures, conduct scientific work, survive physical hardships, and exercise professional judgment, undermined medical and social claims about female fragility and intellectual shifts. Throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, medical authorities made confident pronouncements about women's physical and mental capacities, claiming that women's reproductive systems made them unsuited for intellectual work, that their constitutions couldn't withstand the rigors of travel to physical exertion, and that their emotional temperaments made them unreliable for professional judgment. These weren't fringe opinions, but mainstream medical consensus, published in respected journals and taught in medical schools. But women nonetheless succeeded in activities that medical theory prayed would harm them. They provided empirical evidence against the theories. This didn't immediately change medical opinion. Authorities found ways to explain away counter-evidence or to claim that the women who succeeded were exceptional outliers, whose success didn't invalidate general rules. But the accumulation of counterexamples eventually made the old theories untangled. Annie Smith Peck's survival and success at high altitudes directly contradicted claims about women's physical limitations. Mary Kingsley's clear analytical writing and systematic observations demonstrated women's capacity for scientific work. Gertrude Bell's political and administrative roles in Iraq proved women's capacity for strategic thinking and complex judgment. Each success chipped away at the obvious of claims about women's natural limitations, making it progressively harder to maintain that the limitations were natural rather than socially constructed. These women also insisted on being taken seriously as scholars and professionals rather than mere novelties or curiosities, and this insistence mattered for advancing women's professional status. The dominant framework for understanding women who achieved in unconventional domains was to treat them as exceptions, remarkable precisely because they were unlike other women. This framework preserved the general assumption that women as a category were unsuited for such work, while allowing for individual exceptions. Our six septics resisted this framework in various ways. Mary Kingsley insisted that her ethnographic observations be evaluated by the same standards applied to male anthropologists, refusing to be condescended to or relegated to a special category of lady travelers whose work wasn't quite serious. Gertrude Bell demanded recognition from the Royal Geographical Society not as an honorary gesture, but as acknowledgement of scholarly contributions equivalent to those of male members. Annie Smith Peck explicitly framed her achievements as evidence of what women generally could do, rather than as proof of her individual exceptionalism. By refusing to accept the framework of the exceptional woman, they pushed for recognition that women as a category were capable of serious professional work. This was strategic and important. If each successful woman is framed as exception, her success doesn't create pressure to include more women. Instead, it reinforces the idea that most women cannot and should not attempt such work. But if successful women insist that their achievements demonstrate general female capacity, their success becomes an argument argument for systemic change. We can trace direct lineages from these pioneers to subsequent generations of women who explicitly cited that as inspiration for careers in journalism, anthropology, geography, mountaineering, and international relations. The archives of women's professional organizations contain letters, speeches, and interviews in which later women acknowledged.
Third, these lives demonstrate that achievement under discrimination requires double the effort for half the recognition. Each of these women had to be not just competent, but exceptional to receive even grudging acknowledgement. Mary Kingsley's ethnographic work had to be unimpeachable to be taken seriously. Male anthropologists with less rigorous methods were given more credence. Gertrude Bell's archaeological and political analysis had to be demonstrably superior to receive the recognition that would have been given more readily to a man with equivalent skills. Annie Smith Peck had to break records, not just complete climbs, to command attention. Nellie Bly had to circle the globe faster than Phileas Fogg's fictional 80 Days to make her journey newsworthy rather than merely interesting. And even then, they often received recognition only to have it qualified, minimized, or attributed partly to luck rather than skill. Baret's botanical contributions went unrecognized for decades, credited to the male naturalists she worked with. Bell's political work in Iraq was often attributed primarily to the male officials she worked with, her contributions minimized. This pattern, requiring exceptional achievement from marginalized group members while giving easier credit to dominant group members, is a persistent feature of discrimination that these women's experiences illustrate clearly. Fourth, visibility matters profoundly for demonstrating what is possible. By being public figures, by publishing accounts, by giving lectures and interviews, these women made their achievements visible to others in ways that had ripple effects they could not always trace or predict. The young woman reading Mary Kingsley's book in a London townhouse, deciding to pursue anthropology. That story, repeated thousands of times in different circumstances, is how these pioneers' influence spread. Visibility provides models and inspiration, but it also changes what seems normal versus exceptional. The more often people encounter women explorers, scientists, and adventurers, the more these roles seem like natural possibilities rather than bizarre anomalies. This is why representation matters across all forms of media and public life, not just because it makes marginalized groups feel included, but because it literally changes what people can imagine for themselves and what society comes to view as normal. The writings these women left behind preserve their voices and perspectives, allowing modern readers to encounter them directly rather than through others' interpretations. This is one of their most valuable legacies. When we read Nellie Bly's first-person account of her asylum investigation or her around-the-world journey, we hear her voice, her observations, her humor, her anger. When we read Mary Kingsley's descriptions of navigating rivers and documenting trade practices, we encounter her analytical mind and her vivid sensory observations. When we read Freya Stark's travel narratives, we experience her literary artistry and her geographical precision. When we study Gertrude Bell's letters and reports, we see her political analysis and her complex relationships with the people and places she worked with. These primary sources allow us to form our own judgments, to appreciate complexity, to see these women as rounded individuals rather than as symbols. This is why the recovery and preservation of women's writings, letters, diaries, and other documents is such important historical work. It gives us access to perspectives that official records often excluded or minimized. A young woman sits in a university library in 1935, a scholarship student at Barnard College, preparing for an anthropological field research project in New Guinea. Her name is Margaret Mead, and she will become one of the 20th century's most influential anthropologists. On the desk before her are several books, including Mary Kingsley's Travels in West Africa. Mead has read Kingsley's work multiple times, studying not just the ethnographic content but the methods, the way Kingsley navigated relationships with informants, the way she balanced scientific observation with cultural respect. Mead's own approach to fieldwork will differ in many ways. She has formal academic training that Kingsley lacked. She operates in a different theoretical framework. She works in a different region with different cultural dynamics. But the fundamental demonstration that Kingsley provided, that a woman can conduct serious ethnographic fieldwork, survive in challenging environments, document cultural practices systematically, and produce work that scholars respect, has made Mead's path more imaginable, more possible. When Mead faces skepticism from male colleagues about her planned solo fieldwork in Samoa, she can point to precedents, can argue that women have already proven their capacity for such work. She stands on foundations laid by women like Kingsley, even as she builds structures that will in turn support subsequent generations. In a climbing hut in the Peruvian Andes in 1975, a group of women mountaineers gather around a small stove, preparing tea and planning the next day's climb. They are attempting Mount Huascarra, the peak that Annie Smith Peck summited in 1908, setting an altitude record for the Western Hemisphere. The women have brought copies of Peck's route descriptions, her photographs, her accounts of the challenges she faced. This expedition is deliberately framed as honoring Peck's legacy. The climbing team has named themselves the Annie Smith Peck Memorial Expedition, and they plan to plant a banner at the summit celebrating women's mountaineering. But beyond the symbolic gesture, Peck's detailed accounts provide practical information: where to establish camps, which approaches work, what challenges to anticipate. Her technical route descriptions, published
published in mountaineering journals contain information useful to anyone attempting the peak. This is the dual legacy of women pioneers in any field, the symbolic importance of their barrier breaking which inspires and validates others, and the practical contributions of their work which subsequent practitioners build on. The women in this climbing hut are there because Peck proved it was possible, and because her route descriptions make their attempt more likely to succeed. In a newsroom in 1972, a young journalist named Gloria Steinem pitches a story idea. She wants to go undercover as a Playboy bunny to expose the working conditions and treatment of women in Playboy clubs. Her editors are skeptical of the approach, worried about ethical questions around deception. Steinem argues that this kind of immersive, first-person investigative journalism has a strong precedent, citing Nellie Bly's undercover work in the asylum, Bly's various exposés that used similar methods. The editors ultimately approve the piece, which becomes famous as I Was a Playboy Bunny, helping launch Steinem's career and contributing to growing public awareness of women's workplace issues. This is direct lineage, a 20th century journalist explicitly invoking a 19th century pioneer to justify investigative method, building on foundations laid decades earlier. Bly's transformation of journalism to include immersive first-person investigative journalism created templates that journalists continue to use, regardless of gender. Her innovations became part of journalism's standard toolkit, her influence extending far beyond women's journalism to journalism generally. In Baghdad in 2003, in the chaos following the American invasion of Iraq, staff at the Iraq Museum worked desperately to protect collections from looting and damage. The museum that Gertrude Bell captured in 1926 houses irreplaceable artifacts from Mesopotamian combinases, collections she assembled and organized, institutions she created to preserve cultural heritage. In the decades since Bell's death, the museum has been both a symbol of Iraqi cultural identity and a reminder of the colonial history entangled with its founding. Iraqi archaeologists and museum professionals who trained there and worked to build its collections have complicated relationships with Bell's legacy, recognizing her genuine scholarship and her commitment to keeping artifacts in Iraq rather than shipping them to British museums, while also acknowledging that she operated as an instrument of British imperial power. The museum itself survives as her most concrete legacy, though damaged by wars and sanctions that trace back partly to the borders and political structures she helped create. This complexity cannot be resolved into a simple judgment. Bell's legacy includes both real contributions to archaeology and cultural preservation, and complicity in political structures that cause lasting harm. Both are true, both matter, and holding both truths simultaneously is necessary for honest historical assessment. A botanical garden in Paris, 2010. A new wing is opening, dedicated to specimens collected during 18th century expeditions. The curators have spent years researching the provenance of specimens, trying to credit the actual collectors rather than just seeing the different names appeared in official records. They have discovered that many specimens long attributed solely to Philibert Commerson, the official naturalist on Bougainville's 1766-1769 circumnavigation, were actually collected by Jeanne Baret, Commerson's assistant and partner. The new labels credit both names. A plaque explains Baret's story, how she disguised herself as a man to join the expedition, how she was discovered partway through the voyage, how her expertise was essential to the expedition's scientific success, how her name was omitted from official records. This quiet act of historical correction, repeated in botanical gardens and natural history museums around the world, represents a broader effort to acknowledge women's contributions to science that were long erased or minimized. It matters not just for historical accuracy, but for what it teaches current and future generations, that women have always been part of scientific work, that their exclusion from official records reflected social barriers rather than actual absence, that recovering these stories requires active effort. In a university classwork, students study travel writing as both literary art and historical document. They read Freya Stark's accounts of traveling through remote regions of Turkey, Persia, and Arabia, analyzing her prose style, her use of historical allusion, her geographical precision, her complex portrayals of the people and culture she encountered. The professor, a woman scholar of Middle Eastern studies, discusses how to read Stark's work critically, appreciating her literary merit and geographical contributions, while recognizing her entanglement with British imperial interests and its limitations in representation. The students, diverse in background and coming to this material with different perspectives, debate what they find valuable and what they find problematic. This is how legacy works in educational settings, not as simple hero worship, but as critical engagement, learning from achievements while recognizing limitations, using historical historical figures to think about how social change happens and how individuals navigate systems of power. Stark's work endures not because she was perfect, but because she was talented, complex, and historically significant, because her experiences and her writing teach us things worth knowing, even as we critique aspects of her context and choices. A montage unfolds of contemporary women whose work builds on these pioneers' foundations. A journalist investigating exploitative labor practices in overseas factories, her methods descended directly from Nellie Bly's immersive investigative approach. A botanist conducting field research in Papua New Guinea, part of a long lineage that includes Jeanne Baret's specimen collection. A mountaineer summiting K2, standing on the shoulders of women like Annie Smith Peck who proved that women could climb the world's highest peaks. An anthropologist documenting endangered cultural practices in the Amazon, her work tracing back through Margaret Mead to Mary Kingsley. A diplomat specializing in Middle Eastern affairs, benefiting from and also grappling with the complex legacy of women like Gertrude Bell, who pioneered women's roles in international relations. A travel writer crafting literary nonfiction about remote places, working in a tradition shaped significantly by Freya Stark's artistry. These connections are sometimes explicit, sometimes unacknowledged, sometimes indirect, but they are real. The women working in these fields today do so in part because earlier generations of women proved it was possible, broke down barriers, and created pathways. This is what legacy needs, not that contemporary women consciously model themselves on historical pioneers in every detail, but that the accumulated effect of many individuals' barrier breaking has transformed what opportunities are available and what paths seem imaginable. Yet we must also recognize what this chapter cannot fully capture, the countless women whose names we do not know, whose contributions went completely unrecorded, whose courage changed their own lives and perhaps the lives of lives irreservables, who left no written accounts, no visible achievements that historians can trace. The 6 women featured in this book are remarkable partly because they achieved public recognition, because they wrote and published, because they left records that allow us to study their lives. But for every woman whose story we can tell, there were surely hundreds of thousands whose defined facts went unrecorded. The enslaved women who escaped to freedom, surviving journeys as harrowing as any exploration. The working class women who traveled as servants, sailors' wives, or camp followers, seeing as much of the world as official explorers, but without the social position that would make their observations count his knowledge. The indigenous women who served as guides, translators, and informants for European travelers, whose knowledge made others' journeys possible, but whose names appear rarely or never in the published accounts. The women who simply insisted on living unconventionally in quiet ways that never attracted public notice. Unmarried women who supported themselves, women who ran businesses, women who educated themselves and their daughters despite social opposition. All of these women were also pioneers in their ways, also expanded possibilities, also demonstrated through their lives that the boundaries society drew were not inevitable. We cannot tell their individual stories because the records do not exist, but we can acknowledge their collective existence and the collective impact. The recognition of this vast invisible history should cultivate humility about what any historical account can capture. The 6 women whose stories this book tells are representative rather than exhaustive, chosen because their relatively privileged positions left evidence that historians can work with. Their stories illuminate broader patterns and processes, but they do not and cannot represent the full diversity of women's experiences of traveling, exploring, and challenging boundaries during the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. Class, race, nationality, education, and countless other factors shaped what became possible for different women and what evidence their lives might leave behind. A florid history would include many voices, many different perspectives, many different kinds of barrier breaking. What we can say is that these 6 stories demonstrate how social change works, how barriers fall, how possibilities expand, and that similar dynamics with different particulars played out in countless other lives. Returning to the question of what these legacies teach us today, several lessons emerge clearly. First, that courage matters and is costly. Each of these women paid prices for her defiance: social isolation, financial insecurity, physical danger, dismissal, ridicule. Jeanne Baret endured years to spouse as a man, the psychological toll of that constant deception, the loss of credit for her scientific work. Gertrude Bell married by covetous source of reasons, and died alone in Baghdad, estranged from many of her contemporaries. Annie Smith Peck struggled financially throughout her career, dependent on lecture each and small grants, never achieving the security she might have had in a more conventional life. Nellie Bly's fan is spectacular but grief, her later career marked by financial difficulties and diminishing recognition. Mary Kingsley died young, of typhoid contracted while nursing Focal War prisoners, her most productive years cut short. Freya Stark survived into old age but faced periods of professional and personal difficulties, her work sometimes celebrated and sometimes dismissed. Courage is not free, and those who go first often pay the highest costs. This is worth remembering in our own time, when people challenge barriers.